You ever wonder what it would be like to get ambushed by the Apache? Nah, just me. I imagine it'd be quite the jarring experience. 1 second, you're half asleep in the saddle, just daydreaming, maybe thinking about little Juanita over there in White Oaks. And the next, you're plunged into complete and utter chaos. Horses rearing as men drop to the ground, cursing and jerking rifles out of scabbards as they dive for cover. A brief moment of extreme violence mixed with fear and confusion, and then silence. A silence sporadically punctured as the natives fall back and hurl insults and pot shots your way, hoping to get lucky or goad you out into the open. Those who are brave or foolish enough to stick their heads out do so carefully, scanning the horizon for the telltale sign of sun glitting off of rifle barrels, or the dust kicked up from a muzzle blast. Anything to determine where their attackers are hiding or how many of them are out there. The others hug the desert floor as tight as possible, the scalding ground burning from below and the high desert sun baking from above. You don't dare make a move other than try to make a bulwark of sorts out of some rocks within reaching distance, blistering stones that won't stop no bullet, but good Lord willing, they might just deflect an arrow. And God, you're thirsty. Too much of Beaver's rock gut the night before, and you and the boys ain't got but one canteen between you. Ain't no way in hell that's gonna last till night, and besides, Tommy over there caught a slug down low, and he's already begging for a drink. You reach down, finger in the dirt, and come up with some small, smooth pebbles to pop in your mouth, an old-timer's trick to help alleviate the thirst. And you run through your options. This ain't the movies, so there'll be no John Wayne riding in with the cavalry. And hell, if the cavalry actually did show up, they wouldn't know who to shoot first, the Apache or you. Thus is the life of an outlaw. Still, though, a U.S. government-issued bullet would be a hell of a lot better than what happens if them Apache down there get their hands on you. You've heard the stories, maybe even seen the bodies yourself. The bleached bones of other unlucky bastards scattered across the arid wasteland. Save the last bullet for yourself. Ain't that what they say? Now hold on now, let's just think this thing through. If there's only a few mescalero out there, and sure as shit they are mescalero, you might just have a chance. Unfortunately, judging by the rounds they're starting to send your way, there's at least half a dozen. And there ain't but 5 of you. Make that 4. Tommy done stop moving. So what do? Obviously, you don't just lay down and die, right? You put up a fight. If your time's up, then your time's up, but you damn sure ain't gonna make it easy on them. You'll sell yourself dearly, make them earn that scalp. You talk yourself into it, begin working yourself up. Hell, I've been through tougher scrapes than this, came out all right. Don't they know who the fuck I am? You lever another round into your Winchester, just in time. Here they come, boys, steady now. Make every shot count. The words still hanging in the air as they fling themselves into your midst, screaming like demons, bronze devils bubbling up from the desert floor. You drop one, then another as the bullets ricochet off the rocks and tug at your clothing. The sound of men screaming in defiance and fear as you choke on the dust and smoke filling your lungs, your eyes stinging as you work the action on your rifle again and again, and they're gone. Once again, breaking off their charge as quickly as it began. Probing attack. Sons of bitches were just testing us. Oddly enough, you begin to laugh. That same peculiar feeling in your guts that you felt so many times before after cheating death. A deep, infectious belly laugh that spreads to your compadres. The type of laugh that feels truly earned. Honest. But then the adrenaline wears off and reality creeps in and something akin to fear begins tickling at your insides. In addition to testing your strength with that recent assault, them Apache also did for the last of your horses. And brother, it's one hell of a long way back to that last watering hole. You glance at the sky, judging there's a few more hours yet till sunset, thinking you'll break free in the cover of darkness, if you and the boys can make it that long. You top off your rifle and then start counting your ammunition, or what's left of it. A measly 4 shells. Wishing now that you bought a couple more boxes back when you had the chance. Once again, the thought enters your mind. Save the last bullet for yourself. But you won't, and neither will your pards. Nah, there'll be no suicide pack here among these boulders. You're all too damn mean to go out like that, and young to boot, possessing that immortal optimism known only to young men with their entire lives ahead of them. An optimism that sometimes, every now and then, pays off in spades. Nah, by God, if you and the boys can last till nightfall, then you'll make a break for it. Throw caution to the wind, curse the fates, and, if Providence calls for it, go down swinging your empty rifles like clubs. Still, though, you can't help but think of Juanita and all them other Spanish angels. And you begin rummaging through your pockets, coming out with a piece of rolling paper and a stub of a pencil, scribbling out a quick note, just in case. What's up, y'all? My name is Josh, and you're listening to the Wild West Extravaganza. That little bit of fiction you just heard is something I kind of made up, so my apologies. Hopefully, though, I painted a semi-realistic picture of what it'd be like getting attacked by the Apache, just getting surrounded and outgunned. It's a drama that was played out more than once in real life down in southern New Mexico back in the old days. And believe it or not, the infamous Billy the Kid may have found himself in a situation very similar to the one I just described. In a recently published article titled Billy the Kid and the Apaches, author and historian James B. Mills included a tantalizing tidbit about a little something known as the Last Stand Note. Discovered sometime prior to 1952 in the Florida mountains of southwestern New Mexico, the note, written on a piece of tobacco paper and stuffed inside an empty shell case, reads as follows. This is our last shell and about 10 Indians left, so our chances look slim. But we are going to take a chance. Yours truly, William Bonney. What? William Bonney? The William Bonney? Our William Bonney? Now, this last stand note is what educated people like to call apocryphal. It means it's of doubtful authenticity, spurious, likely contrived or fabricated. And hell, let's not fool ourselves. They're probably right. Call me skeptical, whatever you want. It just seems too easy. But still, what if? What if Billy the Kid did find himself hopelessly surrounded by Apache and out of ammo? And not everybody is convinced that it is fake. According to the now deceased historian Maurice G. Fulton, the handwriting on the note stands up well when compared to a sampling of the real Billy Bonney's penmanship. Furthermore, the doctor posits, had the note been placed as a hoax by some trickster, they likely would have gone with the more obvious route and signed it as Billy the Kid, as opposed to William Bonney. Also, what are the odds that someone's going to go through all the trouble of attempting to replicate the kid's own handwriting? Now, unfortunately, thus far, I have not been able to find out much more information on this last stand note. Remember, it's not authenticated, and I doubt it ever will be. But man, it sure is intriguing. Looks like it was sold at an auction in Arizona back in 2019 for just $3,025. Not a bad payday for a hoax, and one hell of a deal if it was actually written by the kid. So, now that we've got the speculation out of the way, did Billy the Kid ever have any known run-ins with the Apache? The answer is a resounding yes. Turns out he had more than a few close encounters with the southwestern indigenous. The first that we know of occurred sometime in the fall of 1877, not too long after Billy had killed his first man over in Arizona, that blacksmith Wendy Cahill. Killed him and broke out of jail there in Camp Grant and lit out for New Mexico. Once in the territory, somewhere in or near the Guadalupe Mountains, he and a companion were ambushed, likely by the Apache. The kid was able to hide and make his way out on foot, but still, it was a very desolate area. It took him 3 nights of walking and laying low during the day to finally make it to the no longer existing town of Seven Rivers, where a good Samaritan took him in, tended to his torn and bloody feet, gave him some warm goat milk and a place to rest. And Billy wasn't the only one losing horses to the Apache there in New Mexico around this time. They made a hobby of stealing from ranchers like John Chisholm, who, over the course of a few years, lost 1,700 head of cattle, horses, and mules. A loss valued at more than $90,000 at the time, or nearly $2.5 million in today's money. And we know that Chisholm ranch hand and future regulator Josiah Doc Scurlock had him a couple of run-ins with the Apache as well. In one such incident, he and another man were working as line riders and got surprised by about 5 mescalero. The other man was killed almost immediately along with all the horses, and Doc hid among the rocks, just trading shots with the warriors until they finally gave up and let him alone. On another occasion, Scurlock returned to his line shack and found another partner dead, missing both scalp and nose. Seems like it was a full-time job just staying alive in New Mexico back in the 1870s. And make no mistake about it, the gringos and Mexicans stole plenty of horses from the Apache as well, especially once the tribe was settled on reservations. Ranchers and cowboys did it, Jesse Evans and his gang did it, and so did the Lincoln County Regulators. Which brings us back to Billy the Kid and his other known encounters with the Apache. Full disclosure, one of them is unverifiable, kind of anecdotal, so I'll go ahead and start with it. Story goes that the kid once used some sopapillas to distract a dog long enough for him to quietly untie a mule from an Apache lodge not too far from Fort Stanton. Evidently, those delicious delicacies kept the dog busy and docile long enough for the kid to make off with said mule and other stock, laying low before then driving the ill-gotten animals on over to Mr. Chisholm's place. I guess they were still friends when all this went down. And sopapillas, for those of you who've never dated a Mexican, It's kind of a fried tortilla with a bunch of sugar and sometimes cinnamon. Evidently, Billy was nice enough to all them New Mexican senoritas that they kept him well supplied with such sweets. The other time that we know for a fact Billy was stealing from the Apache was in early August of 1878, almost a year after he killed that blacksmith and after the Lincoln County War. Man, it's crazy how quick the kid's career was. I sometimes forget how much action was packed into such a short amount of time. Basically, like all of Young Guns 1 took place in 9 months. And then just 3 weeks later, August 5th, 1878, Billy and what was left of the Regulators, along with some Mexican friends, rode to the Mescalero Apache Reservation with plans to steal themselves some fresh mounts. As the Regulators and friends neared the Mescalero agency, they paused at a nearby spring to water their horses. At least Billy and the Regulators did. For whatever reason, the Mexicans rode on ahead without stopping. Moments later, gunshots rang out, spooking the kid's horse and causing it to bolt. Turns out Billy's amigos had run into some Apache that didn't take kindly to having their horses taken. When agency clerk Morris J. Bernstein saddled up to investigate, he was unfortunate enough to get caught in the middle and stop one or more fatal rounds. Bullets supposedly fired by Regulator ally Adonacio Martinez. The Indian agent himself, a guy named Frederick Godfroy, ran back to the nearby agency, got him some soldiers and more Apache, and they all came gunning for the Regulators. Billy, still not able to locate his damn horse, jumped up behind George Coe, and the pair quickly raced to the agency's corrals under a hell of gunfire. The kid leaping off the back of George's mount and onto an Apache pony, riding off on it bareback with a whole bunch more horses than they came with. Now, we don't know if Billy even fired a shot. He for sure didn't kill Bernstein. Hell, he didn't even see the man get killed. But he would get blamed for it nevertheless. At this point in his career, I reckon it didn't matter much. He was already a marked man with less than 2 years left to live. So yeah, Billy most definitely had personal experience with the Apache and came out unscathed. But what about those who didn't? Was anyone ever involved in a siege like the one I described in the intro, surrounded by the Apache and forced to make a desperate last stand out of ammunition? Once again, the answer is yes. One such example is the Freeman-Thompson stage that was ambushed back in 1861. As soon as the Apache opened up fire, the 7 passengers immediately bailed out of the wagon, grabbing rifles and ammo, and headed for cover, not knowing that they were only putting off the inevitable. Now, these men were well armed with Springfield breechloaders, and they were experienced, some having tasted combat already. But can't no 7 men hold out for long against an estimated 300 Apache warriors, especially without water. Still, though, they did make it possibly as long as 3 days before the Apache were finally able to finish them off. If you ever get a chance, I highly recommend the book The Education of a Wandering Man by Louis L'Amour. You're probably familiar with the author and his many fiction Western novels, especially the ones that were turned into movies like Hondo, The Shadow Riders, The Quick and the Dead, Conager. Now, The Education of a Wandering Man is a nonfiction biography, kind of a memoir of his recollections of his early years just being a hobo and working odd jobs all over the world and all the books he read along the way and the interesting people he met. One of those interesting people was an old man, a wolfer, who the then 16-year-old L'Amour was hired to help skin some cattle with up in the Texas Panhandle. Now, this guy claimed to have been captured by the Apache as a child and adopted into the tribe. He also claimed to have been a witness to the battle there that wiped out those Freeman stage passengers. Now, take all this for what it is. L'Amour wrote this from memory some 60 years after hearing the story from the old man, who at that time would have already been pushing 80. As such, there are certain details that they got wrong. For instance, L'Amour said that the battle happened at the entrance of Doubtful Canyon. It did not. It actually occurred about 100 miles further east in Cook's Canyon. Still, though, if this old man was telling the truth, I think it's worth hearing. And what that wolfer said about the end of the fight, I also think is very interesting. So, according to L'Amour, the old man had this to say, quote, "At last, midday in the 3rd afternoon, the shooting ended, and after a long time, the Apache began to expose themselves. When there was no more firing, they went down, one after another, until hundreds were gathered. The ammunition was all gone. One of the last men had broken the extra rifles so that they would not be available for use by the Apache. All 7 of the defenders died, the last one, or perhaps 2, dying by his own hands with his last bullet, rather than suffer the torture that awaited him if taken alive." End quote. There you go. Save that last bullet for yourself. It's also worth pointing out that in the same area, not very long after, about 8 or 9 Mexican herders suffered the same fate. They were driving about 40 head of cattle, paused to have lunch, and they too were surrounded and massacred, killed down to the last man. And I know all this happened in 1861 when the kid was still probably sucking at his mama's teat, but it's not like the Apache just up and went away. Almost 20 years later, when our very own William H. Bonney was very much in his prime, the Apache were still raising hell in the Cooks Canyon area. In early June of 1880, according to Dan Thrapp in The Conquest of Apacheria, quote, Major Morrow with 4 troops struck the hostiles in Cooks Canyon, not far from Fort Cummins, killed 10 and wounded 3, capturing much livestock. One of the dead was said to have been the raider Washington, Victorio's son, end quote. Even as late as the summer of 1884, the Apache attacked a caravan of farmers hauling produce through Cooks Canyon. According to one source, quote, the Indians attacked the ox-drawn carts. The way of traveling at the time was in 2-wheeled carts with a fairly large bed to carry merchandise. The caravan was soon massacred, and the complete load of merchandise was destroyed. And these are just a few examples. No telling how many other people were completely massacred in these canyons of southern New Mexico. I mean, that's why Doubtful Canyon is called Doubtful Canyon. It was doubtful if you rode in that your ass was coming back out alive. But the reason I'm focusing so much on Cooks Canyon is because of its location. Present-day Luna County, New Mexico. Just 30 short miles away from the Florida mountains where that cryptic last stand note was found. So what do you think? Is it possible that Billy the Kid could have found himself in a similar situation as all those others who died in nearby Cooks Canyon? Absolutely. But did he? Did he really write that note, or was it some practical joker looking to cause some excitement? And if Billy did indeed scribble it out, what do you think was going through his head? Did he begin to regret some of his life choices or curse the unfairness of it all? Or did he accept his fate stoically, knowing that life is but a morning fog, a mist that appears before a moment and then vanishes? Or, as I alluded to in my intro, was he like most young men his age and feeling invincible, thinking he'd live forever, not knowing that he didn't have too much longer till he'd utter his last words? Ken S. A question answered by 2 slugs from Pat Garrett's revolver. Email me and let me know what you think. Or head on over to my website, wildwestextra.com, and hit that contact button. And remember, you're Billy the Kid too, You all are. Dirty little Billy bastards. Wyatt Earp, Billy the Kid, Doc Holliday, Jesse James, Wild Bill Hickok. These are the names of legends. Names I think most people, even those with no interest in Old West history, will find familiar. But for every one of these guys, there were a dozen others who were every bit as deadly and capable with a firearm, if not more so. Men who didn't flinch in the face of death. Men who knew the smell of the black powder smoke and the crack of a bullet snapping past their heads. Men who, for whatever reason, are largely lost to history. Or at very least, just not that well known. Men like Elfego Baca, the young store clerk who pinned on a fake mail-order badge and single-handedly took on an overwhelming force of gunmen. The over 30-hour gunfight that ensued is considered by some to be the most lopsided of the Wild West. And all at the tender age of 19. And don't you worry your pretty little head none. The rest of Elfego's life was chock full of excitement as well. The man would go on to be tried several times for murder, get involved in the Mexican Revolution, work as a sheriff, a lawyer, a detective, a district attorney, a Prohibition-era speakeasy bouncer, and hell, even a school superintendent. And yes, his life would inspire a Disney TV series not too long after his death. According to one biographer, Elfego Baca was, quote, controversial. He drank too much, he talked too much, he had a weakness for wild women, and he was often arrogant. And of course, he showed no compunction about killing people. And when it came to killing, Elfego made no bones about it, saying, quote, if a man has it in mind to kill me, I made it my business to kill him first. Sounds like the kind of guy we like around these parts. Who was Elfego Baca? Well, put on that sombrero and find out on this newest El Gato Nueve Vidas I Can't Speak Spanish worth a damn episode of Bloody Beaver's Wild West Extravaganza. Yeah! Como estas, bitches? My name's Josh, and I'm the host of this monstrosity of a podcast. And today, boys and girls, we are talking about the one and only Elfego Baca. Now, as I touched on a moment ago, he is one of those lesser-known Wild West characters. Lesser known to me, at least. If you're of a certain age, you're probably at least familiar with the name.
as a Disney TV series called The 9 Lives of Elfego Baca aired from 1958 to 1960. Or maybe you're from New Mexico, or you just passed through the tiny town of Reserve, New Mexico, and paused to visit the bronze statue portraying a defiant Elfego stepping out of a half-destroyed shack, 6-gun in hand. Elfego Baca was born in February of 1865 in the central New Mexico town of Socorro. His parents, Francisco and Juana Maria, would move the family to Kansas just a couple of years after Elfego's birth, affording Baca a better education than a boy could then get down New Mexico way. I did find a source claiming that Elfego was kidnapped by Native Americans at the age of 1 and then quickly returned to his parents, something he himself allegedly would claim was yet another example of his lifelong streak of good luck. No idea how true this is, though, and regardless, it does appear that Baca spent the majority of his first 15 years in the mostly lily-white town of Topeka, Kansas. Unfortunately, tragedy would strike the Baca family, and over the course of just a few weeks, Elfego's mother, a brother, and a sister would all pass away. And I wasn't able to find out exactly what caused these deaths or when exactly they happened, but a good guess would be around the year 1880, as that's the same time that Elfego and his daddy would move back down to New Mexico territory. Speaking of which, his father, Francisco Baca, wasn't no shrinking violet either. Once back in New Mexico, he became a lawman out of Los Lunas. Ended up killing a member of a prominent family while on duty, an action that landed the elder Baca behind bars. Elfego, then just 15 years of age and fearing a lynch mob, ended up breaking his dad out of jail and helping him flee to the safety of Texas. So right off the bat, we know Elfego comes from a tough stock, or at least stock that wasn't afraid to use a gun. And we know young Baca, even at the age of 15, wasn't lacking in nerve. As you can probably guess by the names Elfego, Francisco, and Maria, the Bacas were of Hispanic descent. And the Baca family goes way back in Nuevo Mexico, hundreds of years in fact. They called that land home back when it still belonged to Spain. By the 1880s, New Mexico was still just a territory, but the Hispanics that lived there were U.S. citizens, thanks to the 1848 Treaty of Hidalgo. But that didn't necessarily mean that they were treated as such, which brings us to the little village of Upper Frisco Plaza. Frisco, or San Francisco Plaza, was really just a string of 3 villages on the San Francisco River in eastern New Mexico, all within about a mile and a half of each other in present-day Catron County. Back then you had Lower Frisco, Middle Frisco, and Upper Frisco. The only one still in existence is Upper, now known as Reserve, New Mexico. Still a tiny town, by the way, with a population of less than 300. And although you just heard me mention Catron County, way back when that whole area was part of Socorro County. Whose county seat is? You guessed it, Socorro. The same town Elfego was born in and the town that he returned to as a teenager. Now back in those days, Socorro County took up a huge swath of land. We're talking roughly south of Albuquerque and just west of the Mescalero Reservation, all the way to the Arizona border. Now this used to be Apache land, and even during our story's timeline, it was still a rough and wild country. Butch Cassidy lived there for a while, and even the elusive Apache Kid was known to pass through from time to time. But by the 1880s, it was mostly cattle country. And as such, a whole lot of Texas cowboys had drifted on in to seek employment at the many ranches that dotted Socorro County. Now, Upper Frisco Plaza, now known as Reserve, was also called Milligan's Plaza back in the day, thanks to a drinking establishment of the same name. It's also where all those Texas cowboys would come to blow off a little bit of steam. You know, get a little drunk, maybe do some gambling, some fighting, which is to be expected, right? Being a cowboy is hard, dangerous work. Got to get loose every now and then and let that freak flag fly. You know what I mean? Got to let that monkey out of the cage. Besides, we were all young once. You know how it goes. I'm kind of reminded of that Blue Edmondson song, $50 and a Flask of Crown. Unfortunately, these Socorro County cowhands began getting a little bit too wild. A lot too wild, actually. As I briefly touched on earlier, the Hispanics who had long called this area home weren't really considered real citizens. They were just simply Mexicans. And that was probably the nicest thing they were ever called by those cowboys. By the way, going forward on this episode, if I refer to somebody as Mexican, just know that I'm doing so for the historical perspective. In the same way the term Indian was once used to describe Native Americans. You know, the townspeople of Upper Frisco called themselves Mexicans as well. It's what they identified as. There was no such thing as Latinx back in those days. And the more I read about Elfego Baca, the more I'm positive he himself would have a violent reaction to being referred to as Latinx. Anyway, when I say these cowhands were getting out of control, they were destroying property, they were shooting chickens, not to mention shooting holes in the roof of Jenkins Saloon. just flat out terrorizing the locals. And for the most part, they got away with it. I mean, who the hell was going to stand up to him? Tomas down at the stables? Juanita, the midwife? There was no Wyatt Earp, or Bat Masterson, or Bass Reeves walking the beat in Upper Frisco. Matter of fact, there was no real law at all, other than one so-called deputy, a guy named Pedro Saraceno, who was really just a shopkeep who happened to moonlight as a peace officer on occasion. Nowhere in his job description did it list taking on scores of drunken cowboys. Cowboys who took to riding up and down the streets, ignorantly yelling out phrases like "Remember the Alamo." And then there's the incident of the young woman who was lassoed and taken out of town, never to be seen again. And finally, there was poor El Burro. No, not a donkey, a man. A mentally challenged guy simply known as Burro. A group of cowboys got liquored up and, they held the poor bastard down on the bar at Milligan's place and they castrated him. And when a bystander named Epitacio Martinez tried to intervene, those drunken drovers tied him to a pole and used him for target practice. Fortunately for him, they were too damn inebriated to do a whole hell of a lot of damage. 4 of their bullets found Martinez, but none of them hit any of his vitals, and he would live. Now, at this point, that timid so-called deputy Saraceno decided to ride the 130 miles east to Socorro to plead for help, for anyone to come to the aid of those poor citizens of Frisco. And somehow our very own Elfego Baca, then just 19 years old and working as a clerk in his uncle's store, would answer this call. Now, there's a few versions of what happened, but long story short, Elfego pinned on a fake badge that he had ordered in the mail, basically the equivalent of a little kid's toy badge you'd buy at Walmart, mounted up and rode west toward Frisco Plaza with a Colt 45 resting on his hip. Now, when I first read this, I got some serious Dwight Schrute volunteer sheriff's deputy vibes from this guy. But what happened next would vanquish all similarities to the bumbling Dunder Mifflin paper salesman and bare fact connoisseur. Upon arriving at Upper Frisco, Elfego would waste no time in arresting a drunk cowboy who was shooting off his gun and acting a damn fool. Now, this cowboy he arrested was an employee of rancher John Slaughter, a.k.a. Texas John Slaughter. The Louisiana-born Slaughter was a veteran of the Civil War and the Texas Rangers before he took to ranching in the late 1870s. He'd eventually become sheriff of Cochise County, Arizona, and even helped track down Geronimo. But back in 1884, he was just ranching, as far as I know, and this Charlie McCarthy character was simply one of his many employees. Like I said, Baca arrested the inebriated buckaroo and hauled him before what passed as a justice of the peace there in Frisco, who, probably not wanting any trouble, simply fined McCarthy $5 and sent him on his way. And as you can imagine, he went right back on to drinking and shooting off his gun. Now, Elfego Baca didn't appreciate this too much. The teenage 5'7" tall, quote-unquote Mexican, quote-unquote lawman with the fake-ass badge went and arrested McCarthy again. Only problem was, things didn't go quite as smoothly as the first time. And the cowboy did have friends. Just as Elfego was trying to apprehend the man, McCarthy grabbed a pistol out of the holster of his foreman, a guy by the name of Young Parham, and tried to use it on Baca, but to no avail. Elfego wrenched the revolver from his grip and put the tipsy herder under guard in a private residence to once again await the justice of the peace. Now, this didn't sit too well for the Slaughter Ranch cowboys. Parham, the foreman, told Baca to release McCarthy immediately. Fine him, do what you gotta do, but let the man go. Hell, we got work to do. To which Baca replied, nuh-uh. Now here's where things get dicey. Parham wasn't alone. He was being backed up by cowboys from the Slaughter Ranch. How many, I can't say for certain. And I don't think Elfego was alone either, not at this point. In one source I found, Baca had raised a small armed posse when he went to go arrest McCarthy the second time. I assume just some of the long-suffering citizens of Frisco Plaza. Anyway, it didn't matter. You don't get to be foreman for John By-God Slaughter unless you got some grit, which it looks like Parham had. He demanded once again that McCarthy be released. Tensions were mounting on both sides, and the cowboys soon lost patience and began to close in on the building where Baca was guarding their wayward compañero. Guns drawn, by the way. Upon seeing the weapons, Elfego ordered the advancing cowhands to halt, which I'm sure got him some not-so-nice words thrown his way. Some phrases that were probably just a tad bit culturally insensitive. By the way, this wasn't Baca's first run-in with the vigilante justice. A few years prior, he witnessed his own brother lynched by some cowboys, men just like these crowding in on him, and he'd be damned if he'd let these weirdos do the same. He called out to them, saying he was going to give them a count of 3, telling them if they didn't clear out by the time he got to 3, he would open fire. This warning went unheeded, and true to his word, upon yelling out 3, Elfego opened up with that Colt 45 of his. One round shattered a cowboy's knee and another caught Parham's horse, causing it to rear and fall over on top of the slaughter ranch foreman. Now, I did read other versions that have the horse throwing him. Either way, the results were the same. Young Parham, the respected foreman of the slaughter ranch, lay dead in the street. Oh boy. Chingao. As soon as the smoke cleared and it was determined that Parham had indeed gone on to meet his Lord and Savior, another cowhand rode hell for leather to the nearby WS Ranch. Once there, he told wild tales of a Mexican uprising and the wanton slaughter of Americans. The way he was acting, you'd think General Santa Anna himself had been resurrected and was leading an army of walking dead Mexicans across the border. As you can imagine, this caused quite a bit of alarm. The following day, the WS foreman James Cook took a crew of his own cowhands and headed to Frisco Plaza, hoping to help the slaughter hands put down this dangerous revolt. Obviously, when they arrived, they learned the truth. There weren't no insurrection, just one ballsy Mexican kid with a fake badge, a dead cowboy, and another in custody. Now, before we go any further, I think it's important to point out the role that many ranchers and cowboys played when it came to keeping the peace, or more accurately, administering their own brand of justice, especially there in New Mexico. I was recently reading about how the famous New Mexican rancher John Chisholm and his cowhands, his cowboys, would implement summary justice, almost as if it was just part of the job. Hell, it was part of the job if you were a line rider. I mean, if you couldn't stop or deter would-be thieves, then you weren't cut out for that line of work. Chisholm himself once spoke about how several of his cowboys strung up a fellow cowhand for killing a well-liked foreman, someone just like young Parham, who Baca just killed. There was another situation where Chisholm's cowhands were executing justice once again, and another man asked the rancher why didn't he just let the authorities over in Las Vegas handle it, to which Chisholm replied that it wasn't his business to interfere in the cowboys' form of justice. And besides, it'd take too much time to ride all the way to Las Vegas. So as you can see, there was most definitely a culture surrounding the cowboys handling shit their own way. So them going after Elfego wasn't exactly unprecedented. That said, they did somewhat attempt to do things under the cover of law. They hit up Jenkins Saloon and took to drinking, of course, and waiting for an actual real lawman to show up, a white one. In this case, the law came in the form of a very unimpressive deputy, Dan Betchel. According to one source, he and his group arrived that evening full of zeal and whiskey. So at this point, we've got the Slaughter Ranch crew, the WS crew, Deputy Dan and his band of drunks, and who knows how many other cowboys that trickled in from other ranches. And they were all in a big race to see which one of them could drink up Milligan's supply of whiskey the fastest. Finally, the justice of the peace showed up. Now, I do not know if this was the same JP who fined McCarthy before or not. This guy here was named William W. Wilson. And upon his arrival, Elfego did the right thing and turned McCarthy over. Wilson then quickly tried the man right there in Jenkins Saloon. Tried him, fined him, and let him go. Just that quick. Pretty much exactly what would have happened in the first place, but unfortunately things had escalated and now there was a dead cowboy who happened to have some very pissed off and very drunk friends. They demanded that the justice of the peace issue a warrant for Baca's arrest, which he did, along with deputizing at least two of them, Jerome Wadsworth and William Hearn. By the way, Elfego had been in Milligan's initially, but once he saw the way the worm was turning, he quietly slipped out a side door and beat feet to a nearby jacal. Now, a jacal, spelled Jacal, is kind of a Mexican shack, sort of like an adobe meets a dugout. Imagine a kind of a picket house made up with sun-baked mud and the rest just wooden poles and kind of filled in with mud and grass. Evidently, the Native Americans of the Southwest utilized these jacals long before Europeans showed up. And once they did, they took to using them too. Probably be a cozy little shelter during a storm, but there ain't no jacal that can stop a slug fired from a Colt or a Winchester, as Elfego Baca would soon learn when the newly deputized cowboys and all their friends found him. And it wouldn't take long for them to find him. Upper Frisco wasn't exactly the type of bustling metropolis that one could get lost in. Once the angry drovers had the jacal surrounded and figured out Baca wasn't planning on showing himself, the deputized Hearn told the others he'd, quote, get that little Mexican out, and marched boldly to the door demanding Elfego surrender. Come on, just surrender so we can lynch you. Why won't you just let us murder you? When Baca didn't respond, Hearn took to kicking the entrance down, or at least he tried to, until Elfego finally had enough and gave his answer in the form of 245 slugs sent straight through the door and into Hearn's guts. He would die within the hour. In the meantime, all his cowboy friends immediately opened up fire on Baca, their bullets slicing through the thin walls of the jacal like knife through butter. And what followed is, according to one source, the highest volume gunfight in the history of the Old West. Now, I'm not too sure about that. Matter of fact, I'm positive that it was not the highest volume gunfight in the history of the Old West. I also mentioned earlier that it's considered to be one of the most lopsided gunfights. The reason being is the cowboys that surrounded Elfego that day were estimated to number 80 strong. Now, that's 80 against 1. That is pretty damn lopsided. Here's the thing, though. Nobody knows that for sure. Elfego claimed 80. Others claimed that the real number was more like 12. Probably the truth lies somewhere in the middle, like it almost always does. Doesn't matter, though. Even if there was just 12, those aren't good odds either. The only issue I have with the statement that it was the most lopsided or highest volume gunfight is because I think people are forgetting the last stand of Nate Champion. He was most certainly surrounded by well over 80 men up there in Wyoming. If I remember correctly, it was closer to like 200. And I will address the number of assailants on Baca again later on in this episode. But for now, it's 1884 and the Johnson County War had not yet occurred, and Nate Champion was still alive and well. And a young man by the name of Elfego Baca was hugging the floor as God only knows how many rifles and pistols were raining down hell on him. Don't get it twisted, though. Elfego Baca didn't spend this whole little standoff on the ground with his dick in the dirt. That little Mexican could give just as good as he could get, popping up sporadically and returning fire of his own. He sent a round through the hat of cowhand Charlie Moore, quickly followed by another that barely missed the man's face. Another one of Baca's bullets found the wall just inches away from the head of W.S. Foreman James Cook. Suffice it to say, these would-be vigilantes weren't full of enough liquid courage just yet to organize a charge and make targets of themselves. Instead, they were content with just taking pot shots at the jacal every now and then, and every so often mustering up a steady rate of fire, pretty much just hoping to get lucky. And the crazy thing is, they should have succeeded. Like I said, the thin walls of a jacal are in no way a barricade. All those pistols were punching through it like paper. So why the hell wasn't Elfego Baca so much as wounded? Well, some claim it was a miracle. More on that later. According to some versions, the cowboys would try to torch the jacal, but the fire wouldn't take. Soon enough, the sun began to set and things quieted down. In fact, things got so damn quiet that the cowboys began thinking maybe they had succeeded. They weren't hearing a peep out of Elfego, and, well, they figured he was El Dedo. However, there wasn't a man among them who was feeling froggy enough to go investigate. Nah, they'd wait till morning and then go check. Surely come sun up, they'd find their dead Mexican riddled with holes. Funny thing, though, the next morning, the delicious smell of cooking food wafted from the jacal. Not only was Baca not dead, but all that fighting got the young man a little hungry around the mouth. He fired up a little stove and fried himself up some tortillas and bacon before the morning fighting would commence. I got to imagine him just calmly cooking breakfast like that pissed off his assailants more than him being alive. Here they were nursing hangovers or taking some hair of the dog, thinking they'd probably got their man, and it turns out he was just in there casually fixing himself a morning snack. Wasn't too long before the cowboys answered this insult in the form of gunfire. Now, to the herder's credit, one of them would work up enough nerve to approach the jacal using a cast iron cover from a stove as a shield, a mistake he would not make twice. The man got a little too close for Baca's liking, and when he peeked over his makeshift bulwark, Elfego let loose a couple rounds, one of which grazed the man's head and sent him running and hollering, "He killed me! He killed me!" Believe it or not, this highly amused those other cowboys, causing them to break out in laughter. A strange thing was happening there in Frisco Plaza. First, this teenage lone Mexican decides to take on a mob of white cowboys, something that was completely unheard of in those parts. And then the Hispanic citizens, who did outnumber the cowboys, flipped the script a little bit and surrounded them. Now, they weren't being openly hostile, but they were yelling out encouragement for Baca, as well as a few threats every now and then to these no longer quite as bold cowhands. And this did cause the W.S. foreman, James Cook, to kind of pull in the reins somewhat. As the de facto leader of the mob, he did kind of sort of attempt to de-escalate things. Taking a different tactic, he sent a message in Spanish to Baca, maybe thinking that there was a little bit of miscommunication. Obviously, there was none, and Elfego answered this newest call to surrender with some gunfire of his own. Not sure which aggravated Baca the most. Their assumption that he couldn't speak any English, or them thinking he was dumb enough to just give up and let him hang him. No, sir. More gunfire was exchanged, and by the end of the second day, Elfego was still holed up in that jacal, and still very much alive. Finally, that afternoon, a deputy sheriff from Socorro named Frank Rose came riding into town with one of Elfego's amigos, who'd gone for help, Francisquito Naranjo. This is right around the time that other deputy, Betchel, finally poured himself off the bar stool and decided to make an appearance. The damn fool had set out the entire gunfight thus far, content just to lounge there at Milligan's and get his drunk on. And that's exactly where Sheriff Rose sent him back to, having no use for the man and realizing that the burden of simmering things down now lay squarely on his shoulders alone. Now eventually, between he and Naranjo's urgings, Elfego was persuaded to emerge from the jacal, covered in dust and debris, revolver in each hand. Revolvers he refused to relinquish. He was led back to Milligan's saloon, pistols at the ready, where, get this, he was placed under the guard of the WS Cowboys. I guess the idea was they were less inclined to lynch him because it wasn't their foreman who had been killed, the main threat being the Slaughter Boys. And also there's the fact that Baca was ready with those revolvers of his. Nobody was itching to try him face to face. The next day, November 1st, Elfego accompanied Deputy Rose and Naranjo back to Socorro with an escort of WS Cowboys, who Baca very smartly demanded ride 30 yards ahead of him. 19 years old or not, he weren't nobody's fool, and he damn sure wasn't trying to accidentally get shot in the back. Not a bad idea considering there were two separate plans to ambush and kill Baca during this trip, but both were foiled due to bad planning and corn mash whiskey. Elfego Baca did wind up spending a couple of months in jail there in Socorro. He was tried twice for the murder of Parham and acquitted twice. And that little 3-day gunfight there in Frisco was just the beginning of a long and colorful life. His next job would be that of a legitimate deputy up in Albuquerque, finally traded in that mail order badge for a real one. And eventually he would become the elected sheriff of Socorro County. Now, as sheriff, Elfego was more than a little unconventional. For instance, if there were prisoners who he felt were given unreasonable sentences, he'd just simply let them go. Also, when he was elected, there was this huge stack of outstanding warrants. Instead of just going out and rounding up all these bad guys one by one, he sent them letters. Letters that read something along the lines of, "This is Elfego Baca. I have a warrant for your arrest. Please come in by such and such date and give yourself up. If you don't, then I'll assume you intend to resist arrest, and I will feel justified in shooting your damn gringo ass on sight." Now, obviously, I'm loosely paraphrasing here, but you get the gist of it. Most of the offenders did turn themselves in voluntarily. After his stint as sheriff, Baca would work as both a lawyer and a private detective. A funny little incident from his lawyering days. He had this client that got arrested for murder, over an hour away. Upon hearing the news, Elfego wired his client saying, "Be there in an hour with 3 witnesses." Something tells me that Senor Baca, attorney at law, kept witnesses on retainer. In 1906, he moved back to Albuquerque and went into the newspaper business, published in the Spanish language La Opinión Pública, and helped form New Mexico's first chapter of the Spanish-American Alliance. He even ran for state Congress in 1912 when New Mexico gained its statehood, but he just didn't get enough votes. Now, back around this time, Mexico was experiencing a revolution. A revolution comprised of many different factions, some of which Elfego Baca would be involved with. As opposed to just sitting on the sidelines and seeing how everything panned out in the motherland, Baca became the official U.S. representative of Victoriano Huerta's Mexican government. He even helped bust one of Huerta's generals, a guy named Joe Salazar, out of an Albuquerque jail. Elfego was arrested for this, but the charges did not stick. The charges never stuck when it came to Elfego Baca. And of course, his legend only grew. Hell, he even had the pleasure of meeting Pancho Villa around this time. Not only did he meet him, but he stole one of his fancy rifles, an action that caused Pancho to place a $30,000 bounty on the old lawman's head. Of course, the bounty was never collected, and Baca would pose as an old man with that same rifle, long after Pancho Villa was gone. Now, the man he backed in Mexico, Huerta, didn't come out on top. And there was this other revolutionary, Celestino Otero, who decided to try to squeeze some money from Elfego. Some about his helping Baca bust General Salazar out of jail. The two men met up in El Paso, things got heated, and they both went for their guns. Otero got a shot off, grazing Baca's groin. But unfortunately for him, the 50-year-old Elfego still had it, and was able to put 2 rounds in Otero's heart. Another incident that occurred in Baca's later years that highly amused me was his run-in with a gangster by the name of Numero Ocho. I shit you not. So here's what happened. Baca took a job as a head bouncer in this Juarez nightclub called Tivoli. Now this place was popping, as the kids like to say. It wasn't just some old West saloon. It was a casino, a bar, a theater, all rolled into one. And they hired Elfego for the weight of his name. The idea being that the gangs would stop trying to shake him down if they brought in somebody with Baca's reputation. Well, the name Elfego Baca didn't impress this numero ocho guy. He and his gang considered themselves bad hombres, and they started talking about how they'd make quick work of this old has-been lawman from New Mexico. Sure enough, Elfego heard tell of these threats, and not wanting to just sit around and wait, he went looking for Mr. Ocho. When he found the gangster, the first thing he asked him was what kind of a man has a damn number for a name. A rhetorical question that was quickly followed by Baca open palm pimp slapping the ever-loving shit out of numero ocho.
Wild West pimp style.
That's right. Once again, y'all, I'm not making this up. He slapped Ocho in the face before he had a chance to answer. Then he punched him in the gut, and then, with numero ocho doubled over and trying to turn around, Elfego kicked the man so hard in the ass that it lifted him up off the ground. Go ahead now and tell me what you're going to do to me. Tell me like you've been telling everybody else. Baca hollered at the gangster. Nothing. Silence. Not only did numero ocho not do a damn thing, neither did any of his fellow gang members. And Elfego Baca would never have any more trouble from this would-be tough guy ever again. Dude is well over the hill at this point in his life, and I've seen pictures of an older Elfego Baca. He ain't exactly the epitome of physical fitness, but the man was just tough as nails, slapping around gangsters like they're some sort of a damn Trump pinata, robbing Pancho Villa, getting in gunfights all over the age of 50 and still coming out on top in every single instance. Now, at some point following his experience down there in Frisco, Baca would get married and have one son and 5 daughters. Later in life, however, it's said that he started hitting the bottle a little too hard, and as we briefly touched on prior, he became a bit of a womanizer. Despite these indiscretions, Elfego Baca would live a long, long time, passing peacefully in Albuquerque on August 27, 1945, at the age of 80. If you care to pay your respects, you can find him resting at Albuquerque's Sunset Memorial Park. The man was born at the tail end of the Civil War and died at the tail end of World War II, just a few weeks after we dropped the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Think about that for a second. The Civil War to Nagasaki. What an amazing span of time to be alive, from riding horses and covered wagons to nuclear damn weapons. Now, I guess I should mention that not everybody loved Elfego. Pat Garrett's biographer Leon Claire Metz called Baca a braggart, an insult that I find kind of rich. Talk about the pot calling the kettle black. But yeah, okay, Baca for sure wasn't perfect, and he most certainly inflated his actions, particularly in regards to that gunfight all those years prior in Frisco Plaza. And his life wasn't without controversy, such as his friendship and the support he gave for Albert Hall of the Teapot Dome scandal fame. With that said, Elfego did a lot of work for his fellow Hispanics and donated his time and services to the poor. And he never lacked ambition to be a public servant. Hell, he even considered running for governor shortly before his death. Speaking of governors, former governor of New Mexico, Bill Richardson, once said this of Elfego, quote, "The story of Elfego Baca demonstrates a man's will to preserve justice in a land in time of rampant corruption and bullying. Baca's bravery instilled hope to the native New Mexican people who upheld the laws of the land and refused to succumb to racial injustice." End quote. As for Baca himself, he was quoted as saying, "In those days, I was a self-made deputy. I had a badge I made for myself. And if they didn't believe I was a deputy, they'd better believe it, because I'd make them believe it." This from a man who once claimed that outlaws could hear his steps from blocks away. And I personally found it interesting that Elfego became a defense attorney. You know, he went from locking people up in jail to helping them to avoid it. And out of the 30 men that he defended in court, only one of them got sent to the pen. That's not a bad record. Okay, so as far as that famous gunfight in Frisco, like I said, he, along with others, claimed that there were 80 cowboys gunning for him. And a lot of articles you find on that fight will say over 4,000 rounds were fired into that jacal, with nearly 400 bullet holes in the door alone. But is any of this true? Well, I kind of like what a guy named Richard Dury wrote about Baca in an article titled "The Life and the Truth of Elfego Baca." You can find a link to this article in this episode's show notes. Dury writes, quote, "Baca's early interest in the law and his powerful reputation led him into a long and successful career in both law and politics. As such, he had a ready and willing audience to his glib tongue, and as many of the other Old West characters did, he was not above embellishing his story. The dozen or so shooters at Frisco Plaza soon became 80. The one casualty of the shootout became 4. One wounded man became 8. The 400 or so fired rounds became 4,000. with over 380 bullet holes in the door, end quote. So who the hell knows how many gunmen were involved or how many rounds were fired? Doesn't really change much though, right? Elfego Baca stood down an angry mob and he came out on top. He taught the people of Socorro County that they didn't have to just put up with being treated any which way. And he put those cowboys on notice, just like he said he would, showing them that there was at least one Mexican in that country who wasn't afraid of him. His actions in Frisco had made him a hero for everyone in that part of New Mexico who believed in law and order. And hell, even the cowboys who once wanted him dead had a grudge of respect for the young Hispanic lawman. Matter of fact, the W.S. ranch foreman, James Cook, remember him? Decades later, he sent Elfego a photograph with an inscription that read, "To Elfego Baca," in memory of that day in Frisco. And that's about all we've got, but I'm going to leave y'all with two interesting anecdotes when it comes to Elfego. The first is a quote that, let's just say it's got a whole lot of truth to it. Baca once said, quote, "If you think about punching someone in the face if wronged, punch them in the face. If not, you'll feel self-conscious about it the rest of your life," end quote. Woo! Do I even have to explain that? Now, obviously, don't go out and punch nobody. It is an interesting thought, though. I just really like that quote. Another Elfego Baca story goes that one day he and a guy were driving around through Socorro County. Now, this was later on in life when Elfego was an older man. And he pointed to a hill and said, "See that hill over there? I once shot and killed a man on that hill." "What was the man's name?" the other guy asked. "Hell, I don't know," Elfego replied. "I wasn't taking no census. I was there to kill the man." Baca biographer Kyle Crichton said, quote, "The life of Elfego Baca makes Billy the Kid look like a piker." Another guy, Harvey Ferguson, called Elfego, quote, "a knight errant from the romantic point of view, if ever the six-shooter West produced one." Are these guys laying it on a bit thick? Hell yeah, they are. Did Elfego exaggerate his actions? You'd have to have the faith of a child to think that he didn't. But who cares? All those guys I mentioned in the intro, guys like Wyatt Earp and Bill Hickok, they did the same thing. Was Elfego Baca one tough-ass son of a bitch? You betcha. I think he himself summed up his life the best in a 1936 interview when he said, quote, "I never wanted to kill anybody, but if a man had it in his mind to kill me, I made it my business to get to him first." Oh, and one last thing I keep forgetting. We never touched on why Elfego never got hit by any of those bullets that were getting pumped into that little shack. Whether it was 400 or 4,000 bullets, you'd think at least one of them would have drawn blood. Well, as it turns out, there was a plaster statue of the Nuestra Senora Donna Ana in that jacal with Elfego, and she didn't catch nary a bullet either. Many suspect that the Senora was looking over Baca, keeping him safe. Now that sounds nice, but the truth is the floor of the jacal was a good 14 inches lower than ground level. Elfego simply flattened himself during the heaviest of the firing, and the bullet snapped harmlessly above him. As previously mentioned, there was a Disney TV series called The 9 Lives of Elfego Baca. I'm really curious to see if any of y'all have seen it. I looked up showings online and I couldn't find anywhere where it's still in rotation, but you can watch a lot of it on YouTube. And it's kind of corny, but I mean, it's better than most of the crap on TV nowadays. And it stars the late great Robert Loggia as Elfego. Y'all might remember Loggia as the general from Independence Day, from that movie Big when he was dancing on that giant piano with Tom Hanks. Or my absolute favorite role of his, the frightening old school gangster Feech LaManna in The Sopranos. Now Robert Loggia, real name Salvatore, is not Hispanic. This dude's Italian AF. Sicilian actually. But it is crazy going through his acting credits and seeing how many times he was cast as a Hispanic or Latino character. I'm guessing back in the 50s or 60s, they figured if they got somebody with a vowel at the end of their name, it was close enough. How crazy was it, man, the way they cast ethnic people back in those days? My favorite is John Wayne playing as Genghis Khan. And yes, I do still pronounce it Genghis, okay? Fun fact, the town of Cerrillos, New Mexico is where Disney's The 9 Lives of Elfego Baca was filmed. It was also a stand-in for the town of Lincoln in Young Guns 1. There's just no denying that Texas produced its fair share of stone-cold killers in the latter part of the 19th century. Men like John Wesley Hardin, King Fisher, Clay Allison, the outlaw Sam Bass, and of course, the notorious Deacon Jim Miller. And then there's Bill Longley, considered by some to be one of the deadliest gunmen of all the West. A tall, brooding shootist credited with 32 kills, who was once described as the worst man in Texas. Join me today as we delve into the man who once said, quote, "I still alone tread the living land destitute of friends, but damn the world and every son of a bitch that don't like me. For I am a wolf, and it is my night to howl."
Wild West pimp style.
William Preston Longley was born on the 6th of October, 1851 in Austin County, Texas. Young William, or Bill as he would come to be known, was number 6 out of 10 children to parents Campbell and Sarah Longley, farming family who would move west to Lee County in 1853, where they'd continue to eke a living out of that soil. And it's there in Lee County, near the town of Evergreen, where young Bill would come of age, enjoying what appears to be a pretty normal childhood for the time and place. He received a decent education, at least up into his early teens, and grew to be a tall, strapping young man. A young man who, like many his age, was greatly affected by the Civil War ravaging the country. Now, Bill himself was too young to serve. By the time the war ended, he was still just 14 years old. And his father didn't serve either. An older man in his mid-40s when the hostilities began, Campbell Longley had fulfilled those duties years earlier, fighting as a young rebel during the Texas Revolution. Bill's brother Alexander, however, would see action in the war between the states, serving in the Confederate Army with Nelson's 10th Texas Infantry, service that would cost the young man his life at just 19 years of age. One would have to assume that this accounted for at least part of Bill Longley's hatred of Yankees, Yankee sympathizers, and freed black men, or pretty much anybody who represented the victorious Union Army or their cause. According to at least one source I've found, Bill, quote, picked many a fight with anyone he suspected of being a Yankee sympathizer or carpetbagger, and that he was known to whip any black man who crossed his path, end quote. As you'll soon hear, Bill Longley was not a fan of the black people. By the time he was in his late teens, Texas was under full swing Reconstruction, something that didn't sit too well with him or anybody else who was still wishing that the Confederacy had won. The great state of Texas was basically under military occupation, and their recent enemies, the Union officials, were now firmly in control. And I know this is a touchy subject, but a lot of people in Texas during this time did not much like the idea of all those slaves being set free. Shocking, I know. Men and women who were just slaves a few years prior were now just walking around, traveling where they pleased, and living life to the best of their abilities. These actions in and of themselves were considered cocky or arrogant, or sassy, as Bill Longley would put it in his own words when he said he was, quote, taught to believe it was right to kill sassy Negroes, end quote. Sassy. Now there's a word. Means audacious, bold, lively, and maybe a little mouthy. It was a character trait that Bill Longley was having no part of, at least not from no damn former slaves. He felt like it was not only his duty, but his right to put such people in their place. And it wasn't too long before Bill took to running with other teenagers who felt the same way. Delinquent hellraisers who would harass and even rob any freedmen who were misfortunate enough to cross their path. It was one such encounter that led to Bill Longley taking his first life there in Evergreen, shortly after his 17th birthday. They spotted 3 former slaves traveling through Evergreen in a very sassy manner and decided to rob them, forced the black men into a creek bed at gunpoint. And believe it or not, I really do think these youngsters were only planning on robbing these guys, and putting them in their proper place, of course. Whatever the intention, however, it all went to hell when one of the freedmen, a guy named Green Evans, tried to make a run for it. He wouldn't get too far before Bill Longley shot him deader than hell. As for the other 2 former slaves, they were simply absconded of their valuables and sent along their way. Now there in Evergreen where Bill lived, the locals didn't seem to mind this killing all that much. Or if they did, they didn't do nothing about it. Matter of fact, when Green Evans' former owner showed up in town to investigate the man's death, everybody just kept their mouths shut. Bill and his friends might have been little shits, but I guess they were their little shits. Still though, the 17-year-old Bill Longley wouldn't stick around for long. He was kind of paranoid about the Union soldiers finding out somehow and arresting him. And so, for the next year and some change, Bill Longley pretty much just roamed south central Texas. Him and his brother-in-law John Wilson, and yes, the pair continued to raise hell. Now, it's kind of hard to classify Bill Longley at this point in his life, or at any point really. He wasn't an outlaw, at least not in the classic sense of the word. He would never do any Jesse James type stuff like robbing trains or holding up banks. And what robberies he would commit seemed to be minor, and as more of a punishment of sassy black people than as a way of making a living. From all accounts, Bill enjoyed drinking, and like many notorious gunmen, he got mean when he drank. Still though, he would hold down jobs. Throughout his entire career, if you want to call it that, as a wanted man, he would have various jobs ranging from a farm field hand to a cowboy, and he was known to be a hard worker. And it was around this time that Bill began keeping company with other dangerous men, guys like the famous Phil Coe. Now, Phil Coe is someone I'm definitely going to be doing an episode on sometime in the future. At 12 years, Longley Sr., the Texas-born Co., was a veteran of the Civil War and would eventually drift on up to Abilene, Kansas, where he'd go down in history as Wild Bill Hickok's last confirmed kill. Definitely no stranger to violence, Philco, and I'm pretty sure Bill Longley was mightily impressed with the man, and likely yearned to be like him. Now that's just an assumption on my part, but as you'll soon see, Longley made a habit of comparing himself with others, along with aspiring to best their reputations as deadly men. As if to prove his bona fides as a legitimate killer, Longley and his brother-in-law murdered 2 more freed slaves, one in Bastrop County, and the other, a woman, back near his old stomping grounds there in Evergreen. Keep in mind that neither of these killings were in self-defense or a gunfight type situation. That fella over there in Bastrop County just committed the cardinal offense of owning a horse that Bill wanted, along with being black. As far as the woman, I don't know what she did to earn Longley's scorn. An overabundance of sass, I imagine. Before too long, Union authorities got wind of these senseless murders and offered up a $1,000 bounty on Bill's head. Now, that doesn't sound like a whole lot of money, but keep in mind this was 1870. Taking inflation into account, it was more like $20,000 in today's currency. Likely not wanting to stick around and see what sort of bad men might want to collect such a reward, Longley made a somewhat rational decision and got the hell out of Texas, possibly by joining up with a cattle drive headed north. We do know, however, that by May of 1870, the 19-year-old Longley had made his way all the way up to Cheyenne, Wyoming, where he joined up with a group of prospectors bound for the Black Hills of South Dakota. And this wasn't no tiny group of miners either. They were headed into the hills 130 men deep, led by a Judge William Kirkendall, a dangerous trip that saw the men plagued by Native American attacks almost from the get-go, and it would be a failed venture. Instead of striking it rich, the expedition would be intercepted by the Army and quickly sent back home. Now, this was back when the Black Hills were still being protected per the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868, before the boomtown of Deadwood was even thought of. Far from home, with no prospects and likely broke as hell, I guess Bill figured if you can't beat them, you join them. He signed that dotted line and swore in for a 5-year hitch with Company B of the 2nd Cavalry, stationed out of Camp Stomball, Wyoming. Now, with anybody else, this could have been a life-changing moment. A wild young man with no direction joins the military and finds purpose and discipline. Unfortunately, old badass Bill Longley didn't see things that way and almost immediately regretted this decision. The wild Texas boy would only make it about 2 weeks before trying to desert. Trying being the operative word. He was caught, he was court-martialed, and he was sentenced to 2 years of hard labor, wearing a ball and chain and making little rocks out of biggins. By the way, this Camp Stomball wasn't too far from present-day South Pass City in the Wind River Range. Wild, beautiful country, bitterly cold in the winter. Frigid temperatures that might have helped Bill serve a much shorter sentence than he should have. After just 4 months and during a brutal winter storm, Longley's post commander had pity and gave the young man a second chance and sent him on back to his company. Now, the 2nd Cav has a long, storied history, and they were involved a good bit during the Indian Wars. Matter of fact, they're still active today. Now known as the 2nd Stryker Cavalry, it looks like they were serving a tour in Afghanistan as recently as 2013. According to at least one source, they were the oldest continuously serving mounted regiment in the entire U.S. Army. And while I couldn't find any specific engagements between Company B and the natives, at least not during Bill's hitch, I'm sure he did spend a good amount of time outside the wire on patrol. I'm also sure he was probably tasked with plenty of mundane chores, the type that come with garrison life, mind-numbingly boring jobs that made him wonder if he was still a prisoner or not. That said, his accuracy with a rifle was noticed, and he would be sent out on regular hunting parties. Now, despite this newfound freedom, or possibly due to opportunities afforded him with this freedom, Bill would desert again, less than 2 years later in May of 1872. And this time I reckon he planned it out better because he actually got away with it. Hell, the man did such a good job at covering his tracks that we still don't know exactly what he was up to for the rest of that year. And to be honest, there's more than a little mystery surrounding his time in the military. According to Bill, he killed a man, a fellow soldier, with whom he had been defrauding the Army with. How true this is, I don't know. Maybe the best insight we have into the man is what a fellow soldier would later say about him, claiming Bill was, quote, an idle boaster, a notorious liar, a man of low instinct and habits, but tolerated on account of his good nature, gift of gab, and excellent marksmanship, end quote. By February of 1873, Bill was back in Texas where he was accused of killing yet another freed black man. This time again in Bastrop County, just east of Austin. Or was it Brown County? I don't know, I've read both. Hell, knowing this guy, maybe it was both. What would occur over the course of the next 3.5 years can only be described as one hell of a murder spree. At least if all the stories are true. By Longley's own account, he'd kill a total of 32 men during his lifetime. Big disclaimer, we don't know how accurate this number is. Captain Obvious over here, right? The numbers are almost always inflated when it comes to these Old West guys. And we'll talk more about the more accurate number later on. For now, let's just run through the events following his return to Texas and the killing of that freedman in February of 73. That summer, Bill would be caught riding with Frank Eastwood and his gang of Texas Hill Country bandits. But whether or not he was actually a member of the outfit is up for debate. The whole bunch of them were stuck in jail in beautiful Kerrville, Texas, when on the morning of July 29, 1873, a vigilante mob, air quotes, overpowered the jailers and strung all the men up. All of them except for Bill Longley. And I still can't figure out how the hell he got so lucky as to not join his companions dancing at the end of that rope. I'm guessing it was probably that reward money though. Sheriff J.J. Finney from Mason County just north of Kerrville hauled Longley's ass to Austin to collect on the bounty. However, the money wasn't too quick in coming, so he simply let the young killer go. Possibly persuaded to do so by bribes paid by Longley's wealthy uncle from California, Preston Longley, who I'm assuming Bill was named after. Troubled kid getting into fights at a young age, rich uncle from California. I'm getting some major Fresh Prince of Bel-Air vibes from Bill Longley right now. Things seemed to quiet down a little bit until March of 1875, when Bill murdered a friend of his from childhood, Wilson Anderson. Now this incident involved another of Bill's uncles, Caleb Longley, who somehow got into his head that his son's death was caused by Mr. Anderson. Evidence suggests that Anderson and the young Longley cousin got to drinking together and the boy ended up riding his horse into a damn tree, thus causing his death. Didn't matter though, he was dead and Caleb wanted blood. And who better to extract that blood than your homicidal young nephew, Bill Longley? Turns out it was a job he was well suited for. Bill found Wilson Anderson plowing a field and simply rode up on him and emptied both barrels of a shotgun. Not wanting to stick around and answer any questions to the law enforcement, Bill decided to hit the road. After a brief trip up to Indian Territory and a horrible lice infection, Longley would return back to familiar stomping grounds in Texas, still on the run and living under various aliases and working various jobs. And although he was a wanted man, he did have a lot of places he could go to where he didn't necessarily have to hide his true identity. He'd visit his parents on occasion or other family members. He had a sister in Salt Lake City he may or may not have traveled to see. And he even had some friends in law enforcement. As far as his immediate family is concerned, it wasn't all sunshine and kitty cats, though. Bill's father actually forbade him to speak with his younger siblings and suggested the young man head to Old Mexico. I guess Mr. Longley didn't like the heat or the shame being brought onto the good family name. Bill would not go to Mexico, however. Instead, he decided to get drunk with some friends and go fox hunting. Because why not? At some point during the hunt, Longley and one of the other hunters, a guy named George Thomas, started having words. Then things got physical. When the fight didn't seem to be going Bill's way, he decided to pull a gun out and kill the man. And once again, he was on the run. It was this murder, by the way, that really ramped up law enforcement efforts to apprehend Longley. Just 24 years old at this point, by the way. In January of 76, Longley would get into an actual, legit gunfight with fellow outlaw Lou Schroyer. And you know what they say about honor amongst thieves, right? Now, Lou was a former Union soldier who sniffed out Bill's true identity and conspired to kill the wanted man so he could collect that money. Bill got wind of these plans and decided to put Schroyer under before he got the chance. Now, remember earlier when I said Longley had friends in law enforcement, despite having a bounty on his head? Well, welcome to Texas in the 1870s. That thin blue line was mighty blurry back in those days. So blurry that when Bill decided to go kill Lou Schroyer, not only did he bring Uvalde Deputy William Hayes along with him, but he himself managed to get deputized as well. Yes, Bill Longley, wanted for murder, somehow convinced the mayor or someone over there in Uvalde to pin a damn badge on him. Guess he wanted to kill Schroyer under the cover of law. Alright, so what happened was Bill told Lou that he killed a cow and needed his help to butcher it. As the trio were riding out to where the alleged bovine lay, Lou got nervous, smelled a trap. Sure enough, he spurred his horse just as soon as Bill and Deputy Hayes pulled their guns. They shot Schroyer's horse out from under him, and Lou returned the favor, killing Longley's horse and putting a bullet in Hayes' thigh, causing his horse to bolt with him on it. That left just Lou and Bill, both of them on foot and trading bullets, as Lou dove behind some tall grass. Eventually, he would call out to Longley saying that he wanted to talk. Turns out it was just a ruse, though. When Bill approached the man carefully, Lou raised his pistol and Longley shot him dead, thus ending the only legitimate gunfight that Bill Longley probably ever got himself into. Fleeing once again, Longley found himself in Delta County, Texas, tiny little fart of a county east of Dallas and just north of Sulphur Springs. He moved in with a farmer by the name of Thomas Jack. It was pretty soon bit by the itty-bitty teeny-weeny thing they called the love bug, falling hard for Mr. Jack's 16-year-old daughter, Rachel Lavinia, or Miss Luvinia, as Bill took to calling her. Not sure what she called him, though, as he was going by the name William Black at this point, and I don't know if he ever confessed his true identity to his lady love or not. Can't be sparking no Delta County gal without a job, though. So Bill took up sharecropping with a minister, a Reverend Roland Lay, whose nephew, Mark Foster, also had the hots for Miss Luvinia. Oh boy, here we go. You know what happens next, right? Mark starts seeing Luvinia. Eventually, he asks for her hand in marriage. She accepts and gently breaks the news to Bill, and although he's heartbroken, he is supportive of her decision, saying, quote, "Luvinia, I don't like it one bit, but you know your heart better than anybody else, and although I love you, I want you to be happy. May God bless you and your new husband-to-be," end quote. And of course, that's not what happened. Now, Longley would later claim that he kept finding anonymous notes meant for him, warning him away from Luvinia. Notes he was sure were being left by that son of a bitch, Mark Foster. Eventually, he confronted Foster and beat the young man both with pistol and a horse quirt, and probably with the help of Lavinia's father, Thomas Jack, as both he and Thomas were soon jailed for the assault. Bill only spent 6 days in jail, though. He ended up burning a hole through the wall and escaping, finding the good Reverend Lay, whom he blamed for the whole damn ordeal, and gunning the man down with a shotgun. Again with the shotgun. By the way, I did find a Rachel Lavinia Jack on the 1880 census in nearby Lamar County, and it appears that the young lady was still single, so I guess she and Mark Foster never did tie that knot. As for Bill, it was time to hit the road once again, possibly up to Lee County, where he possibly busted a couple of bandit friends of his out of the custody of a Grayson County deputy sheriff. The next time we know for sure when old Bill pops up on the scene, he's hiding out in Louisiana under another assumed name, Bill Jackson, over in DeSoto Parish, and once again working for a farmer. Now, I got blood kin that were living in DeSoto Parish and directly across the border in Panola County, Texas, right around this time. And trust me when I say them people up there are still half outlaw, even nowadays. Bill Longley certainly wasn't the first wanted man to find refuge there on the Texas-Louisiana border. Nevertheless, it seems that Longley could play that Farmer John shit when he needed to, and he did once again develop a reputation as a hard worker. He even got in good with a local constable, June Courtney, to the point that he'd even helped the lawman make arrests on occasion. Wasn't too long before Constable June got a hold of a wanted poster that described his new friend Bill to a T. Upon further inquiry, the Louisiana lawman received word from Lee County, Texas, where the wanted poster was out of, that Longley was, quote, "the worst man in Texas. You will have to take advantage of him. He will fight, and he is a good shot," end quote. So, enlisting the help of some lawmen in neighboring Nacogdoches County, Texas, Constable June Courtney sent word to Longley to meet him at the courthouse to assist in an arrest. Bill fell for the trap, and when he showed up, it was he that was arrested without incident and immediately put into shackles. This was June 6, 1877, and the jig was up. Days later, without the benefit of extradition proceedings, Bill Longley was back in Texas in the Lee County jailhouse, waiting to be tried for the 1875 murder of his childhood friend Wilson Anderson. So if you're familiar with the story of Bill Longley, or maybe you just casually Googled the man prior to listening to this episode, you may be thinking to yourself that I've left out some of his other various adventures. Like the story of him killing his first man at the age of 16 when some fool dared to insult his father. Bill pulled out his revolver and emptied it at the son of a bitch. Or how Longley once killed his own trail boss on a cattle drive. Or his gunfight in Leavenworth, Kansas, with a drunken soldier who made the fatal mistake of insulting the great state of Texas. Or maybe you've heard of Longley living with the Shoshone after he deserted from the army, going on raids with them against their enemies, even raiding his old post, Camp Stoneball, and stealing horses. And then about how Bill headed on down to New Mexico fighting banditos and romancing spicy senoritas. And of course, there's a story of Bill riding with the infamous Cullen Baker gang. The only problem is most of these stories are either unverifiable or just verifiably untrue. Unfortunately, Bill Longley wasn't the most honest guy, and yes, he did have a reason for his tall tales, which I will get to very shortly. But the story of him riding with Cullen Baker is a great example of when we know for sure Bill was telling a fib. If you're not familiar, Cullen Baker, he was a legitimate nasty dude. He and his gang targeted both Union soldiers and civilians in Texas, Arkansas, and Louisiana from the end of the Civil War until Baker's death. Now, Longley claims to have fallen in with the gang in the spring of 1869. Story goes that the still teenaged Bill was merely traveling with one of Baker's men when they got captured by an angry posse who decided to string him up. As soon as Longley and his companion were dancing at the end of that rope, the purveyors of justice just simply rode off. This allowed another one of Baker's gang to shoot the rope right above Bill's head, thus toppling him to the ground before he strangled to death. He then claimed to have gone on to become one of Cullen Baker's top lieutenants. Problem is, Cullen Baker was already dead and in the ground when this story supposedly happened, by several months. And the whole shooting the rope thing is very hard to believe. Matter of fact, I'm pretty sure they tried that back in the day on Mythbusters and they just couldn't get it to work. Anyway, a lot of these stories came to light after Longley got arrested and he took to writing letters, trying to make himself out to be a more dangerous man than he actually was. Or I guess I should say trying to make himself out to be more dangerous than another very famous Texas outlaw, John Wesley Hardin. Turns out Longley was dead set on proving that it was he and not Hardin who was the most dangerous man in Texas. So he took to filling in the gaps with made-up stories about getting into gunfights and surviving hangings and all that kind of stuff. And how do I know that he made this all up? Well, he would eventually admit to lying about much of it. Longley's trial began in early September 1877 in Giddings, Texas, up there in Lee County. And due to Bill spending the preceding months inflating his reputation as a damn killer, it was a pretty short trial. One day was spent picking the jury, prosecution took 1 day to present their case, and the jury just took 1 hour to come back with a guilty verdict. Guess them 12 honest men didn't care much for Longley's stories either. And the punishment? Bill was to hang by the neck till he was dead. Let this be a lesson to you. You get arrested, keep your damn mouth shut. Bill literally talked himself into a hangman's noose. Now everything here was being done by the books, believe it or not. Longley wasn't just taken from the courthouse right after the verdict and strung up from the nearest tree. He was soon transferred down to the Galveston County Jail, a much harder jail to escape from, and began working on his appeal. It was also a time of reflection for Bill Longley, and he started regretting making up all them stories to sound like the biggest, baddest outlaw around. Even to the point of finally admitting that they were just that, stories, and that in reality he had only killed 8 men. Didn't matter much though, as his appeal was soon denied. And as if to add insult to injury, a few months later John Wesley Hardin, his rival, who was also on trial for murder at the same time, was sentenced to only 25 years in prison, something Bill considered very unjust, saying, quote, "Don't you think it's a one-sided thing to kill me for my sins, but only give Hardin 25 years? I reckon life ain't fair. And just like the great Clint Eastwood once said, deserves got nothing to do with it." By the way, I got to thinking, what would have happened had Longley and Hardin ever actually met up in real life when they were both in their prime? Would they have decided to see which one was the deadliest, or would their mutual bloodlust lend itself to friendship? Well, as it turns out, the two did meet, at least once, and very early in their careers. Matter of fact, Wes Hardin was only 17 at the time, and playing a rousing game of 7-Up in Bonham, Texas, when what he later described as a, quote, dark-looking man came up and started making threats. That man was Longley, and he had initially suspected Hardin of being a spy of some sort. The two ended up going to the horse races and even playing poker together before leaving on good terms, or at least good enough terms to not resort to gunplay. Later, though, once both men were behind bars, they'd start to criticize one another via the newspapers. During Hardin's trial, he claimed to have never had anything to do with Bill Longley, and that he only rode with men of honor, suggesting, of course, that honor was something that Bill didn't have much of. In turn, Longley spoke derisively of how Hardin needed so many men with him to kill Cuero City Marshal Rube Barrow, and how John Wesley and Jim Taylor murdered Charlie Webb, whom Longley described as, quote, one of the best and bravest men in the state of Texas. Now, I for one think that if the two men had decided to fight, that Hardin would have likely came out on top, as he was the more accomplished killer. However, it's not like either men were out there fighting a lot of pitched battles. They drank and they got mean and they killed mostly when they had the drop. So I reckon it'd just come down to whichever one of them happened to have the advantage, as well as their individual levels of intoxication. What do you think? Who'd win the bout of the Texas Bad Men, John Wesley Hardin or Bad Bill Longley? Now, Longley would make at least one attempt to escape, but it was no use. His fate was sealed and he knew it. This was around the time that he began recounting some of those stories and reflecting on his life. "My first step was disobedience," he wrote, saying further, quote, "next whiskey drinking, next carrying pistols, next gambling, and then murder. And I suppose the next step will be the gallows," end quote. It's also important to note that Bill would receive no visitors the entire time he was locked up. No family came to his trial or went to see him down there in Galveston. They hadn't completely abandoned their wild boy, though. Remember that rich uncle from California? Well, he started writing letters to then President Rutherford B. Hayes, seeking a pardon. Others in Texas, friends of the family, I assume, began a petition to get Bill's sentence commuted to just life in prison. But to quote Michael Scott from The Office, it was all just an exercise in fertility. By August of 1878, Bill was transferred back up there to Giddings under heavy chains. And with just 2 months left to live, he found God and converted to Catholicism. He even seemed to accept his fate at this point, saying that he was, quote, ready to abide by the decision of the jury, and telling his brother on the night before the execution, quote, I don't dread this at all. Tomorrow this time I will be in a much better place. When the day finally came, it was a Friday, October 11th, 1878. Although it was overcast, that didn't stop thousands from flocking to Giddings to watch the macabre event. Bill, however, wasn't too concerned with the weather. He spent that morning meeting with 2 priests and then had the jail guards join him in singing Amazing Grace. That's a song right there that I've always liked. Always hits me in the feels. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound. Saved a wretch like me. A wretch. That means a deplorably unfortunate person of despicable character. And I reckon I felt like a wretch most of my life. And I'm pretty sure there at the end, Bill Longley was feeling kind of the same way. Looking for that same grace that I've always sought after. And I can't help but wonder how Bill felt during that last day. Wonder if he had to sit there in his cell and listen to the sawing and hammering as the gallows he'd soon hang from were being built. I wonder what they fed him for his last meal and if he was able to keep it down. When the time came, Bill was marched to the scaffold in a black suit, adorned with a blue rosette arrangement on the lapel and a small Catholic medal hanging around his neck. And he was finally able to visit with a family member, a 10-year-old niece who came to say goodbye. Bill was given a drink of water and a cigar. Then at 2:15 p.m., he was ordered to head up to the scaffold. Noticing that the stairs were a little rickety, he warned the guards to watch their steps, joking that if a man wasn't careful, he was likely to break his neck on such a contraption. The death warrant was read. Bill discarded what was left of his stogie and then addressed the crowded throng of onlookers, saying in part, quote, I deserve this fate. It is a debt I owe for my wild, reckless life. One more prayer with the priest, and then the condemned man took his position over the trap door. A hood then placed over his head and a noose around his neck. At the preordained time, the executioner, using a hatchet, cut the rope, sending Longley straight to the ground. Uh-oh. Seems there was a miscalculation, and the rope was too long. Instead of a quick fall, a broken neck, and a swift death, Bill Longley was sent tumbling to the ground, still very much alive and in pain. At least one account I found said that the man landed on his knees. Obviously, this is no good, and it kind of got me to looking up information on hangings and various hanging techniques. Did y'all know we've been hanging our fellow brothers and sisters for one hell of a long time? At least as far back as the medieval days. The first mention of hanging in all of literature goes back to Homer's Odyssey. And the Vikings were possibly using hangings during religious ceremonies way back in the Iron Age. The last person to be officially executed in the United States of America via hanging was in Delaware in 1996. Other countries, however, still use hangings as their preferred method of execution. In places like Saudi Arabia, North Korea, Somalia, and Iran, you can still get your neck stretched. Remember Saddam Hussein? They hung his ass back in 2006 over there in Iraq. Seems like yesterday. As far as the art of hanging goes, there's basically 3 different methods. You got the short drop, which was probably the most common throughout history. As the name suggests, there's a short drop and you just strangle to death. Usually takes 10 to 20 minutes. Effective, but it's messy. Then there's the standard drop, where the fall is between 4 to 6 feet. Now this came into widespread use after 1866 and was considered more humane because it broke the condemned person's neck, causing them to immediately lose consciousness and a quick brain death, instead of just dancing at the end of a rope slowly strangling. And finally, there's the long drop, or the measured drop. Sort of a more scientific approach to the standard drop. Now this is interesting because it calculated a person's height and weight when determining how far they'd fall. Because guess what? You know how if a hanging is not done properly, then the prisoner will just choke to death? Well, if there's an overcompensation or a miscalculation, that could result in decapitation. That's what happened to the outlaw Blackjack Ketchum when he got hung back in 1901. His damn head just popped right off. The measured drop was sort of a sweet spot between strangulation and decapitation. And from what I can tell, it appears that this is the type of hanging that Bill Longley experienced. Only problem was the rope was too long, and so while his head didn't pop off, his neck didn't break either. Dude literally just stood there, noose around his neck, until the sheriff and a deputy physically hauled his body back up by the rope. And then Bill Longley had his final dance, gurgling and moaning, feet kicking for 11 long minutes, until he finally was at peace, dead at the young age of 27. His body was placed in a coffin and buried outside of the main cemetery, in an area where the blacks and Hispanics were buried, so I'm assuming this was somewhat of a pauper's burial. Once again, I find this interesting. If his immediate family couldn't afford to bury him, surely his rich uncle could. Turns out there may have been a very good reason why Bill's parents neither attended his funeral nor had him buried close by, which I will get to in just a moment. Either way, I guess it didn't matter none though. Their boy was gone. Or was he? Over 9 years later, in 1887, a newspaper ran an article claiming that Bill Longley's execution was a hoax and that he was alive and well, living the good life of a wealthy cattleman down in South America. Story goes that rich uncle from California bribed the sheriff and the deputies had a special harness placed on Bill just to make it look like he got hanged. And the newspaper's source was Campbell Longley, Bill's own father. Now, when I first saw this, my initial reaction was, okay, here we go. Bill's daddy must have fallen on hard times and decided to make a little money off his dead son's name. Maybe trying for a book deal or something like that. Turns out that's probably not the case. Turns out Campbell Longley's little lie about his son was most likely made out of compassion and a desire to lessen the pain of a grieving mother. Seems that Bill's mom, Sarah, never accepted the fact that her baby boy turned out to be a maniacal killer, and she couldn't accept the fact that he was executed. So to lessen her grief and stop her mind from fully shattering, the family concocted the story of Bill's escape. A story that was meant to just stay in their little inner circle, but somehow got leaked to the press. Man, I read how the family would even go so far as to write letters to Sarah from Bill. So fucking sad, man. Something about a mother's love. No matter what kind of piece of shit you turn out to be, to her, you're still that little boy that she had to clean and hold and feed. Happy little boy that went wrong. Well, Sarah would pass away in the year 1890, but the stories of Bill Longley escaping death didn't die with her. Hell, I even found one story that claims Longley lived long enough to finally perish as a passenger of the Titanic. No joke. Even nearly 100 years after his death, new stories were emerging from his alleged escape from the long arm of the law. In 1988, a man named Ted Wax wrote a book called Dead Man on the Bayou, in which he laid out the case that Bill Longley not only faked his death, but changed his name yet again to John Calhoun Brown, a wealthy Louisiana timberman who just so happened to be the author's grandfather. Now, all you Brushy Bill Roberts believers might want to pay attention to this next part. A computer-based comparison of photos of John Calhoun Brown compared to a known picture of Longley at none other than the Smithsonian Institute determined with high probability that the two men were one and the same. Likewise, a handwriting comparison analysis was conducted that backed up the photo comparison study. This sparked renewed interest in Longley's case, and after much effort, eventually his grave was located and dug up in 1998. Revealing a corpse that matched Bill's description, even down to the Catholic medal around the neck and a broken leg likely caused by the fall. These remains were sent to the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C., and in 2001, it was determined through DNA testing that this was the body of Bill Longley. Now the case is closed. And now I hope you all know how unreliable those photo comparison and handwriting analysis cases are. As far as how many men Bill Longley actually killed, I will refer you to an article by Marshall Trimble I found on True West magazine, titled Bad Bill Longley. In the article, Mr. Trimble asked Longley biographer Rick Miller, the author of the book Bloody Bill Longley, The Mythology of a Gunfighter, to clarify how many people Bill had actually killed. According to Rick Miller, the answer is just 5. At least that's how many he was able to corroborate and verify. Green Evans, the former slave that I mentioned as, being Bill's first kill, his childhood friend Wilson Anderson, who he was eventually executed for, George Thomas, the hunting buddy, the outlaw Lou Schroyer, and finally the Reverend Lay. Mr. Miller goes on to say that the rest of the killings appeared to be boasts in order to best the record of John Wesley Hardin, boasts that he came to regret when his appeal didn't work out the way that he was hoping. So what do you think? My opinion is there's a good chance Longley killed more than just those 5 I listed. 8 is probably a more accurate number. That's the number he himself would finally admit to at the end. And before anyone emails me saying that Longley was just a victim of his times and that the Yankee soldiers were so mean to him that he had no other choice, well, we're just going to have to agree to disagree. Bill lost a brother to the war, sure, but so did a hell of a lot of other Texans. From all accounts, Longley had a decent childhood. His family wasn't destitute and the soldiers didn't burn the farm down or anything like that. There is zero evidence that suggests Bill Longley was a noble freedom fighter or much of anything else other than a killer motivated by hate. I think it's safe to say, based on everything I've read, the most dangerous part about Bill Longley wasn't his skill as a gunfighter, but just his total lack of regard for the sanctity of life. By the way, one thing I forgot to mention was that Bill was said to favor a matching pair of Dance .44 caliber revolvers. Established in Columbia, Texas, I've been there, in 1858, The J.H. Dance and Company manufactured grist mills and cotton gins, but soon began making firearms as well during the Civil War, in an attempt to supply the Confederate Army with much-needed weapons. Over the course of the war, they made a few hundred of these so-called dance revolvers, which were pretty much designed as a mix between the Dragoon and the 1851 Navy revolvers. It's worth noting, however, that the only times we know for sure what firearm Longley used, it was a shotgun, as opposed to a pistol. So I'm not sure how often those dance revolvers were put to use. They probably did see action, though, during that gunfight with Lou Schroyer. There's a lot to Bill Longley, and I definitely suggest looking into the man a little more if you're interested. The book I mentioned earlier, Bloody Bill Longley, The Mythology of a Gunfighter by Rick Miller, and Wild Bill Longley by Dick Brownson would be great places to start.
Nobody knows for sure when the Comanche first got a hold of horses, but the transformation that followed was nothing short of epic. A once nondescript people living in the foothills of the Rockies, horses allowed the Comanche to push their way onto the Great Plains, dominating smaller tribes in the process and claiming the prime buffalo territory as their own. Wasn't long before Comancheria included a vast empire of nearly 250,000 square miles, stretching throughout the present-day states of Texas, Oklahoma, New Mexico, Kansas, and Colorado. And that's just where they called home. If you want to take into account the raiding capabilities of the Comanche, you're looking as far north as Nebraska and Wyoming, and south hundreds of miles deep into the heart of Mexico. As S.C. Gwynn so eloquently put it in The Empire of the Summer Moon, a Spanish soldier in San Antonio was in grave and immediate danger from a Comanche brave sitting before a fire in the equivalent of modern-day Oklahoma City. Hell, so feared were these lords of the southern plains that they were one of the main reasons the Mexican government encouraged American settlement in Texas. Figured the gringos would offer up some type of a buffer. Sure enough, just like the Spanish and the Mexicans before them, these newly arrived migrants from the east soon found themselves clashing with the Comanche, especially as more and more settlers began pushing into their territory trying to scratch a living out the dirt. And in those early years, there wasn't a whole hell of a lot that anyone could do about it. The Texans may have won independence from Mexico, but their newly acquired republic was, for all intents and purposes, still firmly in the hands of the Comanche Nation. Peace negotiations were broken on both sides. Raids and counter-raids were conducted, and entire bloodlines eradicated. Finally, when Texas was admitted to the Union in 1845, federal troops moved in and established a line of forts, attempting to offer at least a little protection to the settlers braving the edges of Comancheria. Believe it or not, many of these troops were infantry, and next to useless at waging campaigns against mounted warriors. And the dragoons didn't fare much better. Poorly equipped with swords and musketoons, these heavy-in-the-saddle predecessors to the cavalry were far too slow to pursue horse soldiers like the Comanche. So the attacks continued, exasperated by official policies that were astonishingly passive. Soldiers were not to fight hostiles until attacked, or unless they had clear proof that the natives in question had been directly involved in criminal acts. This meant that they were also forbidden from conducting punitive raids north into Indian Territory, aka present-day Oklahoma. From what I understand, this regulation was largely in place to protect the much friendlier tribes like the Cherokee and their allies, and to uphold a few tentative treaties already in place with certain bands of the Comanche. That said, a good number of the warriors soon deduced that they could strike Texas with impunity, and then skedaddle up across the Red River without fear of repercussion. Finally, in late 1857, the Dragoons of the 2nd U.S. Cavalry were redeployed to Utah to take on the revolting Mormons, thus leaving the frontier almost completely without protection. As you can imagine, attacks only increased, along with rumors of another great raid of the sort conducted in 1840 when Buffalo Hump and his warriors pillaged their way to the Gulf of Mexico. Texas Governor Hardin Runnels figured the only way to check these depredations was by calling up a regiment of Texas Rangers, who had mostly been disbanded following the Mexican-American War. Turns out this was a pretty common practice. In the years 1850, 1852, 1855, and 1857, the Rangers had likewise been temporarily activated with limited state funding and then disbanded. To lead this latest force, Runnels chose none other than the legendary John Selman Rip Ford. Ford, at this time, was in his early 40s and working as a newspaper editor in addition to teaching Sunday school. Almost any given night, you'd be more likely to find him studying his Bible rather than worrying over military tactics.
Be that as it may, Ford did have quite a well-deserved reputation as an Indian fighter. Served as a ranger under the famed captain John Coffee Hayes in his younger years, losing a finger to the Comanche in the process and even catching a poison arrow, a wound that still bothered him years later. Along with fighting hostiles, Ford also rode with the mounted rifles during the Mexican-American War, at which time he earned his iconic nickname. Tasked with sending death notices to the families of fallen soldiers, Ford would finalize each letter directly under his signature with the phrase, "Rest in peace." As casualties mounted, this was shortened to RIP, and the name stuck. Wasn't long before his fellow Rangers took to calling him Old Rip. Now, the plan in 1858 was for Ford to raise a regiment of Texas Rangers and lead a preemptive strike up into Indian Territory, hopefully catching the Comanche with their pants down. And his orders from Governor Runnels were explicit. "I impress upon you the necessity of action and energy. Follow any trail and all trails of hostile or suspected hostile Indians you may discover, and if possible, overtake and chastise them if unfriendly." This was followed by Runnels making it abundantly clear that Ford and his Rangers were to brook no interference whatsoever from anyone, i.e. the U.S. Army or Indian agents, who attempted to prevent them from accomplishing this mission by crossing the Red River. Thus charged, Rip began heading north, recruiting volunteers as he traveled until he had a force of just over 100 Rangers. A base camp was set up not far from Fort Belknap, dubbed Camp Runnels, a little bit of ass-kissing in that name choice if you ask me, and Ford commenced organizing and drilling his men. Officers were chosen, many of whom had previous experience engaging hostiles and Mexicans alike, and each Ranger was outfitted with a long rifle and a minimum of 2 Colt revolvers. They tried to get a shipment of the newer model Navy Colts, but these were controlled by Major General David Twiggs, who just so happened to command the Department of Texas. Twiggs refused, saying that he weren't going to issue the guns unless Ford and his men agreed to be placed under federal command. Considering that the Rangers had plans of defying federal policy, openly declaring war on the Comanche, and invading Indian Territory where they had zero legal jurisdiction, federal oversight was about the last thing they wanted. With that in mind, they did still do all right with the slightly older revolvers that they had at their disposal, and Ford boasted that his Rangers could shoot a total of 1,500 rounds without needing to reload, a tremendous advantage when it came to mounted warfare. In years past, when relying solely on single-shot muskets and pistols, your average teenage Comanche could fire off 20 or so well-placed arrows in the time it took for an experienced Texas Ranger just to reload. With Sam Colt's equalizers, this was no longer an issue, and what's more, they could also be effectively wielded from the back of a galloping pony. As the Rangers continued to train, future Texas Governor Sol Ross, then just a nervy 19-year-old, moseyed on down to the neighboring Brazos Indian Agency to recruit a passel of friendly natives, the bulk of whom turned out to be Tonkawas. Now, if you're not familiar, it's thought that the Tonkawa arrived in Texas a little before the Comanche, settling down in the central portion of the state where the town of Round Rock now stands. They aided the Texans during the Revolution with Mexico and got along well with settlers for the most part. Still, though, by the early 1850s, they, along with the Caddo, Anadarko, Waco, and a few other smaller tribes, had been forced to settle on what was known as the Brazos River Reservation, some 12-odd miles south of Fort Belknap. And they, just like the settlers, fell victim to the Comanche raiders from the north. Make no mistake about it, though, the Tonkawa were fierce fighters, and they certainly needed no special incentive to fall in with the Rangers and exact a little revenge. Their leader on this jaunt would be the 70-year-old, yet still tough as nails, chief by the name of Placido, known to his people as Hashukana, or Can't Kill Him. Placido's mother, ironically, was a Comanche captive. Just goes to show how far back things had been uneasy between the two tribes. Also joining the Tonkawa would be an additional smattering of fighters from the tribes I mentioned a moment ago. The Waco, Caddo, Anadarko, hell, even a few Shawnee. All total, there would be 113 reservation warriors, along with a specially recruited scout by the name of Kichi, who had once lived amongst the Comanche. By the way, this episode goes out to Evie. Hope I pronounced that right, short for Genevieve. Evie, hopefully you're listening. Do me a favor and stop what you're doing right now and go give your dad a good swift kick to the balls. Don't hold back, he can take it. No, seriously, thank you, Evie, for listening. Sounds like you're a pretty cool young lady, and your dad, Jeremy, sounds okay, I guess. Thanks to both y'all for listening. Really means the world to me. Back to the story. Captain Ford saw that 2 light wagons were loaded with powder and supplies, but not really much in the way of foodstuffs. This campaign was to be conducted in the old way, much like it was years prior under John Coffee Hayes. The Rangers would travel light and hard, they and their indigenous compadres fending for themselves and subsiding off of what they could hunt along the way. Likewise for their horses. There was no feed, so they'd have to make do just like the Comanche mounts and settle for whatever grass was available. Thus provisioned, Captain Ford led the column of a little over 200 men north on April 22, 1858, and despite federal policy, immediately crossed the Red River into Indian Territory. Later, when pressed on whether or not there was any hesitation, Ford stated that his mission was to find Indians, not learn geography. Now, before we go any further, I do want to say another quick word on the Tonkawa, who were accompanying these Rangers. Any cursory search on Google is sure to unearth a ton of stories involving the tribe's penchant for cannibalism. This is a little misleading. While the Tonkawa did engage in ritual cannibalism on occasion, the key word here is ritual. They weren't out there just running around hunting humans down for food. As far as I can tell, this practice was done with the idea of absorbing their vanquished enemies' power rather than filling empty bellies. Is it strange to us nowadays? Absolutely. Hell, it was strange to the Comanche and other tribes even back 200 years ago, which I believe was another reason why the Tonkawa did it. It scared the shit out of their enemies. So yeah, the Tonkawa did engage in a form of ritual cannibalism, but they were not subsiding off of human flesh. And the only reason I bring this up, I do think it's important to differentiate, because these claims historically, in the years past, were blown way out of proportion, and oftentimes used as an excuse to commit genocide, particularly on the Tonkawa's neighbors to the south, the Karankawa. Also, you may read that the Tonkawa are now extinct. This is false. There are several hundred enrolled members of the tribe living and thriving up in Oklahoma. They even have a website if you want to check it out, TonkawaTribe.com. And after crossing the Red River, it was these Tonkawa who was riding point for the Rangers, scouting far ahead, searching for sign. After about 2 weeks in the saddle, the Tonkawa reported seeing a string of Comanche camps on the Canadian River. Sure enough, the following day, May 11th, they and the Rangers spied a few Comanche hunters in the distance, chasing buffalo. Knowing the main bunch would be close at hand, Ford commanded his men to set up a cold camp and keep the noise at a minimum. That night, he sent out some more Tonkawa scouts to kick up additional intel. Turns out them buffalo hunters had a small village of less than a dozen lodges just a few miles away on Little Robe Creek. Easy pickings for Ford and his men. Furthermore, there were reports of an even larger village further to the north. And if you're looking for this location on a modern-day map, this is far western Oklahoma, damn near on the border with the Texas Panhandle, and from what I can tell, just north of the Antelope Hills. Just before first light on the following day, May 12th, the native scouts wrapped their heads with cloth, just as a way so the Rangers wouldn't confuse them with the enemy. They then asked for and received permission to open up the dance on that tiny village. What followed was a swift yet brutal attack as the Tonkawa caught the sleeping Comanche completely unaware. Damn near everyone was killed, men and women, and what few survivors there were taken captive. Regarding the death of the women, Ford later defended these actions by saying it was not an easy matter to distinguish Indian warriors from squaws. From there, the column continued on to the larger village, and once again, Ford sent in the Tonkawa and other reservation warriors. This time, though, the Comanche were ready, rallied by the courageous old chief Iron Jacket. Forgive me for not attempting the man's Comanche name, I don't think I'd do it justice, but it roughly translated to Trotter. Be that as it may, to the Mexicans and the Texans, he was known as Iron Jacket, on account of an old Spanish coat of mail that he wore into battle. Not a lot is known about Iron Jacket, but he was likely around 60 years of age at this time, and described as both a war chief with dozens of raids under his belt, in addition to being a powerful medicine man with the ability to, quote, blow bullets away with his breath. Likely a reference to that Spanish armor, which no doubt had deflected a few arrows and poorly charged musket balls in previous battles. With this big medicine and a whole hell of a lot of balls, Iron Jacket rode out alone in front of the Rangers and Tonkawas, and began taunting and challenging them to individual combat. Nonplussed, Ford ordered a volley of shots, some of which found their mark and knocked the old warrior from his horse. Sure enough, though, living up to his reputation as being able to repel bullets, Iron Jacket quickly rose to his feet and notched another arrow. A second volley was fired, and at least one of these rounds did what no other bullet had yet been able to do. As old Iron Jacket collapsed and lay breathing his last, Captain Ford gave the order to draw revolvers and charge. Now, the death of Iron Jacket momentarily broke the morale of the Comanches. Many fell back, leaving just a few staunch fighters standing their ground who, incidentally, were quickly felled by the pistols of them charging Rangers. As was their tendency, the Comanches did attempt to slow down the attackers long enough to allow their women and children to retreat. As such, a small group of warriors gathered on the banks of Little Rope Creek in an attempt to make a stand of it. Their efforts were not in vain, as a few lucky family members were able to flee to safety. But these Comanche paid dearly for their courage, each of them soon killed by the determined Texas Rangers and their Brazos Reservation allies. According to one participant, a Sergeant Bob Cotter, quote, Captain Ford was everywhere, directing and controlling the movements of his men. The fight then devolved into a run-and-gun battle, stretching miles over the prairie as the mounted Rangers rode down what survivors they could find. Sensing that powder and lead were running low and the horses were likely nearing exhaustion, Ford finally gave the command for everyone to fall back to the conquered village and regroup. After all, by this point they had been fighting for a good 6 hours straight. As the Rangers and the Tonkawas were taking a brief moment of rest, several hundred additional Comanche warriors appeared in the distance, led by Iron Jacket's son, Peter Nakona, who himself was the father of future Texas legend, Quanah Parker. What happened next is something that few white men had ever witnessed. For the better part of an hour, there was a standoff, with the Comanche and Tonkawa meeting in the middle for individual hand-to-hand combat. According to Captain Ford, quote, the mind of the spectator was carried back to the days of chivalry, the joists and tournaments of knights. The whole performance was a novel show to civilized man, end quote. Apparently, the Tonkawa were getting the worst of these bouts, so Ford finally ordered them to advance en masse, a bluff of sorts that he hoped would draw the Comanche down out of the hills. Peter Nakona failed to take the bait, so an impatient Ford ordered his Rangers forward at a trot. Once within distance, the command was given to charge, and once more the fight was on. The Comanches, although outnumbering their attackers by at least 2 to 1, soon found themselves outmatched by the leadership of Ford and the firepower of all them six-shooters. Got to imagine they were also still suffering from the shock of losing Iron Jacket and just getting attacked out of the blue right there in their own country. Despite all this, Peter Nakona and the other chiefs were able to effect a somewhat orderly retreat, organizing the warriors and fighting a series of delaying actions as women and children ran for safety. Once again, there was a running gun battle, stretching for miles, and once again the fighting ended with Ford's concerns of worn-out men and animals. Also, the captain had just learned from a captive that there was an even larger village further downriver under the leadership of Buffalo Hump. Miraculously, only one ranger was killed in the entire day's action, along with a Waco warrior, both of whom were lanced. They left an estimated 75 dead Comanche in their wake and took 18 women and children as captives, along with 300 Comanche horses. Per usual, the villages, or what was left of them, were razed, and the next morning the triumphant Rangers headed south. By May 21st, they were back in Camp Runnels, where Ford got busy writing up his after-action report, stressing that he and his men were so successful that all future pursuits of the hostiles should be undertaken in a similar fashion. The Comanche can be followed, overtaken, and beaten, providing the pursuers will be laborious, vigilant, and are willing to undergo privations, Ford wrote. This led to vigorous debates in Texas as to who was better qualified to protect the frontier, Rangers or the U.S. Army. Sam Houston himself, in the months that followed, would claim that they no longer needed federal troops, but instead, give us 1,000 Rangers and we will be responsible for the defense of the frontier. Only problem was a little too much money was spent in this endeavor. And you know how politicians can be with money. Declaring a quick win, Governor Runnels nixed Ford's plans for future punitive expeditions, and then, to save cost, went ahead and once more disbanded the Texas Rangers. The Comanches and their allies would continue as a force to be reckoned with their raids only increasing in the years to come, as most Texas men of fighting age would head east for the Civil War. Wouldn't be for another decade and a half until the backs of the Comanche were finally broken at the Battle of Palo Duro Canyon. And even then, it would take the slaughter of over 1,000 horses and the destruction of hundreds of lodges. The Tonkawas would help out with that fight as well, and for their efforts, they were kicked off their land and sent packing up to Indian territory with everybody else. Of course, by that point, old Pete and Nakona and Buffalo Hump were already dead, and Rip Ford had retired down to Brownsville, where he found himself elected as the mayor. Not quite as exciting as Indian fighting, but I imagine dealing with small-town politics can be a whole hell of a lot more dangerous. And that's about all I've got on the Battle of Little Rope Creek, sometimes referred to as the Battle or Campaign of Antelope Hills. When Johnny Ringo rode out of Tombstone for the very last time, he was drunk, and had been for quite a few days. The mysterious and oftentimes sullen gunfighter had helped celebrate America's 106th birthday by going on a bender. And judging by the liquor bottles stashed in his saddlebags, he wasn't planning on the festivities ending anytime soon. A few days later, Ringo shows up at a ranch about 20 miles to the north, and he's still drinking. Likewise, even later when he runs into Cochise County Sheriff's Deputy Billy Breckenridge. According to Billy, it was barely past midday, and Johnny was so damn lit he was having trouble staying in the saddle. What happened next is a mystery, but the following day, Johnny Ringo's lifeless body was discovered by a teamster. His feet wrapped up in a torn shirt, his cartridge belt on upside down, and a noticeable piece of his scalp missing, seemingly cut away with a knife. The official coroner's report would rule Johnny Ringo's death a suicide. After all, he was found with a pistol in his hand and a single bullet hole to the head. But is that what really happened? Why would a veteran of so many battles choose to take his own life? And where was his horse? Why was he barefoot? And who the hell cut off a piece of his hair? While we're at it, who the hell was Johnny Ringo anyway? And could he really speak Latin? John Peter Ringo was born on May 3rd, 1850 in Wayne County, Indiana. His parents, Martin and Mary, would move the family to northern Missouri a few years later, and then, when Johnny was just 14 years of age, they packed up and headed for California. It seems the elder Ringo was suffering from tuberculosis and figured the drier climate out west might help alleviate his symptoms. It was the year of our Lord 1864, and the Ringos had joined up with a wagon train out of Liberty, Missouri. As exciting as I'm sure this was for a youngster like Johnny, the family soon learned just how hard life could be on the trail. In the course of just one day, Ringo witnessed a boy around his age fall from a wagon and get crushed to death under the heavy wheels. And then just a few hours later, the wagon master got into it with a teamster and ended the argument with a well-placed bullet to the head. Still, they pressed on. Indian sign was plentiful, and the train even had a few close encounters, but it was nothing compared to the tragedy of July 30th. As Johnny's father Martin was stepping down from a wagon, he accidentally shot himself in the head with a shotgun. An onlooker reported seeing Martin's brains scatter in all directions, as his hat went soaring 20 feet up in the air. The Ringos would bury their patriarch right there on the side of the trail, and somehow muster up the strength to keep on a-pushing west. Eventually, they arrived in San Jose, California, where Johnny would spend his formidable years. By 1870, a 20-year-old Ringo is listed on the federal census as a farmer, but would soon depart for Texas soon thereafter. It's there in the Lone Star State where Ringo would befriend a former Texas Ranger by the name of Scott Cooley and find himself balls deep in a little something known as the Hoodoo War, aka the Mason County War. While the extent of Ringo's participation is somewhat up for debate, he most certainly rode with Cooley, at least for a little bit, and Ringo helped gun down Mason County rival James Chaney. Johnny was arrested, stuck in jail in Lampasas, but soon escaped. Got arrested again, this time by Texas Rangers, and was looking at some pretty serious prison time for the killing of Chaney. Ended up filing an appeal, and it worked. There was a new trial, no witnesses were willing to testify against him, and Ringo went free. Of course, by this time, the fighting there in Mason County was pretty much done. I really hope to dedicate an entire episode to this feud one of these days, if for no other reason than to take a closer look at this Scott Cooley character. Dude was orphaned as a kid after his parents were killed by hostiles and raised by the Williamson family there in Mason County before joining the Texas Rangers. It was the murder of his adopted father, Tim Williamson, at the hands of the Vigilantes, or Hoodoos, that kicked off the Mason County War. And apparently Cooley was not a man to be trifled with. He also wasn't afraid of taking a scalping knife to his victims, but that's another story for another day. Interestingly enough, once Ringo was released from jail, he ended up running for and getting elected by a pretty wide margin as constable in the nearby town of Loyal Valley. But adventure was calling. By 1879, Johnny traded in his badge and headed west to Arizona, where he promptly shot a man in a saloon for refusing a complimentary drink. Now, the guy he shot, Lewis Hancock, would survive, but Ringo was quickly developing a reputation as a mean-tempered drunk. He also began associating with a little group known as the Cochise County Cowboys. Maybe you've heard of them. I don't want to make this episode a deep dive into the Cowboys and their beef with the Earps, or even just the general history of Tombstone. I'm saving all that for an upcoming series, but suffice to say that there was no love lost between Johnny Ringo and Wyatt Earp. Same goes for Earp's good friend Doc Holliday. In contrast, Ringo made fast friends with fellow Earp enemy Ike Clanton. The pair trafficked in stolen cattle together, allegedly, helped to rig an election, and even filed a joint claim on some land over in southwestern New Mexico. Now, Ringo was not present for the notorious shootout at the OK Corral, but a few months later, he damn near brought about its sequel. A drunk Johnny Ringo confronted Wyatt Earp and his brother Virgil there on the streets of Tombstone. Said he wanted their blood, and he wanted their souls, and he wanted them now. The Earps refused to take the bait, and that's when Doc Holliday steps in. Now, Doc and Ringo were already beefing. Back when Holliday was in jail on some trumped-up charge, his gal pal Big Nose Kate decided to leave Tombstone, and it was Johnny who financed her departure. Whether Ringo did this out of the kindness of his own heart or for services rendered, I do not know. But you got to imagine this didn't sit too well with Doc. And sure enough, here Doc was ready to play. "That's just my game," he tells Ringo. "I'm your Huckleberry." To which Johnny replies, "You're my what?" "Huckleberry." Okay, and what exactly is a huckleberry?" "They're like blueberries, only bigger, and a little more tart. They're also the state fruit of Idaho." At this point, Ringo's getting visibly frustrated. Tells Holliday that he knows what a huckleberry is, and that they're delicious and all, but look, man, I'm out here talking about taking souls, and you're comparing yourself to a GD fruit. What gives, Lunger? Looking a little embarrassed, Doc admits that he wasn't entirely sure what his point was. Said it just sounded good in the moment and that he went with it. Why, Johnny Ringo, I declare I've never given it too much thought. I suppose I could have gone with a Georgia peach, but that would have been a little too Shut up! Just shut up! Either throw down or shut your mouth, because honestly, dude, you are making absolutely no sense right now. To which Holliday replies, "You're a daisy if you do." At this point, Ringo just completely loses it. His left eye starts twitching, his face flushed red with anger, and instead of asking Doc what the hell flowers had to do with anything, he just went for his gun. Luckily, his fellow cowboys were able to grab him from behind at the last second and drag him off. And further hostilities were avoided. Okay, so maybe I did kind of improvise that dialogue from Tombstone, just a little, but you get the gist of it. In reality, neither huckleberries nor daisies were discussed, but Ringo, Wyatt, and Doc Holliday did exchange words right there on the streets of Tombstone. And in real life, it was not Johnny's fellow cowboys who pulled him away. It was a Tombstone police chief by the name of James Flynn. Matter of fact, all three of them got hauled to court, with Doc and Ringo being fined $32 each. By the way, if you're a new listener and you're under the impression that Doc Holliday said hucklebearer as opposed to huckleberry in Tombstone, I got an episode on that you might find interesting. Link in the show notes. In December of that same year, Virgil Earp would be ambushed and seriously wounded. And just 3 months later, in March 1882, Wyatt's younger brother Morgan was assassinated. Worth pointing out that before Wyatt killed Frank Stillwell, Frank allegedly confessed that there were several others involved in the murder of Morgan, including Curly Bill Brocious and Johnny Ringo. Not sure how true this is, but Earp and his avenging angels soon embarked upon their vendetta ride and began systematically gunning down the Cochise County Cowboys. "I see a red sash and I kill the man wearing it." Well, in all actuality, the Cowboys did not wear red sashes, but Wyatt and his men did succeed in taking out Curly Bill and a few others. At this point, Sheriff Johnny Behan formed his own posse, comprised of several members of the Earp-hating Cowboys, including the now deputized Johnny Ringo. The big showdown never occurred, though, and in mid-April of 1882, Wyatt led his Avengers out of Arizona. Johnny Ringo was 32 years of age, and unbeknownst to him, he'd be following Curly Bill to the grave in less than 3 months. And yeah, we pretty much covered the circumstances surrounding his death at the beginning of this episode. Ringo gets a big drunk on during the 4th of July festivities, continues drinking pretty much nonstop, and on July 14th, 1882, Johnny was found dead against a tree in West Turkey Creek Valley, about 60 or so miles to the east of Tombstone, with a single bullet hole to the head. And the big question is, who killed Ringo? Well, according to the official coroner's report, his death was ruled a suicide. We'll touch on that in a moment, but I think it's safe to say that not everybody buys that theory. Some think that Doc Holliday was to blame, as portrayed in the movie Tombstone. The problem with this explanation is that Doc was hundreds of miles away in Colorado. He had once again gotten himself into trouble, as he tended to do, and at the same time that Ringo was laying dead in the desert, Holliday was pleading not guilty to larceny and posting bail in the town of Pueblo. Then there's the Wyatt Earp theory, which is even more popular on account of Wyatt himself claiming that he was the one who killed Ringo. He later denied it, but once more, years later, claimed it again. This is almost certainly not true, though, on account of Wyatt also being in Colorado at the time of Johnny's death. Gunnison, to be exact. And in the case of him and Doc Holliday, there are period newspaper articles and even court records proving that they were indeed up there in Colorado. Then there's a guy by the name of Michael O'Rourke, a.k.a. Johnny Behind the Deuce. Not to be confused with Jimmy Can't Take a Deuce, because he ate too much queso and unripened bananas. Now, Michael O'Rourke was arrested in Tucson, Arizona in January of 1881 on suspicion of murdering a mining engineer named Harry Schneider. Story goes that Wyatt Earp had helped to protect him from a lynch mob that had been organized and led by Johnny Ringo. O'Rourke escaped jail in April of 81 and was last seen not too far from the Dragoon Mountains, well-mounted, well-equipped, and headed straight the hell out of the territory. As far as I know, Michael O'Rourke's fate is a mystery. According to some, he was killed by the outlaw Pony Deal in the year 1882, and the pony killed him on account of O'Rourke killing his pal Ringo. If I'm not mistaken, the only evidence or source of this information comes from former Tombstone resident Fred Dodge, who shared it with author Stuart Lake. And finally, the one that I think most people believe, at least from what I've noticed, is Buckskin Frank Leslie. Guy famous for killing somebody in Tombstone and then just a few days later marrying his widow. Supposedly Frank had been a scout for the army, hence his buckskin attire, but it looks like there's not really a lot of proof of that. Matter of fact, not a whole lot of evidence for many of Frank's claims, like his stories about serving as a deputy in Abilene under Wild Bill Hickok, or selling the Ocean Blue and working as a cowboy in Australia. We know that in the late 1870s, Leslie was working as a bartender in San Francisco before heading to Tombstone, where he went partners in the Cosmopolitan Saloon. Now, Frank's lies notwithstanding, he apparently knew how to handle himself. In addition to the killing that I just mentioned, Frank also did for Billy Claiborne, survivor of the gunfight at the OK Corral. I guess Billy came into the bar one night and started getting verbally abusive. Leslie told him to leave. A few minutes later, there's a confrontation outside, and Frank shoots Claiborne dead. He also got into a running gunfight with the Apache in March 1883, came out on top, and he did serve as a scout for the Army against Geronimo in the summer of 1885. Kind of. A newspaper out of San Francisco, where he used to live, ran an article in 1886 stating that for many years, Leslie was a chief of scouts, held in confidence by General Crook, and that he personally knew Geronimo. A rebuttal was soon published in Los Angeles, however, stating that in truth, Leslie was only a scout for a few weeks before getting fired for his inability to, quote, tell a trail from a box of flea powder, end quote. The article does specify that while Frank was, quote, no scout, he is no dude. He has killed 2 men under circumstances of Arizona propriety, is a fine shot, and could ride farther and harder in a day than any other white man you can rake up with a fine-toothed comb. As to him enjoying General Crook's confidence, I guess it isn't necessary to say anything, but you ought to have heard the quiet old general laugh when I showed him that dispatch. End quote. Frank would get divorced in June of 1887 and shack up with a new gal named Molly Edwards. The relationship was cut short in the summer of 89, though, when Frank caught Molly with another man and shot her dead. He pled guilty and was sentenced to life in prison. And it's while behind bars that Frank began telling folks that he was the one who killed Johnny Ringo. Also, Billy Claiborne's last words, allegedly, back this up. Legend states that as Billy lay dying, he told a friend, Frank Leslie shot Johnny Ringo and I saw him do it. Okay, so who the hell is telling the truth here? And why is there so much mystery surrounding the death of Johnny Ringo? Well, let's back up and take a slightly closer look. There's a few more details that don't always get mentioned. For instance, when Ringo was in Tombstone partying, celebrating the 4th, he ominously told a newspaperman that he was, quote, certain of being killed as he was of living. Said he might run along for a couple more years or he may not last 2 days. Okay, that's a little strange, but hey, we all say stuff when we're drinking, right? Sometimes in vino es veritas, and sometimes it's just talk for the sake of talking. A few days later, Johnny leaves town, several bottles of whiskey in tow, and is next seen on the Dial Ranch about 20 or so miles to the north, and he's still drinking heavily. A couple of days later, on July 13th, is when Deputy Billy Breckenridge runs into Ringo, and surprise, surprise, he's still drinking. According to the deputy, quote, Ringo was very drunk, reeling in the saddle, and said he was going to Galyville, however the hell you pronounce it. It was in the summer and a very hot day. He offered me a drink of the half-filled bottle of whiskey, and he had another full bottle. I tasted it, and it was too hot to drink. It burned my lips. Knowing that he would have to ride near all night before he got to Galyville, I tried to get him to go back with me to the Goodrich Ranch and wait until after sundown. But he was too drunk and stubborn and went on his way. I think that was the last time that he was seen alive. That evening, around 3 p.m., a nearby rancher hears a single gunshot, and the next day is when the teamster found Ringo's body. By the way, that single gunshot is in contradiction to Wyatt Earp's claim that he had an actual gunfight with Ringo, that several shots were exchanged. Another, by the way, when Johnny's body was found, his horse was not with him. It was found miles away, still saddled, with Ringo's boots hanging off of it. From what I understand, that was a common practice in those days when making camp, just to keep scorpions and other creepy crawlers out of your boots. Now, as I touched on at the beginning of this episode, Johnny's feet were both wrapped up in a torn shirt. And oddly enough, his cartridge belt was on upside down. If that's not weird enough for you, Ringo was also missing a small portion of his hair and scalp, with marks indicating that his head had been cut on with a knife. None of this really contradicts the official findings of that coroner's jury, though. At least not to me, and matter of fact, I tend to agree with them. If you don't mind, I'll share with you what I think happened. Now, we know for a fact that Ringo was on a several-day bender. I think he was drunk off his ass, having a hard time staying in the saddle, and he stopped to sleep it off. Probably was planning on taking Breckenridge's advice and resuming his journey after the sun went down. He wakes up a couple hours later, still drunk, likely a little disoriented. I'm sure craving a cold drink of water, something fierce, and trying to remember the last time he had any good food in his belly. And then he notices that his horse had wandered off. A frustrated Ringo gets up in a rush, puts his belt on upside down, and sets out to find his pony. He likely only makes it a few steps before Arizona's rough terrain reminds him that he wasn't wearing no boots. So he pulls off that undershirt, tears it in two, and wraps his feet up. He makes a half-assed attempt at locating his mount. It's nowhere to be found, so he just sits down at the base of that tree and, tragically, decides that enough is enough. By all accounts, Johnny Ringo was a troubled young man. Despite wearing a badge on a couple of occasions, he was constantly finding himself in and out of trouble. Also witnessed his fair share of death, including seeing his own father's brains blown out the back of his head. And all that liquor he'd been using to keep these demons at bay wasn't working so well no more. You know, that's what nobody tells you. After a while, you're not even drinking to feel good. You're just drinking to maintain. And when you're fighting devils in your head, and maintaining ain't always enough. My opinion is that Ringo was tired of fighting. He almost certainly wasn't in his right mind. And in an act of desperation, he pulled his pistol, placed it against his forehead, and squeezed the trigger. While I doubt anyone will ever know exactly what transpired, I do think suicide is the most logical explanation. It's also important to note that a few people who knew Ringo stated that they had seen it coming and that he had supposedly threatened to off himself in the past. He was described as polite and introspective, but also morose, sullen, and when he drank, he became violent. That's another thing that cannot be discounted, his drinking. While alcohol abuse isn't always a cry for help, it does usually point to some form of self-medication. Ringo wasn't just drinking to relax or to help fall asleep. He had a sickness inside of him, the kind that'll eat your soul up if you're not careful. And I think that's unfortunate. You know, life can be hard and we face shit sometimes that seems impossible to overcome. And it's in such dark moments that people, sadly, sometimes choose to no longer play ball. They opt out. And I'm thinking that's what happened with Johnny Ringo. If you ever find yourself in the same spot, stop. Don't do anything you can't undo. If you're struggling, seek help. There are people you can reach out to. The suicide prevention hotline is always open. All you got to do is dial 988. That's it. 3 digits. 988. They got veterans. They got people that speak Spanish. They have people that will listen. So before you pick up your gun, pick up your phone. Give someone a call. And remember, man, nothing lasts forever. Nothing. All right. As far as the missing piece of Ringo's hair is concerned, it is strange, but it's also certainly not out of the realm of possibility that the teamster who found his body decided to take a trophy. Now, please fact check me on this, but I'm pretty sure there was a lock of hair taken from Wild Bill after his death, and I'm also, for some reason, thinking that the same thing happened to Jesse James, but I could be wrong. So all that said, what do you think happened to Johnny Ringo? Did he take himself out? Was it Doc Holliday? Was it Buckskin Frank Leslie? Or maybe even Wyatt Earp? Now, Johnny Ringo was buried near the base of that tree where his body was found. You can visit his grave, but it is on private property, so make sure you get permission first. I'd hate to see you get buried there too. Now, earlier I posed the question as to whether or not Johnny Ringo could speak Latin. I mean, that is arguably one of the coolest scenes from Tombstone, right? Turns out it's probably not true, though. Not sure where this legend began, but in all actuality, Ringo did drop out of school at the age of 14 when his family left Missouri. He never attended college, and there is no indication that he spoke a lick of Latin. Furthermore, and this is likely going to anger a couple of people, but Johnny Ringo's reputation as a deadly gunman has been blown way out of proportion. And this goes all the way back to the time of his death. The Grant County Herald, out of Minnesota of all places, reported the following just a few days after Ringo's death. During the past few years, 32 men dared to doubt his honor. They now fill 32 graves. Although he, Ringo, had many competitors in his line, he had no true rivals. And Curly Bill and Billy the Kid could not bear comparison with him. Okay, but the truth is Johnny Ringo only killed one person that we're aware of. Well, 2, actually. That old boy James Chaney back in the Mason County War, and 7 years later, himself. His only other known shooting was when he shot that guy in the saloon for refusing that drink. And of course, this is not to say that Ringo definitely never shot anybody else. This is just all we're aware of. No telling what the hell he got up to with them cowboys. And since we're on a roll debunking shit, it's worth noting that his real name was Ringo. Okay, sometimes you'll see him referred to as Johnny Ringold, and his name was reported as such in newspapers, even when he was still alive, but that was a mistake on their part. Official records do prove that his last name was indeed Ringo. So yeah, very cool name, just maybe not quite as deadly as he's been portrayed over the years. Not to say he couldn't have been. Lots of stories about how good Johnny was with a gun, and I don't doubt he had the nerve. Look, what I'm trying to say is Johnny Ringo was a pussy, okay? And if you don't like it, then you can go to hell. No, I'm not saying that at all, on either account. No, this is a very common thing when we're talking about Old West figures. So many of these people had reputations that weren't necessarily true. And there's other people, some of whom we've never even heard of, whose body counts would put these guys to shame. All right, and I guess that's about all I've got this week on Johnny Ringo. Back in the summer of 1874, the Comanche and their allies went on the offense. Turns out a bunch of uninvited buffalo hunters were invading their territory, and, well, they didn't much appreciate that. This turn of events would lead to the Second Battle of Adobe Walls and the Red River War, a conflict that saw Colonel Ronald McKenzie and the U.S. Army crisscrossing the Llano Estacado in order to finally defeat the Comanche for good. And they were successful. Mostly due to McKenzie striking at their winter camp, destroying their lodges, along with their supply of winter food, and killing over 1,500 head of Comanche ponies. Without provisions or shelter for the winter, and especially without their lifeblood, the horses, these lords of the southern plains were, effectively, defeated. By June of 1875, Quanah Parker and the last of the holdouts surrendered at Fort Sill, and that was it. The Comanche were on the reservation, the buffalo were mostly gone, and all that prime real estate was free for the taking. While the legendary Charles Goodnight may have been one of the first to run cattle near the Palo Duro Canyon, other folks soon began putting down roots some 90-odd miles to the northwest at a place called Tascosa. First, just a small collection of New Mexican sheep herders, weren't long before Tascosa began filling up with Texas cattlemen and ranchers hoping to claim their piece of all that wide open land. And they did so at breakneck speed, turning the tiny sheep town into the cowboy capital of the plains, and an economic rival to Dodge City nearly overnight. Massive ranches like the LS, the LX, the Frying Pan, and even the storied XIT, which is still around today, by the way, all began running cows in the area as Tascosa became the hub of all cattle shipping and supplying in the Texas Panhandle. That being the case, Tascosa was about as wild of a town as you could hope to find back in its heyday, especially lower Tascosa, which soon came to be called Hogtown. That's where you could find all the brothels and the cheaper, seedier saloons. You may remember from the recent series on Billy the Kid about how the regulators called Tascosa home after the Lincoln County War. Billy the Kid, Doc Scurlock, and Dave Rudaball all walked the cowtown's dusty streets, as did other legendary Old West figures like John Selman, Henry Newton Brown, Pat Garrett, and Charlie Siringo, just to name a few. And then there were others, men perhaps you've never heard of, like Ed King or Poker Tom or Lewis the Animal Boozman. And of course, we can't forget the Catfish Kid and Squirrel-Eyed Charlie. Sounds like a bunch of made-up names, I know, but what if I were to tell you that not only were they all very real citizens of Tascosa, but that they also participated in a shootout that eclipsed the famous gunfight at the OK Corral, both in shots fired and dead bodies? Oh yeah, today we're going to take a little trip up to the Panhandle and visit a town described by some as tougher than Tombstone, deadlier than Dodge, and as damnable as Deadwood. This tale has a little bit of everything. Double-crossing dance hall gals, an action-packed gunfight, Boot Hill, a ghost town, and hell, I'll even top it all off with a nice little Old West love story. The LS Ranch got its start in 1880 when an old boy from Kansas named Lucian Scott purchased over 35,000 acres in the newly settled Texas Panhandle. Not long thereafter, he went into business with cattleman William McDowell Lee, and by 1883, the ranch had nearly doubled in size. Everybody was making big money, and by everybody, I mean the large spreads like the LS. Investors from back east in Europe got involved, the smaller operations were squeezed out, and even the poor hard-working cowboys began feeling the burn. Not only were they stuck making a paltry sum of just $30 a month, but they were also barred from the age-old tradition of branding mavericks and taking partial payment in calves. The only real hope any of these youngsters had in building capital of their own. So they went on strike. According to newspapers at the time, between 200 to 300 Texas Panhandle cowboys, including them employed on the big ranches, all walked off the job shortly before the big spring roundup of 1883. They posted a list of demands, most of which were calling for a substantial raise in pay, and cautioned that anybody who ignored these stipulations would suffer the consequences. Oh my. Ultimately, the whole thing didn't amount to a hill of beans. The striking cowhands soon ran out of money and were forced to return back to their employers, 10-gallon hats in hand. Them that would take them back, that is. Many of the out-of-work cowboys soon found themselves blacklisted and unable to find work within several hundred miles. So some of them just took out their frustrations on their former bosses. Fences were cut, livestock was stolen, and pastures were burned. Hell, one group of out-of-work cowboys even took to calling themselves the Get Even Cattle Company. Now, how much of this rank thievery and mayhem truly occurred is somewhat contested, and the strike, as well as its aftermath, were largely blown out of proportion by the newspapers. That said, there was enough of a problem with stolen livestock for the big spreads, namely the LS, to bring in some outside help. And who better to call than the former sheriff of Lincoln County, New Mexico himself, Pat Garrett. Still high off his reputation as being the man who killed Billy the Kid, Garrett signed on at $5,000 a year, over $150,000 in today's money, and formed what was called the Home Rangers. Now, I'm not certain how official this group was. Legend has it that Pat Garrett received a commission from then Texas Governor John Ireland, but no such record has yet to be discovered. So whether or not they were officially official, or this was just sort of a wink and nod type of deal, either way, I'm pretty positive that Garrett and the LS Ranch had the full approval of the Texas government. With that in mind, I do think it's important to point out that these guys were not Texas Rangers, despite using the name Ranger in their title. According to historian Leon Metz, many of the smaller ranchers and homesteaders, thinking that these developments were just a way for the big cattlemen to take over the entire country, started to sneeringly refer to Garrett's outfit as the LS Rangers. And they might have been onto something, as the Rangers' ranks were packed with LS employees, some of whom coincidentally had been with Garrett over at Stinking Springs when he arrested Billy Bonney and Rudaball and them others. Hell, Jim East, the sheriff of Oldham County, where Tascosa is located, was also a former deputy of Garrett's, and he flat out warned Pat about these new recruits, saying that he didn't want nothing to do with them. And I reckon Pat, to his credit, soon came to the same conclusion. Garrett quickly caught on to the fact that he was basically being paid to kill folks for the big outfit, as opposed to bringing them to trial, so he simply handed in his papers and the LS Rangers were disbanded. But they didn't just go away. Like I said earlier, most of them worked for the LS Ranch, and they continued to do so even after Garrett's departure. And even though they were no longer officially quote-unquote Rangers, that didn't stop them from trying to throw their weight around. And oh boy, throw it around did they, albeit mostly in Tascosa's various saloons and gambling establishments. So much so, in fact, that they soon earned themselves yet another nickname, the Barroom Gladiators. And, well, let's just say not everybody was a fan. Especially not Tascosa bartender Lim Woodruff, who had the misfortune of being one of the victims of barroom gladiator leader Ed King. Now, I found several references to Ed King being an ex-Texas Ranger, but once again, I'm not sure how true that is. I think this probably just alludes to King's time as an LS Ranger under Pat Garrett, but I could be wrong. One story I found, straight from a Tascosa old-timer, stated that while Ed did indeed have at least one notch on his gun, he was mostly just a hard-working cowboy who earned an honest living. Problem was, when King got all liquored up, he was, quote, easy on the draw, and didn't mind going on the offense. And not only had King recently stolen the aforementioned Lim Woodruff's girlfriend, a dance hall gal by the name of Sally Emery, but he also took to openly mocking the bartender, calling him Pretty Lim, slapping him on the face, and get this, even forcing Woodruff to call him Daddy. Woo! There's only so much abuse a man's willing to take, though, right? And I'm pretty sure being forced to call another grown man Daddy is getting right to that tipping point. And sure enough, Lim Woodruff was about to teach Ed King a lesson in manners that he wouldn't live long enough to forget. And it all came to a head in the still dark early morning hours of March 21st, 1886. Ed King and a few of his buddies, Johnny Lang, Frank Valley, and Fred Chilton, had themselves a real good time over at Hogtown before headed back into Tascosa proper at around 2 a.m. They tied their ponies up at the Equity Bar and began to head inside. All of them except for Ed King, that is. Little Miss Sally Emery had just finished her shift over at Jenkins Saloon, and the two were headed back to her place for a little early morning rendezvous. As it turns out, Ed wouldn't make it. Right about the time that Chilton, Lang, and Valley were disappearing inside the Equity, somebody held King from the shadows. Stepping forward to investigate, Ed was rewarded by a bullet slamming square into his face. He falls to the dirt, Sally Emery screams and takes off running, and sure enough, here comes Lim Woodruff, emerging from the darkness with a smoking Winchester in his hands. Seeing King struggling to breathe, Lim levels the rifle once more and, at nearly point-blank range, squeezes the trigger, forever putting an end to King's days of slapping bartenders. Now remember, the ex-Rangers' buddies are right across the street over at the Equity. They come spilling out in time to see Woodruff hightailing it towards Jenkins Saloon and give chase. Not seeing anybody out front, they then beat feet around back, only to run smack dab into the man they was a-hunting, Lim Woodruff. Only thing is, now he's got friends as well. Poker Tom Emery and his brother Squirrel-Eyed Charlie, Lewis the Animal Boozman, and the awesomely named Catfish Kid. There weren't no love lost between this bunch and them barroom gladiators, to say the least, and gunfire erupted instantaneously. Despite both Woodruff and Squirrel-Eyed Charlie being on the receiving end of bullets, this fight would be an unmitigated disaster for Ed King's would-be avengers. Frank Valley was the first to fall, and depending on the source, he was either shot between the eyes and dropped dead on the spot, or he took a bullet through the nose, of all places, and lingered painfully for about an hour before finally cashing in his chips. Either way, he was out of the fight right at the get-go, and his companion, Fred Chilton, didn't last much longer himself, taking several rounds through the torso as he lurches to his knees, feebly handing his revolver off to the last man standing, Johnny Lang. And I think it's safe to say that at this point Lang, now outnumbered 5-1, needed all the firepower he could muster. Shooting as he ran, Johnny retreated for cover with the bullets kicking up dust all around him as he finally made it out of the kill zone and back to the Equity Bar. It was there that he found Sheriff Jim East and his deputy Charlie Pierce, who were likely wondering what in the living hell had just popped off a block away. They accompany Lang back to the Jenkins Saloon where they see somebody hop up from behind a woodpile and try to make a run for it. 3 pistols bark in unison and the Catfish Kid falls to the ground, writhing and moaning in pain. Johnny Lang and the 2 lawmen press forward, looking for the others, but by this point they had already made their getaway. And a few moments later, so did the slippery Catfish Kid. Turns out he weren't hit at all and just sort of instinctively dropped at the sound of those guns and played possum as the lawmen passed him by. As soon as they turned their backs, he was gone as well. And thus ended what's now known as the big fight at Jenkins Saloon. Like I said, Squirrel-Eyed Charlie and Lem Woodruff were wounded, but they would ultimately pull through. Johnny Lang never received a scratch, but all 3 of his buddies, Ed King, Frank Valley, and Fred Chilton, were buried at Tascosa's Boot Hill the following day. Now, despite Woodruff and them others escaping into the night, they would all soon be arrested and charged with murder. The first trial resulted in a hung jury, and the second saw all 5 acquitted. And for the most part, they all stayed out of trouble for the rest of their lives, at least as far as I could find. Except, of course, for the Catfish Kid. I mean, with a name like that, it's hard not to get into trouble, right? Now, obviously, that wasn't his real name. It was John Go, and he was, by all accounts, a troublemaker of the first order. Shortly after the gunfight at Jenkins Saloon, Catfish would gun down an unarmed man and be sent to prison, where he died in the year 1890. Ironically, after choking on a catfish bone. Squirrel-Eyed Charlie Emery would be next, passing away in 1897. By the way, that wasn't his real name either. It was apparently Charles Arnhem. And his brother, Poker Tom, was Oscar Arnhem. And old Oscar would follow Charlie to the grave in 1914. I was unable to determine a cause of death for either man. Lem Woodruff ended up moving to Hot Springs, Arkansas, where I assume he refused to call anybody else daddy, and passed away in the year of our Lord 1902. Lewis the Animal Boozman lived quite a long life, making it all the way to January of 1942, before giving up the ghost in Oklahoma at the age of 83. Interestingly enough, Lewis Boozman also once rode with Pat Garrett. He was one of the men who helped kill Tom O'Folliard, and it was he and Jim East who carried Charlie Bowdry's dead body back to Bowdry's widow, Manuela. And surviving all of them would be Johnny Lang. He'd go on to become a marshal in Amarillo, take part in the Klondike Gold Rush in Alaska and Canada, serve in the Philippines during the Spanish-American War, and even get involved in politics as the mayor of Haines, Oregon, before finally crossing that veil on April 4th, 1942. And by the way, I was joking about the Catfish Kid choking on a fish bone. He really did die in prison in 1890, but it was due to tuberculosis. Now, I know what you're thinking. What about that dance hall girl, Sally Emery, a.k.a. the Helen of Tascosa? Well, despite her yelling and running away as her boyfriend Ed King was murdered, Sally was most certainly no wilting flower. A few years prior to the big fight, a cowboy by the name of Bill Gibson, once again an alias, his real name was Frank Norwood, rode into Hogtown looking to spend some of his hard-earned money on whiskey, women, and fun. Bartender John Malley happened to notice the cowpoke flashing money around, so he sent in Sally Emery to soften the mark up. Sally lured Gibson back to her crib, and once the poor bastard was in a post-coital slumber, here comes John Malley, creeping in, killing Frank Norwood, and stealing all his money. A few months later, the victim's brother, Ed Norwood, rides into town and likewise begins flashing money around. And he too was seduced by Sally Emery, or so it seemed. Truth be told, Ed knew exactly what had happened to his brother, and he was planning on exacting some good old-fashioned revenge. Norwood laid there in Sally's bed for hours, pretending to be drunk, as he waited for John Malley to arrive. Finally, weary of waiting on the bartender, Ed just got up out of Sally's bed, sashayed on over to the dance hall, and put a bullet straight into Malley's chest, right in front of everybody. And thus another addition was added to Boot Hill. Unfortunately, I was unable to find out any more on Sally Emery. I have no idea what her origin story was or whatever became of her. Apparently, Sally just faded away into history, much like the town of Tascosa itself. First, the railroad passed them by, causing many of the citizens to pack up and move. And then, in the winter of 1886 and 87, you had a cattle-killing blizzard known as the Big Die-Up. which bankrupted many of the area ranchers. Today, although home to an organization for at-risk youth, not much remains of old Tascosa. You can still visit the courthouse, which is now the Blevins Museum, and there's even some remnants left of the old stone sheep pens built by Tascosa's very first inhabitants. And yes, you can visit Boot Hill, where the graves of Ed King and his pals are still plainly visible, as are many of the dozens of others who came to a premature end there at the cowboy capital of the plains. And dead though the town may have been by the turn of the century, the same could not be said for the love between a gambler and a certain dance hall gal with a heart of gold by the name of Frenchie McCormick. Not her real name, but at this point, who the hell's keeping tabs? Now, Frenchie first came west as a teenager and fell in love with a gambler by the name of Mickey McCormick in some smoky old saloon over in Mobeetie. The two lovebirds migrated further west to Tascosa and began working in the various saloons and gambling joints of Hogtown, where, according to Mickey, he always won at cards when Frenchie was by his side. They both lived there in Tascosa during its wild days. They both knew Billy the Kid. They were there during the big shootout, and they were both there when the railroad bypassed the town and its eventual decline. And although Tascosa began to crumble, their love for each other did not. The gambler, Mickey McCormick, died there in 1912, and once everybody else finally left town, Frenchie stayed on, by herself. Said she couldn't bear to be too far away from her man. For over 27 years, Frenchie McCormick remained in Tascosa, all alone. No running water, no electricity. Until 1939, with failing health, she finally allowed herself to be moved under one condition, that after her death, she be brought back and buried right next to Mickey. And she was. After passing away in 1941, somewhere around the age of 90, Frenchie and Mickey were reunited once again. And I guess that's about all I've got on Tascosa and the big fight at Jenkins Saloon. One thing to note, the version of the gunfight I recounted in today's episode is not the only version. What else is new? I think the same could be said of every single fight we've ever covered here on the Wild West Extravaganza. Now, if you have any further information, anything I didn't cover in this episode, if you're an expert on all things Tascosa, please don't hesitate to hit me up, josh@wildwestextra.com. And also just email me if you want to say hi. If you've got any complaints, topic suggestions, whatever, hit me up.
47 years. That's how much time passed between Wyatt Earp leaving Arizona and his death. Nearly 5 decades spanning from 1882 to 1929, and yet we don't hear too much about it. Granted, the first 35 years of Earp's life were chock full of excitement. From the rough cow towns of Wichita and Dodge City to the boom towns of Deadwood and Tombstone. Toss in the famous gunfight at the OK Corral, the storied Vendetta ride, and friendships with other Old West legends, guys like Doc Holliday, Luke Short, and Bat Masterson, and you've got one hell of a fascinating story. But what about the rest of Wyatt Earp's time on Earth? 47 years is a lifetime. On the last episode, we had some fun discussing the movie Tombstone, the whole Huckleberry debate. But you do remember how that movie ends, right? Wyatt joins Josephine in Denver, and they start dancing in the snow while Robert Mitchum's voice nicely sums everything up. Wyatt and Josephine embarked on a series of adventures. Up or down, thin or flush, in 47 years they never left each other's side. Wyatt Earp died in Los Angeles in 1929. Among the pallbearers at his funeral were early movie stars William S. Hart and Tom Mix. Tom Mix wept. Now, I know the movie is called Tombstone, so it's only natural to focus on that part of Wyatt's life. But what about Kevin Costner's Wyatt Earp? While they at least hint to Earp's adventures in Alaska, the rest of his life is also quickly summed up at the very end, in text form across the screen. Wyatt died in 1929, Josephine followed 15 years later, and their ashes are buried together in Colma, California. Roll credits. The casual fan of westerns could be led to believe that other than falling in love and a brief trip up to the last frontier, Wyatt Earp lived quietly for the remainder of his life, never doing anything else worthy of note. And oh boy, how wrong that assumption would be. Now that said, I likewise will not be doing a complete and thorough examination of Earp's final years. At least not on this episode. We'll save that for a series in the future. Today we're just going to focus on a little snippet. Something to whet your appetite and hopefully show that Wyatt Earp didn't simply fade away to the rocking chair in his old age. And after listening to this, that little brief mention of Tom Mix and William S. Hart at the end of Tombstone will make a whole lot more sense. That's right, we're going to Hollywood on this one. Things are going to get more than a little corrupt, and hopefully I don't get sued by the ghost of Wyatt Earp's widow. My Darling Clementine is considered by many to be the greatest Wyatt Earp film of all time. It also just happens to be the least accurate, despite legendary director John Ford having known Wyatt personally. Contrary to popular belief and Ford's own claims, this film was not based on Earp's own account of his days in Tombstone, but rather an earlier film whose director also knew the now famous lawman. And I say now famous because Wyatt wasn't exactly what you would call a household name prior to the 20th century. His time in Dodge City, as well as his actions in Tombstone, certainly garnered Earp a reputation in certain circles. However, his introduction to the nation at large would not be as a lawman at all, but rather as the corrupt boxing referee who threw the fight for heavyweight champion of the world. Fitzsimmons vs. Sharkey was the sporting event of 1896, with Fitzsimmons as the favorite. He dominated Sharkey, dropping him in the 8th, and as the stunned pugilist rolled across the mat clutching his groin, Earp stopped the fight. He ruled that Fitzsimmons hit below the belt and then shocked the crowd by declaring Sharkey the winner. Fans were livid. Only Wyatt seemed to have witnessed the illegal punch, and Fitzsimmons ended up suing to contest the decision. The trial became national news, thrusting Earp into the limelight as the papers had a field day. Not only did they claim that Wyatt fixed the fight, but once his storied past was discovered, some in the press even went so far as to paint he and his brothers as stagecoach robbing criminals. Ultimately, the case was thrown out due to the fight being held in San Francisco, where boxing just so happened to be illegal. Skip ahead 8 years and the match was proven to have been fixed, although historians do debate the level of Earp's involvement. More on that in a bit, but guilty or not, Wyatt's reputation was thoroughly sullied. In the years following the heavyweight bout, Earp and his wife Sadie traveled all over from Alaska down to the border with Mexico, opening up saloons, gambling houses, even brothels. A line of work that found Wyatt under arrest more than once, albeit mostly for minor offenses. Still, though, his infamy followed, as noted by the Seattle Daily Times, who described Earp as a quote-unquote bad man in a November 1899 edition. Eventually, sunny Los Angeles beckoned, but things weren't much different. Earp, despite now being in his early 60s, would get arrested twice more. First for firing off a rifle round at the feet of a federal receiver before threatening to blow the man apart, and again for just attempting to fleece somebody in a bogus faro game, a charge that would later be reduced to simple vagrancy. And if all that wasn't bad enough, Wyatt then went ahead and got himself involved in some really shady shit. The movie industry. Earp began visiting film sets and even consulting on early westerns, all free of charge. A good deed likely not done so much out of the kindness of his heart as it was in the hopes that one day somebody would make a movie on his life that would repair his shattered reputation. Also got to think that the money such a project would rake in might have had a little something to do with his charity as well. As such, one day in 1916, Wyatt Earp and his friend Jack London, the author, crashed a set looking for actor and director Raoul Walsh. They found him, and the three men had a nice little dinner along with another guest you may have heard of, Charlie Chaplin, as they discussed Walsh possibly making a biopic based on Earp's life, much like his recent film on Pancho Villa. Nothing ever came of this meeting, but the story goes that during dinner, Chaplin turned to Earp and asked if he was, quote, that bloke from Arizona who tamed the baddies. Wyatt would then befriend another notable actor by the name of William S. Hart, a man who prided himself on the authenticity of his westerns. And in March of 1922, Hart alerted Earp to an LA Times article painting him and his brothers as swaggering murderous bandits. Now, I'm not going to read this article here, but there were a ton of errors. Stuff like stating that Earp was ran out of Dodge City by Bat Masterson, that he rode with Frank Stillwell, yet even more suggestions that the Earps were involved with stage holdups, and finally, the story even claimed that Wyatt was dead. Blatant inaccuracies aside, the whole damn thing just made Wyatt and his brothers out to look like corrupt bullies. And, okay, maybe, but needless to say, this did nothing to improve his reputation. More determined than ever to get the green light on that biopic of his, Earp leaned on Hart, who ended up just meeting him halfway, adding Wyatt as a small character, played by Burt Lindley, in the 1923 film Wild Bill Hickok. Although barely featured, the ad copy hyped Earp as one of the 3 best gunmen of all time, and small though the part was, Wyatt had finally became a character in the movies. Only a matter of time before his story gets made, right? Well, not so fast. Unfortunately, not only would critics pan Wild Bill Hickok, but the fans didn't care for it much either, causing it to be a flop at the box office. Even William S. Hart's career began to sharply decline. Still, though, for the next couple of years, both Wyatt and his wife Sadie continued to write hard about getting their film made, with Earp even claiming that he was having a script written. Link in the show notes if you'd like to read some of this correspondence. Finally, Hart just told the couple to go ahead and write a book, an idea that they thought was just swell. Only thing is, they would need a writer, and by this point, Jack London had already passed away. There was always Wyatt's friend, playwright Wilson Meisner, but he also just happened to be a lazy opium fiend. Finally, Wyatt settled on an unlikely candidate, a friend of a friend and mining engineer named John Henry Flood. For the next 2 years, Flood would write the stories as Earp told them, but Sadie stopped any type of conversation that she deemed unclean. Not only that, but she also demanded a chapter claiming that Wyatt saved 2 girls and a cripple from a fire, as well as suggesting to Flood that his prose needed some pep. And by pep, she meant gunshots to be written as crack, all capitals, exclamation mark. The chapter on the OK Corral alone had 109 cracks. They sent Flood's manuscript to various publishers, and We Do Not Care Particularly for the Style in which it is written was probably one of the nicer responses. They wasted 2 years writing 348 pages of unreadable shit, a dilemma I can certainly sympathize with. And as fate would have it, they were not the only ones putting pen to paper in regard to Earp's life. Other authors had joined in the action as well, most notably Walter Noble Burns. Now, I've mentioned this guy a few times on the podcast, even on the last episode we did. Burns' 1926 The Saga of Billy the Kid made William Bonney a household name, and the following year he would turn his attention to the Earp clan and publish Tombstone, an Iliad of the Southwest. While Sadie Earp was insisting that Flood write his 109th crack, Burns was busy interviewing Tombstone old-timers. Hell, he even met up with Wyatt himself, but Earp was a little cagey as, at the time, he was already working with Flood, and, well, we already know how that turned out. In other words, Wyatt Earp got scooped on his own life. By the way, what a great example of the Old West not just magically disappearing at the dawn of the 20th century. The gunfight at the OK Corral occurred in 1881, and when Burns was researching his Iliad of the Southwest, only 45 years had passed. Seems like a long time, but this would be the equivalent of somebody right now in 2023 researching the Jonestown Massacre. In the same way that there are still people alive right now who were members of Jim Jones' cult and survived that tragedy in Guyana, there were still people alive in the 1920s who lived in Tombstone during its heyday. Even some, like Wyatt Earp, who participated in the infamous events. Take Billy Breckinridge, for example, cowboy gang partisan and deputy under Cochise County Sheriff Johnny Behan. Believe it or not, Earp did not bear a grudge as the two would meet up in Tucson in 1927 and reminisce about the so-called good old days. And just like Wyatt and Sadie and Walter Noble Burns, Mr. Breckinridge was also writing a book. The awesomely named Hell Dorado, Bringing Law to the Mesquite, was released in 1928, and despite the reminiscent in Tucson, it portrayed Earp as a pimp, thief, cheat, and murderer. Wyatt and Sadie were appalled, yet the book became a huge success. Another crack to Earp's reputation. By this point, Wyatt was in his late 70s, in poor health, and all attempts at redeeming his image thus far had failed. A few years before his death, he confided in a friend that the Fitzsimmons vs. Sharkey fiasco was the bane of his life. And on January 13th, 1929, at the age of 80, Wyatt Earp died of chronic cystitis in Los Angeles. And even in death, despite having a character named for him in that William S. Hart film, despite Hell Dorado and the Iliad of the Southwest, Wyatt Earp was still more famous for Fitzsimmons vs. Sharkey than anything else. The city paper where Earp was born dedicated more to the match than any other event in his life, and sports articles of the time began using slang like pulling an Earp or Earping it up when referee calls seemed fishy. Before passing away, however, Wyatt Earp gave a series of 8 interviews to a wrestling promoter with an interest in the Old West. The promoter, a guy named Stuart Lake, then expanded those interviews into a book of his own with assistance from Sadie Earp, at least when she wasn't busy threatening legal action if the unsavory stuff wasn't omitted. The book, Wyatt Earp, Frontier Marshal, was published in 1931, and it was an instant smash, elevating the public's perception of Wyatt beyond anything he could have ever imagined. It was also a complete hagiography, meaning it made Earp out to be some sort of a saint. Be that as it may, it was effective in giving his name a bit of mainstream recognition, and Hollywood soon came calling with 1932's Law and Order, the first ever film about Wyatt Earp's life. Kind of. It was based off the novel St. Johnson, a fictionalized account of Wyatt and Doc in Tombstone written a year prior by W.R. Burnett. And I say Law & Order was kind of a Wyatt Earp movie because even though he was clearly the inspiration, his name was changed to Frame Johnson in both the novel and subsequent film. Despite these changes, however, it is considered one of the only Earp films that can stand alongside My Darling Clementine in terms of quality. Following the success of Law & Order, Fox purchased the rights to Lake's book, hoping to capitalize off being the first official Earp movie, at least in the sense that they'd be the first ones to use his name. This was not to be as Sadie Earp sued, saying it was an unauthorized portrayal, and once again Earp's name got changed, this time to Michael Wyatt. This movie, Frontier Marshal, did middle in business, likely in part to not being able to use Wyatt's name, and although today it is extremely hard to come by, it's considered by most who've seen it as just mediocre. As such, Fox would make a remake in 1939, with Earp as a fugitive from justice, a likely reference to Wyatt's 1871 indictment for horse theft, or just the shadier aspects of his character in general. Only this time they changed his name to David Earp. I guess the idea here was the studio knew there was no way Sadie would allow an official Wyatt Earp film to have references to his past criminality. They soon came to their senses, however. I mean, what's the point in making a Wyatt Earp movie without putting Wyatt Earp's name in it? And thus, the fugitive David Earp was rewritten again as the upstanding and totally not a criminal Wyatt Earp. That's not to say that Sadie didn't complain. She didn't think the script was close enough to Lake's book, and she really didn't like that Doc Holliday was the main character. Speaking of Doc, Fox was worried that his kinfolk might be as litigious as Sadie, so they changed his name to, get ready for this, Doc Halliday, with an A instead of an O. I mean, come on, that could be based on anybody, right? And instead of being a dentist from the South, he's a surgeon from back east. This also was carried over into My Darling Clementine, only they were then allowed to use the O. And thus you have 1939's Frontier Marshal, starring Randolph Scott and Cesar Romero. It's on YouTube if you'd like to give it a watch, link in the show notes. Of course, despite being the first authorized and official Wyatt Earp film, Hollywood being Hollywood, the movie takes quite a few historical liberties. There are no Earp brothers, Wyatt comes to Tombstone all alone, and there are no Clantons. Just Curly Bill Brocious and a few of his cronies. And the gunfight at the OK Corral, well, it starts because Curly Bill kills Doc Halliday after challenging him to a duel. Later on, Wyatt Earp confronts Curly Bill and his buddies over at the corral, and he guns them all down on his lonesome. That said, Frontier Marshal was a hit both with critics and audiences, cementing Wyatt Earp in the minds of the public. Wanting to repeat this success, Fox suggested a remake to John Ford in order to fulfill his contract. Ford then screened the film and said, shit, I can do better than that. And that's where My Darling Clementine comes in. And yeah, make no mistake about it, My Darling Clementine is a remake of Frontier Marshal, with just minor differences like Doc removing a bullet from an injured child instead of a saloon girl, or Wyatt pinning on a badge after being beaten rather than finding his brother murdered. Okay, so in addition to John Ford's My Darling Clementine being one of the greatest Wyatt Earp films of all time, it also brings us right back to the very beginning of this episode in regard to Ford speaking about how he first met Wyatt Earp back when he was making them silent westerns. Interesting to note, Frontier Marshal's director, Alan Dwan, had a similar claim. And in addition to directing the quote-unquote first Wyatt Earp film, even if they didn't use his name, Dwan may have also directed the only film with Wyatt Earp himself actually in it. In 1915, Dwan was directing Douglas Fairbanks in a movie called The Half-Breed. As Dwan tells it, quote, Wyatt Earp was a visitor to the set. As was the custom in those days, he was invited to join in the party and mingle with our background action. I think there was a trial. A group of people demanded that the half-breed be sent out of town. And that group was Earp. He only stood there and nodded his head. End quote. Now that said, Dwan's view of Earp differed from Ford's. According to Dwan, Wyatt had been a real marshal in Tombstone, Arizona, and was as crooked as a $3 bill. He and his brothers were racketeers, all of them. They shook people down. They did everything they could to get dough. Now this harsh opinion, despite an error or two, is not completely out of line with the historical record. However, Dwan's physical description of Earp was all wrong. He said Wyatt was a one-eyed old man, but at no point did Earp ever lose an eye, at least not that anybody is aware of. As for whether or not Earp is in that courtroom scene, I'll let you be the judge. Included in the show notes is a link, so feel free to give it a view. For what it's worth, Earp historian Jeff Morey said that there is nobody in that particular segment who even remotely looks like Wyatt.
Alan Barra, also an Earp historian, claims there's an extra who closely resembles Texas John Slaughter, a former Arizona sheriff and future topic here at the Wild West Extravaganza, who also happened to work in the movies. So more than likely, Dwan got something mixed up. Is it possible that Earp is an extra in a different scene or even a different film? Or was Dwan thinking of one of the dozens of other real-life Old West characters attempted to get into the movie business and ended up conflating him with Wyatt? If Earp did appear in The Half-Breed, clearly Dwan's idea of him as a corrupt racketeer didn't stem from Wyatt being an extra for a day. No, Dwan's dim view of Earp was probably from a time before his reputation had been publicly salvaged. Ironically, by a Wyatt Earp film directed by Dwan himself, Frontier Marshal, the movie that led to My Darling Clementine, which helped pave the way to 1957's Gunfight at the OK Corral, starring Burt Lancaster and Kirk Douglas, which in turn spawned 1967's Hour of the Gun, which helped bring about insert one of the many numerous Wyatt Earp movies made over the years. Over 40 by last count, culminating in 1994 with the release of both Tombstone and Wyatt Earp. I say 1994, but technically Tombstone debuted on Christmas Eve of 93, so close enough. And yeah, I think it goes without saying, as far as Hollywood and most casual viewers are concerned, Wyatt Earp's reputation has been restored. Maybe restored isn't the right word. It's been rebranded. Unlike during Wyatt Earp's own lifetime, he is now widely regarded as an honest, brave, tough-as-nails lawman who, after a troubled youth and some minor indiscretions, cleaned up the wild boomtown of Tombstone. He purged the world of the nefarious cowboy gang and rode stoically off into the sunset with his true love, who definitely was not a former prostitute. I think Wyatt would be pleased by this appraisal. I think Sadie would likely be pissed no matter what we said, and I think Doc Holliday would find it all absolutely fucking hilarious. And there you have it. Just like that, a legend is born. Now, we're not done yet, so don't go nowhere. We are going to discuss Wyatt some more, but before we do, I gotta credit the great David Lambert for inspiring and pretty much writing this entire episode. Everything you've just heard and most of what you're about to hear, minus a few additions and some rewording to sort of put the whole thing in my own voice, is based entirely off of one of David's amazing threads. Link in the show notes if you'd like to see it in its original pure genius form, before I got to mucking it all up. I sort of mentioned David on the last episode, but if you're not yet familiar, he's an extremely talented artist and writer, as well as being the foremost expert on all things Western film related. And don't just take my word for it, check out one of David's many appearances on the Wrong Reel podcast, Talking Westerns. Highly recommend the one they just did on the Three Godfathers, by the way. And if you'd like to check out some of David's art, or you would like to support a very talented artist, you can find him at David Lambert Art on most socials as well as Patreon. I will warn you, though, as far as the artwork goes, he does specialize in the nude female form. And he does it well, so boner alert. And a little bit of a jealousy alert, too, at least on my part. This guy has somehow created a life centering around my two favorite things, the Old West and naked women. And don't worry, it's not all nudity. If nothing else, check out the picture he did of Warren Oates in Bring Me the Head of Alfredo Garcia. It's beyond amazing. Listen, I could talk about David for the next hour, and if it sounds like I've got a man crush on the guy, that's probably because I do. So please check out his stuff, link in the show notes for all of this. Once again, David Lambert Art. And thanks again, David, for providing some good podcast fodder. Hope I'm doing the topic justice. All right, with that said, back to Wyatt Earp and his reputation. Seeing as how all the bad press surrounding the man in his latter years stemmed entirely from a fixed boxing match, you may be wondering just what the hell business Wyatt had working as a referee to begin with. Well, first of all, to Earp's credit, the man could fight. Unlike Doc Holliday, who Bat Masterson once described as not being able to whip a healthy 15-year-old boy in a go-as-you-please fight, and thus was quick to resort to gunplay, Wyatt, by all accounts, could handle his own. His daddy, Nicholas Earp, was a tough old bird himself and taught his sons what he knew about the fine art of fisticuffs. As such, I'm not sure that Wyatt ever shied away from going toe-to-toe with most comers, and them he wouldn't usually just receive a tap on the head via the barrel of his six-shooter. As far as Wyatt officiating a fight, the first one I could find was way back in 1869 when a 21-year-old Earp allegedly refereed a bout in Cheyenne, Wyoming, between Professor Mike Donovan and John Shaughnessy. Yes, the same John Shaughnessy who, as a saloon owner about 8 years later, would introduce Wyatt to a gambler by the name of John Henry Holliday. But I'm getting sidetracked now. Point is, leading up to the Fitzsimmons-Sharkey match, Earp had already refereed some 30 or more bouts. Be that as it may, he was still a last-minute choice. The two fighters couldn't agree on a ref, and Fitzsimmons' camp initially objected to Earp as he was friendly with Sharkey and his people. Wyatt even offered to step down, but the Fitzsimmons side finally relented. Then, as Wyatt entered the ring, Police Captain George Whitman stopped him, right there in front of thousands of spectators, and made him remove the pistol he had bulging from his coat. Since boxing was illegal, Whitman should have shut the entire event down, but I reckon he had to draw the line somewhere. And thus began the first of Earp's many indignities stemming from this match. At the trial that followed, doctors testified that Sharkey did in fact show signs of being struck in the groin, an observation that failed to exonerate Wyatt in the eyes of the public. Like I said earlier, boxing was illegal in San Francisco, so the judge couldn't just rule in favor of Fitzsimmons for getting cheated out of the illicitly earned money. The case was thrown out and nobody got charged except for, you guessed it, Wyatt Earp. He had to pay a $50 fine for toting that six-shooter. And if that's not bad enough, with his name plastered all over the news like it was, Wyatt's unpaid debts began to surface. The next day, a suit for $1,110.79 came from Tombstone for a 19-year-old arrear, followed by an additional $2,121 debt that he owed to a loan company. It was also brought up in court that Earp's wife Sadie was a quote-unquote degenerate horse player, and that she had a habit of taking out loans against her jewelry. Oh boy. And as I mentioned before, the press went wild. They ignored any positive aspects of Wyatt's life, amplified the negative, and just flat out made shit up. Reporters tracked down men Earp had arrested way back in the day and printed their word as gospel. Even the gun he was fined for carrying during the fight was described as, quote, murderous looking. Papers from coast to coast reprinted an article about Wyatt's time in Tombstone, claiming that he ran a stage robbing operation with his three brothers, Virgil, Warren, and Julian. Julian? The write-up also asserted that the Earp bandits divvied up the loot with their cousin, Curly Bill. Now, obviously, I don't have to tell you that there was not a brother named Julian, nor was Curly Bill a cousin of the Earps. Oh, and also the article threw in that Wyatt and his brothers killed a whole bunch of innocent people, so, that's always fun. One paper, in an attempt to, I guess, be neutral, wrote of Wyatt, quote, his past mode of making a livelihood by use of a gun has been told. He has shot down people innumerable, wiped the smoke off the barrel of his shotgun, and cut another notch in the butt and said, what a great man am I, end quote. So yeah, they went a little bit beyond simple accusations of Wyatt Earp being corrupt. Evidently, it was not a good idea to fuck with 19th century boxing fans. Oh, and the doctors who said Sharkey showed signs of being hit in the groin, they testified that they were barred from seeing him until a day after the fight. The only physician, and I do use that term loosely, permitted to immediately examine Sharkey was one B. Brooks Lee. And the thing about B. Brooks Lee is that he did not have a license to practice medicine. He did, however, have an arrest record. And Sharkey's trainer admitted to seeing a bottle of potassium iodide, which causes swelling, in the dressing room after the fight. There were other signs pointing to a fixed fight, but once again, they weren't supposed to be boxing in San Francisco in the first place. Sharkey won his case, but the court kept 15% of the $10,000 prize due to an injunction. And when it was all said and done, very few people accepted him as the real heavyweight title holder. Jump forward a few years and B. Brooks Lee would finally be arrested in Portland for fixing this fight. People were just not letting it go. Lee admitted he was paid a cool $1,000 to make it look like Sharkey was hit in the groin, but he didn't reveal how. He would later be charged with murder after stabbing a man in the eye. As for Wyatt, as much as he may have regretted officiating that match, he would then turn around and get involved in yet another throne fight. Just 3.5 months after Sharkey Fitzsimmons, he was seen at a bout in Carson City in the company of both Sharkey and his manager. Per the Los Angeles Times, quote, Earp looked as modest and unassuming as ever, with the same old suspicious bulge in his coattails and the smile of self-satisfaction on his countenance, end quote. A month later, the press would announce that Wyatt had taken on the role as Sharkey's new advisor, helping him prepare to face off against Peter, the Irish giant mare. This fight would take place in New York City on June 9, 1897, to an audience of 12,000, including then New York Police Commissioner and future POTUS, Theodore Roosevelt. And it turned into an absolute shit show. Once Sharkey and Mare really started going at it, even continuing to slug it out after the bell, police officers rushed the ring and arrested everybody within the ropes, ultimately resulting in a draw being called. Just like in San Francisco, boxing was illegal in New York. However, there was a loophole known as the Horton Law that made exhibition bouts perfectly within the bounds of the law. So long as both boxers sparred for points and didn't get too carried away, it was game on. Obviously, this left a lot up to interpretation, and the police could choose when and when not to arbitrarily enforce it. I guess the theory was that if Sharkey appeared to be losing, the police would jump in and put an end to the fight, and apparently that's just what they did. And if you're wanting proof, look no further than Wyatt Earp. While he had been working with Sharkey's team and he had been in New York in preparations for the fight, he left for California a few days before it actually went down. And once he arrived in the Golden State, he told the LA Times that the fight, quote, had been arranged for Sharkey to win on the same principle as Sharkey's fight with Fitzsimmons, end quote. So just how culpable was Wyatt Earp when it came to fixing these fights? For sure, Sharkey and his team were in on it. I think that much is a given. Did Earp leave New York in disgust after discovering that yet another match was to be thrown? Or did he simply remove himself prematurely as to avoid any more bad press? Did Wyatt even purposely throw the original Sharkey and Fitzsimmons fight, or was he really convinced that Sharkey did indeed receive that foul? I have no idea. I just hope some of this is included in the next Wyatt Earp movie, which, if I had my druthers, would be in the form of a HBO miniseries. Alright, and just for fun, just to bring it all full circle, yes, the legendary John Ford really did know Wyatt Earp, and the two did spend quite a bit of time together on set during Ford's silent film era. That is all true. But as to Ford's claims that My Darling Clementine was an accurate portrayal of the fight at the OK Corral as described by Earp himself, I will refer you to Olive Carey, actress and wife of iconic actor Harry Carey. As far as Ford's assertions, Olive said, quote, "He's full of crap. He made that all up. You know damn well he made it all up." End of quote. Of course, in all fairness, John Ford made up a lot of crap that ended up being pretty damn good. So how about a few odds and ends to wrap everything up? As far as Jack London and Wyatt Earp really crashing that movie set, we don't know for sure that happened. This story is considered to be apocryphal. It was never mentioned by London's wife, nor found in any of her many extensive notes or diaries. It could have happened, it may have happened, but as of this recording, Raoul Walsh is the only source. You can find his version in his memoirs, Each Man in His Time. Link in the show notes if you want to read it and decide for yourself. Also, as tends to be the case, True West Magazine has a couple of excellent articles shedding further light on the topics discussed in this episode. The first, written by Alan Barra and titled Wyatt on the Set, details a lot of what we discussed today with Earp in Hollywood with plenty more tantalizing tidbits thrown in. Highly recommend you giving that a read. Also, if you're a boxing fan and you need to further scratch that Wyatt Earp itch ears, check out Garner A. Polinsky's article The Fix, covering Wyatt's involvement with both the aforementioned boxing matches. Link in the show notes for all this, and I hope you found this topic as interesting as I did. I'm forever fascinated with the people from the Old West era, legitimate gunslingers, people who hunted buffalo on the prairie and walked the streets of Dodge City and Deadwood, living long enough to be involved with the movie industry. I mean, there are people alive right now who were directed by John Ford, and John Ford knew Wyatt Earp. We're literally one generation removed from the guy who gunned down Curly Bill Brocious. I've said it before and I'll say it again, this is not ancient history, and the Old West era was not that long ago. All total, there were about 14 regulators enjoying Mrs. Godfrey's victuals there at the mill when the tough as nails and heavily armed Buckshot Roberts ambled up on his mule. Born Andrew L. Roberts, maybe, and almost certainly never called Buckshot during his lifetime, the man still earned the name Honest. Apparently, Roberts had taken a load of shot to his right shoulder at one point, causing the arm to be severely lacking in mobility. Not much is known about the man, though, including whether or not he killed more men than smallpox. Roberts, if that was his real name, would have been in his late 40s, and he may have spent time with the Texas Rangers, or, depending on who you ask, he may have had a shootout with the Rangers. He likely served during the Civil War before turning to a career hunting buffalo. And until very recently, Roberts ran a small spread of his own not far from Lincoln, and had, in the past, worked for Dolan. While he had no part in Tunstall's death, he was with a large posse that descended upon the Englishman's ranch that fateful day. As such, one of the no longer legal warrants held by the regulators was for Mr. Buckshot. And believe it or not, he did not come looking for a fight. Truth is, he wanted nothing to do with the entire war and even sold his ranch in an attempt to get the hell out of the territory.
That was the whole reason he showed up at the mill that day in the first place, to see if the check for said ranch had arrived. Now, Buckshot had been warned that the regulators were in the area, and thus had taken precautions. When he saw the mail stage headed towards Blazer's mill, he followed, and, not noticing regulator horses, he came on ahead. By the time Roberts realized he had company, it was too late, and I reckon he figured he'd just stick around and see how things shook out. Now, he and Frank Coe knew each other, so Frank stepped outside, thinking maybe he could persuade Roberts into surrender into he and his ironclads. They spoke for the better part of an hour, with Buckshot refusing to hand over his firearms. According to Frank Coe, quote, "I think he was the bravest man I ever met. Not a bit excited, knowing too that his life was in our hands." End quote. Dick Brewer soon ran slap out of patience and sent more men outside, one of whom was Charlie Bowdry, who wasn't quite as nice as Frank had been. Charlie bluntly ordered Buckshot to throw his hands up and surrender, and Roberts once again refused. Per at least one source, the grizzled old buffalo hunter then called Charlie Bowdry Mary Ann. And with that, both men opened up fire almost simultaneously. Roberts' first round glanced off Charlie's belt buckle, ricocheting and tearing a path across Doc Scurlock's leg, while Bowdry's bullet hit Buckshot center of the belly. Undaunted, the tough old bastard kept to his feet and laid down a withering fire in the regulator's direction, working the lever on his Winchester quick as lightning. He blew off a couple of George Coe's fingers, sent a round grazing Billy Bonney's arm, and yet another bullet of his plugged John Middleton in the chest. Frank Coe would later recall, quote, "I never saw a man that could handle a Winchester as fast as he could." Now, by this time, Buckshot had made his way into an adobe building and grabbed a big Springfield rifle off the wall, quickly located a box of shells and positioned himself to make a stand of it, despite being all gut shot to hell. The regulators, in turn, took up positions about 100 yards away, firing into the adobe but not doing any damage. Dick Brewer snuck around back, where as luck would have it, he had a much better view of Robert's position. Concealed behind a pile of logs, Dick took careful aim, squeezed the trigger, and missed. There's that famous New Mexico marksmanship. Moments later, Brewer stuck his head up a little too far in hopes of getting off another shot, but Roberts, who obviously spent a lot of time in Texas, was awaiting. A round from that powerful buffalo gun hit Dick square in the eye, blowing out the back of the regulator's head. Now, well after this fight had occurred, Billy Bonney would claim that he charged the adobe at one point, thinking that Roberts was out of bullets, only to have the old man slam his empty rifle into the kid's stomach, knocking his wind out and spiraling him backwards. Much of what we know about the battle seems to come from Frank Coe, and he does not mention this, only saying that one of Buckshot's rounds grazed the kid in the arm and, quote, "The kid backed out, as it was too hot in there for him." And once Brewer was killed, the battle was over. The regulators had enough and skinned on out, leaving both Dick and Buckshot Roberts behind. Now, Roberts was still alive, but he would pass away the following day, and he and Brewer were buried together. Legend has it that they were placed in the same casket.
There's two things you just don't discuss in a beer joint: politics and religion. Reason being, these topics tend to be a bit divisive. You add alcohol to the mix and things could get downright ugly, as was the case one sweltering August evening in Newton, Kansas, 1871. Two kind of sort of lawmen by the names of Mike McCluskey and Billy Bailey got into a heated argument over you-know-what, politics. One thing led to another, and the pair took to throwing hands. Wasn't long before both men tumbled out of the Red Front Saloon and commenced to fighting right there in the thoroughfare. By this point, the Ohio-born McCluskey, a former night watchman for the railroad, had the upper hand on Bailey. And, well, I guess he decided to keep it that way. Not leaving anything up to chance, McCluskey pulled his revolver and fired twice, one of the rounds striking Billy in the chest. The wounded man lingered, but not for long. The following day, Bill Bailey would make his final pilgrimage through death's door. We'll likely never know the specifics as what Mike and Bill were arguing about, and I guess it doesn't really matter. Just one of the countless drunken saloon killings that took place across the American frontier in the latter part of the 19th century. But what makes this fight so interesting is what would follow. A quest for revenge that led to one of the deadliest and most mysterious gunfights of the Old West. For a very brief period, Newton, Kansas was the end of the Chisholm Trail for the cattle herds coming up out of Texas, and the town seemed to pop up nearly overnight. There's a story of someone passing through Newton in May of '71 and only seeing a couple of buildings. The first train would arrive in July, and by late summer, it was a regular boomtown. Now, this was before the Santa Fe line made its way to Wichita, and seeing as how Newton was a good 60 or so miles closer to Texas than Abilene was,
it soon became the destination of choice for the trail bosses. Now, the two men I mentioned earlier, McCluskey and Bailey, they were these so-called special policemen hired by the railroad to help keep the peace during a very contentious election taking place that very August there in Newton. And I was unable to find out the exact details of said election, other than it had something to do with the railroad or a bond of some sort. Remember, since Newton was a cow town, their entire economy was built around being a hub for the Santa Fe Rail. And this brought a lot of money to the town, especially in the form of all them buckaroos coming up out of Texas who would be more than ready to spend some of their hard-earned money once they sold off their beeves. And one of these young cowpokes was a man by the name of Hugh Anderson, who, unfortunately for Mike McCluskey, considered the recently departed Billy Bailey to be a friend. According to at least one source, the two men were possibly related through Hugh's mama's side of the family. Whatever the connection, Mr. Anderson was outraged to learn that Bailey had been gunned down like a dog in the street. And, well, he decided to even up the score. Speaking of McCluskey, as soon as he terminated Bailey, he got to worrying about having his neck stretched, so he skedaddled. Not for long, though. Once he was assured that the killing would most likely be considered justifiable, he returned. Rumor has it that Billy Bailey had previously killed a couple of guys in various gunfights, so I guess all Mike had to say was that he feared for his life. A defense that, while it may have worked in the court of law, would fall on deaf ears when it came to the Texas cowboy, Hugh Anderson. He and his friends went hunting McCluskey, and they found him, along with a buddy of his named Jim Martin, in a saloon playing cards. Tuttle's Dance Hall it were, located in what passed for the red light district there in Newton, an area the locals called Hyde Park. And the men in question, those friends of Hugh Anderson, were none other than Jesse Woodson James, Leroy Butch Cassidy, and Paul G.D. Bunyan. And brother, they was looking for blood. And no, that last part is absolutely not true. The actual names of Anderson's friends are names you've probably never heard before. Henry Kearns, Jim Wilkerson, and Billy Garrett. Together with Hugh, they were just four wild-eyed young cowboys. A few of the legion that trailed cattle from Texas to Kansas back in them days. And if it weren't for the events I'm about to describe, it's very likely that all of these men, McCluskey and Anderson included, would be all but forgotten to history, except for maybe appearing on someone's Ancestry.com tree. However, that's not to say they were just a bunch of nobodies. Billy Garrett, in particular, was said to have already come out on top in a couple of shooting scrapes. And Hugh Anderson weren't no slouch either. The son of a rancher, Anderson had very recently rode with none other than John Wesley Hardin in pursuit of a wanted killer. And take this next part with a grain of salt, as I was not able to verify it, but there is a possibility that Hugh and his older brother had been participants in the Sutton-Taylor feud. What's for certain is that Anderson wasted no time in confronting Mike McCluskey, and he did not mince words when doing so. Called Mike a cowardly son of a bitch to his face and said he was going to blow his dang head off. And this weren't no idle threat either. No sooner were the words out of Hugh's mouth when he cleared leather. But let's just back up for a sec. Remember, this dance hall wouldn't have exactly been empty of civilians when all this went down. There would have been other customers, likely other cowboys looking to blow off some steam, wet their whistles, and hopefully their carrots. You would have had dance hall employees, a bartender or two, probably a few working gals, maybe even a faro dealer, in addition to just a few random citizens of Newton who decided to have a nightcap before calling it a day. But I don't know any of their names. The only other name that I can give you that was there at Tuttle's Dance Hall at this very crucial point when Hugh Anderson threw down was a teenager by the name of Riley. A lunger he was, had tuberculosis. By all accounts, it wasn't looking good. Now this kid is somewhat of a mystery. Scratch that, he's a huge mystery. Nobody seems to know where he came from, and he doesn't appear to have any family or anything like that. Matter of fact, the only thing that Riley did have was a friend, one solitary friend in the whole wide world, a man who had previously been kind to him. And that man was Mike McCluskey. Now, what Mike did to garner the undying loyalty of this Riley character, I have no idea. A few sources will tell you that McCluskey taught the youngster how to handle a firearm, or that he was simply nice to him when others weren't. Whatever the cause, the kid soon became known as McCluskey's shadow. Okay, now we've got all the pieces in place, right? Hopefully you've kind of got an idea of the situation. Hugh Anderson and his pals come hunting for McCluskey looking to get even and find him in a dance hall with Jim Martin, and somewhere nearby was the shadow Riley. Anderson quickly threatens McCluskey and unholsters his revolver, and what follows is one of the deadliest gunfights of the Old West. Upon seeing the brandished revolver, Jim Martin jumped to his feet and tried to defuse the situation, but it was just too late. Anderson's pistol barked, and Mike McCluskey took a round to the side of the neck. Still, though, the wounded man was able to pull his own iron, which misfired. Damn it. Mike drops to the floor and Anderson closes in and pumps several more rounds straight into McCluskey's back. By this point, all hell had broken loose. Hugh's buddies, the aforementioned Garrett, Kearns, and Wilkerson, they started firing as well, at whom we do not know. One theory is that they opened up just to simply keep the crowd at bay. Likely they couldn't even see what they were shooting at due to all the gun smoke. And they almost certainly had no idea that their most immediate threat lay nearby in the form of a sickly and emaciated teenager who had just witnessed the only friend he had gunned down right before his eyes. Now, there's a dramatic version of the story that says Riley then calmly walked to the saloon door and barred it shut for the inside, so as not to allow anyone to escape. Sort of like that scene in that movie The Bronx Tale, if you've ever seen it. You know the one. Now you can't leave. And I personally don't believe Riley locked the door, though. It's a bit, theatrical. But what I do think happened, what most people, even historians, agree on, is that as soon as Mike McCluskey was gunned down, this young Riley produced 2 revolvers of his own and commenced to deal in death. His bullets ripped into Anderson, all of Anderson's friends, and whoever else got the damn way. Even McCluskey's other pal Jim took a fatal round to the throat. By the time the smoke cleared, 8 men would lay dead or dying. As for Riley, well, he simply lowered his guns and stepped out into the street, never to be seen again. Whew, gives me chills just thinking about it. This whole bloody ordeal probably lasted less than 90 seconds, if that. And some unknown teenager just dropped more men in one gunfight than any of your more well-known and celebrated gunmen. Which begs the question, who the hell was this Riley kid? Seriously, nobody knows where he came from or where he went. He just flat out disappeared. And like I said, 8 men were shot. Jim Martin, Garrett, an innocent railroad man who took a bullet to the gut, and Mike McCluskey were all dead. Anderson was shot twice in the legs, and his buddies Kearns and Wilkerson were wounded as well, along with another innocent bystander. And each one of these casualties were due to the lethal guns of Riley, except for Mike McCluskey, of course. As for Anderson, he would survive his wounds, but he was facing serious legal troubles. A warrant was issued for his arrest on account of gunning down McCluskey, but Hugh was snuck out of town and back into the safe beckoning arms of the Lone Star State before he could be brought to justice. And like I said, Riley just disappeared. And that, in a nutshell, is the shootout at Hyde Park, also known as the Newton Massacre. But trust me, the story is far from over. Look, if you're like me, then you were probably at least a little familiar with this fight already. I mean, I've been reading some version of it for as long as I can remember. And for the most part, the story is pretty consistent, and it's pretty similar to what I just described, especially with the strong emphasis on this young man, Riley. I always wondered, though, could there be more to the tale? What would I find if I dug just a little deeper? Luckily, I was not disappointed. I also didn't have to go digging all that deep. Turns out somebody had done quite a bit of research on our behalf, and that someone is a lady named Christine Schmucker, the curator for the Harvey County Historical Museum there in Newton. More on Chris later. I just wanted to point out that her work was phenomenal. But first, let's address the fake elephant in the room. You go ahead and Google the Newton Massacre or the shootout at Hyde Park, and you're sure to find another exciting tale of revenge. One that would take place a couple of years after the gunplay I just described. Story goes that Mike McCluskey had a brother, and if there's one thing brothers don't care for, it's someone else murdering their sibling. I got a brother too, okay? And if he needs killing, I'll be the one to do it. Allegedly. Not some rando. And I reckon Mike's brother Arthur felt the same way. Remember, Hugh Anderson was safely whisked back to Texas following that shootout. But according to this version of events I'm about to recount, he would soon find himself back in Kansas, Medicine Lodge to be exact, working as a bartender. And as soon as Arthur McCluskey found out, he sent an emissary on over to formally invite Anderson to a duel. Yeah, a proper duel. This wasn't going to be no wild free-for-all like the one Mike died in, or Billy Bailey for that matter. No, this would be a stand-in-the-street affair, with rules and such. Anderson was even given a choice, pistols or knives, and he chose pistols. I can't blame him there. Both men stood back to back, walked several paces away, and then, at the signal of a pistol shot, whirled and began firing at each other. And both men drew blood. Matter of fact, they both emptied their damn revolvers. And although both were horribly wounded, neither one was willing to call it quits. According to one dubious reporter who claimed to have witnessed the fight, quote, McCluskey, summoning by a supreme effort his remaining strength, drew his knife and began to crawl feebly in the direction of his antagonist. The latter, who had raised himself to a sitting position, saw the movement and prepared to meet it. End quote. What followed was a good old hackfest with the gruesome duo slicing and stabbing until finally, with the last flicker of a blade, both Hugh Anderson and Art McCluskey lay still in the street, deader in hell. At least, to quote Mike Rowe, that's the way I heard it. Kind of. I mean, there are a few sources that are willing to admit that maybe Hugh Anderson actually survived his wounds and once again returned to Texas and lived to be an old man. And they admit that because, well, it's true. And we know it's true because there's one hell of a clear paper trail when it comes to Hugh Anderson. Listen, I love a good fight to the death as much as the next man, believe me. But here at the Wild West Extravaganza, we try to focus on true tales from the wild and woolly West. As such, I do at least attempt to separate fact from fiction when I can. And it turns out this is one situation where I definitely can do so. Once again, largely due to the research of Christine Schmucker, who we'll get to later. As far as that fatal duel there at Medicine Lodge, there's one source and one source only. And that source is a shady AF news correspondent that went by the alias of Allegro. Yes, Allegro. Sounds like some sort of over-the-counter allergy medication or something. Common side effects of Allegro include nausea, diarrhea, upset stomach, muscle or back discomfort or pain, sleepiness, drowsiness, erectile dysfunction, anal bleeding, anal fissures, anal warts, anal anything, a propensity to listen to horrible podcasts. Please consult your physician. You get the drift. And when it comes to this Allegro guy, let me tell you, the dude knew how to spin a tale. He had also reported on the gunfight at Hyde Park back in 1871, and he was the one that dubbed Riley as the avenging nemesis. Matter of fact, let me read you that passage so you can get an idea of what sort of flair that this Allegro guy wrote with. In August of 1871, very shortly after the actual gunfight at Newton, he wrote, quote, "There is an avenging nemesis on track. A stalwart figure suddenly appears on the scene. For an instant, he remains motionless, as if studying the situation. Then a sheet of flame vomits forth, apparently from his hand, and a Texan staggers from the room across the area and falls dead at the door of the Alamo. Another and another and another shot follows until 6 men have bowed to his prowess." End quote. So here's the deal. This Allegro, in addition to being a correspondent to various newspapers, also made a living as a fiddle player there in Kansas dance halls. At least he did before getting run out of the territory. He would soon, however, continue to write salacious stories for a rag dubbed the New York World, but even they got tired of him, fired him and doxed him, saying that his true identity was, quote, "a shyster named E.J. Harrington, who was utterly unworthy of confidence and continence and belonged in the penitentiary," end quote. And it is this man, this quote-unquote shyster, who is our only source when it comes to the duel at Medicine Lodge. Now, before you get to, "but Josh," and me, it's not just this bad reputation of Allegro, who was also referred, by the way, in the Newton papers as a deadbeat, that makes me question the validity of the duel. Now, some people point to the location of this alleged fight as being proof positive that the story was fake. Allegro says it took place in Medicine Lodge, which he described as being, quote, "in the very heart of the Indian Nation, about 100 miles south of the Kansas frontier," end quote. Now, you and me know that Medicine Lodge was, in fact, in Kansas and not in the Indian Nation or Indian Territory, but I am of the opinion that this could possibly be explained away just by the awkward phrasing. To a greenhorn like Allegro, everything outside of the city limits there in Kansas was the Indian Nation. And I mean, in one sense, he could be right. You know, you had a lot of Arapaho and Southern Cheyenne, Kiowa, and even your occasional Comanche out there. Furthermore, the town of Medicine Lodge, which was founded in 1873, the year the duel allegedly took place, was only 25 miles north of official Indian territory, and coincidentally about 100 miles southwest of Newton. So Allegro's description of being 100 miles south of the Kansas frontier can easily be explained, in my opinion. Now, the main issue with this story, to me, is that there's zero corroboration. Allegro claimed that he and about 70 others witnessed McCluskey and Anderson fight to the death. Yet there's no proof that anyone, anywhere, at this time nor in the years that followed, ever mentioned it. Matter of fact, the local papers there in Kansas were already calling the story a lie almost as soon as it was printed. And furthermore, we know the ultimate outcome of the duel, the death of Hugh Anderson, is absolutely not true. Here's where the paper trail comes into play that I mentioned earlier. You know, thanks to census and marriage records, as well as family recollections, we've got a pretty good general overview of Anderson's entire life. He was born in November of 1851, by the way, so he was still just 19 years old when he threw down on Mike McCluskey there in that dance hall. Rash and full of piss and vinegar and probably thinking he could live forever. just like 1,000 other young men you can still find to this day in dance halls scattered from Houston to Midland, full of fake courage and meanness, especially come payday. Not to say that Anderson wasn't from tough stock. As I mentioned previously, his daddy was a rancher and veteran of the Civil War, having served in the Shiloh Home Guard in DeWitt County. And as I previously teased, the family may have been involved in the Sutton-Taylor feud. And while I could find no solid proof of that, I did find some pretty good evidence that our young Hugh Anderson did in fact know John Wesley Hardin. Now that's an interesting story all on its own. In early July of 1871, a vaquero by the name of Juan Badena shot and killed Billy Coran, trail boss. This led some wealthy cattlemen to recruit none other than the notorious Wes Hardin to track this Badena character down. According to the book 10 Deadly Texans, Hardin ran into Billy's brother John as well as a young cowboy named, you guessed it, Hugh Anderson. And together this bunch was able to locate Mr. Juan Badena at Sumner City, about 60 miles south of Newton, on July 7th. And once located, John Wesley Hardin's pistols barked and another Juan bit the dust. Get it? Another Juan? One? Whatever. Anyway, the gunfight there at Hyde Park would occur just about a month and a half later. And it does seem that this may have been Hugh Anderson's scared straight moment. Remember, he was still a teenager himself. That's another weird angle to this whole story. There's so much emphasis placed on the youth of Riley, who we're going to get to in a minute, but many of the sources I've seen list Riley as being 18 years old. However, when it comes to Hugh Anderson, we automatically imagine a grown man with plenty of experience under his belt. And that could not be further from the truth. And yeah, John Wesley Hardin would have only been about 18 years old himself in 1871, but I do think he was just built different. Some men, most men, don't have the stomach for such deadly action. PTSD is real, and most of us just want to live our lives peacefully. Hardin, however, was a bit of an anomaly. A pure killer who didn't seem to fear death nor have any respect for the sanctity of life. He'd continue his violent ways for the next 20 years, whereas Anderson seemed to steer clear of trouble after gunning down McCluskey. Once back in Texas, Hugh would get married at the young age of 20 after recuperating from his wounds. And his first son was born in 1873, the same year when he was supposed to be up there in Kansas fighting Art McCluskey to the death. By the way, I'm no detective, but I would like to point out that I was not able to find an Arthur McCluskey anywhere near Kansas in the 1860s, 70s, or 80s. Now take that for what it is. I'm not saying it's definitive proof that the man didn't exist, but I am saying that the proof isn't readily available for a dummy like me to find. Back to Hugh Anderson. His wife would die sometime in the 1870s, and by 1880, the widower is living in McCulloch County, Texas, working as a stock raiser, a career he would continue even after his second marriage in 1884, as he and his new bride relocated to New Mexico. Couple would have 2 daughters, but unfortunately, Hugh Anderson would find himself a 2-time widower by the year 1900. A decade later, in 1910, Hugh was still alive and well there in New Mexico, now living with his grown son Oscar and his family, and still working as a stockman. In mid-June of 1914, old Hugh, now 60-something years old, took refuge under a tree during a rainstorm. The tree was struck by lightning, and that was the end of Hugh Anderson, who the local paper dubbed a well-known cattleman. He's buried over in Tenney, New Mexico, by the way, just outside of Lincoln. And as far as anybody knows, he never once mentioned no duel up in Medicine Lodge. Hugh's younger brother Wyatt, who lived all the way up to 1948, would later describe that cattle drive that took place back in 1871. Now, Wyatt would have only been 5 or 6 at the time, but he does confirm hearing that Hugh did kill a man in Kansas that summer, and that their older brother, Richmond, also had a couple of killing scrapes, one in Texas and one in Kansas. And yeah, just like his brother, Wyatt Anderson likewise never mentioned any second duel with Arthur McCluskey. I think it's safe to say that that duel never happened. Not only was the man who penned the original article an untrustworthy source, but there's also zero evidence, and you gotta have evidence. As far as the mysterious Riley goes, oh boy, where to start? Look, your guess is as good as mine. The biggest question I initially had was whether or not Riley even existed. I mean, there are some obvious holes in the story, right? There was a coroner's jury formed following the shootout to determine whether or not Hugh Anderson murdered Mike McCluskey, and shortly thereafter a warrant was issued for Anderson's arrest. And it turned out to be quite the exciting affair. Remember, young Hugh Anderson wasn't in town alone. He was with a group of half-wild cowpokes who weren't too happy about the findings of that coroner's jury. Matter of fact, they promised that bodies would soon be hanging like ornaments from telegraph poles if Hugh was arrested. Anderson's father, Walter, then 50 years old, wasted no time in getting to Newton and not only securing the best medical care for his boy, but also appealing to the business leaders there in town to help get his son out. For their part, they wanted to avoid any additional bloodshed, so a plan was soon concocted to spirit the wounded cowboy out in the dark of night. The excitement was intense, recalled Newton resident Judge Robert W.P. Muse, going on to say, quote, and the city marshal Tom Carson and his assistants, all heavily armed, were parading the streets day and night with warrants for the arrest of Anderson, end quote. Once the local sawbones decided that Hugh could be safely moved, and with the help of the aforementioned judge, the young man was placed on a train at about 2 a.m. Thus ends the third or fourth chapter in Newton's bloody history. A town only a little over 3 months old. But if the worse than beastly prostitution of the sexes is continued and the town is controlled by characters who have no regard for virtue, decency, or honor, it will not soon become fit for the abode of respectable people, reported the Abilene Chronicle on August 24th, 1871. So yeah, there you go. A lot was written about Hugh Anderson directly following the shootout, but there's barely a mention of this mysterious shadow, Riley. The correspondent Allegro didn't even mention Riley by name. Remember? Only referring to the shooter as the quote-unquote avenging nemesis. Matter of fact, it is this Judge Muse who seems to be the first to name the kid, saying, quote, a friend of McCluskey, a boy named Riley, some 18 years of age, quiet and inoffensive in deportment, and evidently dying from consumption, end quote. He'd go on to recall that Riley was known locally as McCluskey's shadow, and that he was a, quote, thin, tubercular man who followed the railroad gunman around like a little dog that barked and snapped from behind his master, end quote. Judge Muse, who, while a citizen of Newton, wasn't actually present at the dance hall on the night in question, was also the one that theorized that Riley coolly locked the door of that saloon before drawing his revolvers. A poem published a year after the incident also lists Riley by name. And this poem, penned by Theodore F. Price, reads as follows. What form strides o'er the threshold red, with weapons fiercely clenched? He looks upon McCluskey dead, with gory garments drenched. Then calmly aimed, the trigger drew. A Texan died, his aim was true. 7 gory forms before him lying. That friend was fearfully avenged. Grim Riley turned away. I don't know. You would think there would at least be more said of this Riley guy. Why was there no warrant issued for his arrest? Or if there was, why no mention of it? Nor mention of the deputies walking the streets of Newton searching for him as opposed to Anderson. There was all this excitement about Hugh leaving town in the middle of the night and he only killed one man, whereas Riley took down several. In 1950, nearly 8 decades after the gunfight, a newspaper there in Newton quoted an unnamed prominent citizen as saying, quote, law-abiding men knew what had taken place in Tuttle's Saloon. They furnished the youth Riley with saddle and bridle. A livery stable owner gave him a pony and he rode out of town that night and wound up in Ellsworth. Nothing more is heard of him, and it is presumed that his pulmonary disease ended his life. Skip ahead another 20 years, and in 1971, an author named William Moran wrote in his book Santa Fe and the Chisholm Trail in Newton that he thought Riley could have escaped town the next morning, possibly as a stowaway, and, simply changed his name. And according to another author, Mary Sandoz, she wrote in her book, The Cattleman, that there was a posse formed to look for Riley, but of course they never found him. So few details, so many questions. I suppose, though, that it's not that surprising that the good citizens of Newton would likely want Riley out of town as quickly as possible. You and me, we look back at these stories and they're exciting, right? Cowboys and gamblers and shootouts, frontier towns. But to the people living there in Newton, the majority of them were law-abiding citizens. Normal people, shopkeepers and merchants and hotel operators and barbers and stuff like that, family men. They didn't like crime any more than you and I do. We know that, according to Judge Muse, they were more than willing to help Anderson get out of town if it meant no more killing. Likely as not, they were equally as willing to sneak young Riley, if that was his name, out of town as well, probably hoping he'd never come back. And surely they would have never dreamed me and you would be talking about him 150 years later. And don't call me Shirley. But man, I sure wish I knew who Riley was. Driving me crazy. And for what it's worth, there are theories, but unfortunately none of them hold much water. One that really piqued my interest is that the young man wasn't really consumptive, and that he not only survived his escape from Newton, but lived for many, many more years, under the alias of Doc Middleton. If you're not familiar with Doc, whose real name, by the way, was Jim Riley, he was one hell of a horse thief. He was also described as being a very thin, soft-spoken man. which would line up with Judge Muse's description of the Newton Riley. Middleton was born in 1851, so his age would have fit as well, and then there's the fact that Doc wasn't afraid to resort to violence, having already killed a man by the tender age of 18, a killing that landed his ass in Huntsville prison. Now, he would eventually escape, but here's the thing, not until 1874. Our gunfight at Hyde Park took place in 1871 when Doc was still behind bars. So unless I've got my facts wrong here, I think it's safe to say that Doc Riley Middleton is not our Riley. By the way, it's thought that Doc earned that title by the way he could doctor or alter a horse's brand. I'll have to look more into Middleton one of these days. He might just be a future topic here on the Wild West Extravaganza. All right, so here's what we're left with in the end. Gunfight at Newton most certainly took place. 8 men were shot, 4 of whom died. We know Hugh Anderson opened up the ball and that it's likely his bullets that did McCluskey in. As for the mysterious shooter Riley, who the hell knows? While I don't believe that he locked the doors of the saloon, I do think there's enough evidence to conclude that he not only existed, but that he was also present and a participant in the gunfight at Hyde Park. As to how many of the wounded and dead he accounted for, as opposed to Anderson's friends who also opened up fire, I don't know. And as far as what happened to Riley after the shootout, I doubt any of us will ever know. It's my opinion that in cases like this, it's almost always the simplest answer that turns out to be true. Occam's razor, right? I tend to think that Riley probably did have tuberculosis and that he was probably already on death's door when he shucked them smoke wagons there in Tuttle's dance hall. More than likely, the young man fled town and he didn't survive another cold Kansas winter. Just another kid buried in a pauper's grave somewhere. Probably under a damn Starbucks now. And once again, as far as the duel at Medicine Lodge, I think we can safely say that was a figment of Allegro's imagination. There's only one recorded telling of the story, pinned under an assumed name by an untrustworthy source. The source reported as a liar even at that time. And in the years that followed, there have absolutely been no other pieces of evidence backing up these claims. Either way, the whole ordeal is fascinating. The gunfight in Newton didn't involve anyone famous, and none of the participants could be considered as real-deal gunslingers. Yet the result was a body count higher than most of the more well-known shootouts. The OK Corral, for example, I think there were, 3 wounded and 3 dead? Now, I mentioned Chris Schmucker earlier, the curator for the Harvey County Historical Museum there in Newton, Kansas. Her research and articles proved to be invaluable to me while preparing this episode. I always knew there was more to the story, and sure enough, thanks to Miss Schmucker, my suspicions were validated. She has posted a series of articles on the museum's website that I'll link to in this episode's show notes. Lots of good, well-researched information on Hugh Anderson, as well as the mysterious Allegro, gunfight in question, and that duel that probably never happened. I highly recommend you checking out her stuff for further reading. Like I said, link in this episode's show notes. Chris, if you're listening, thank you, thank you, thank you. Hard work like yours really helps an idiot like me to sound like I actually know what I'm talking about. And if your bosses are listening, tell them I said to give you a raise. By the way, Newton celebrated its official 150th birthday recently, on February 22nd. But I'm told that the festivities will continue throughout the year. The next big shebang there in Newton is scheduled for June 4th. So, if you're in the area, please stop by and check it out. And email me and let me know how it goes. And that is about all I've got on the Newton Massacre.
In the summer of 1895, John Selman Sr. gunned down John Wesley Hardin. Considered one of the deadliest shooters of the Old West, Hardin killed his first man at the tender age of 15. In the decade that followed, dozens of others would fall to the young man's guns, including, if the legend is true, a victim whose only crime was snoring a little too loud. Yet despite Wes Hardin's massive body count and a willingness to resort to violence at the drop of a hat, John Selman, his killer with a badge, was far worse. And today you're gonna learn why. John Henry Selman was born in Madison County, Arkansas on November 16, 1839. His family, like many others, made the migration to Texas, and after his daddy's death in 1861, Selman enlisted in the Confederate Army, specifically the 22nd Texas Cavalry. Not sure how much action Selman saw, though, as by 1863 he had already deserted. Got hitched to a gal named Edna in August of 65, and it weren't long before the happy couple relocated to the Fort Griffin area, where Selman began working as a deputy for Sheriff John Larn. Located about 160 miles west of Dallas, Fort Griffin had such a penchant for violence that it was often referred to as the Babylon on the Brazos. It's where Doc Holliday first met Wyatt Earp, and counted among its regular visitors future legends such as Pat Garrett, Dave Rudaball, and the aforementioned John Wesley Hardin. So lawless was the area that a vigilance committee known as the Tin Hat Brigade arose up and began doing their thing. And by doing their thing, I mean mostly lynching presumed criminals without due process. And it was as a vigilante with the Tin Hat Brigade that John M. Larn made his bones and secured the position of sheriff. In addition to keeping the peace, Larn also had a beef contract with the Army. Weren't long before the sheriff and his new deputy, our very own John Selman, began procuring the cattle they delivered to the garrison by any means necessary. Local ranchers began noticing that their herds were thinning while Sheriff Lawrence seemed to be doing just fine, and the jig was up. Believe it or not, no charges were brought against the sheriff or Selman, although both men did suddenly find themselves out of a job. So naturally, they just went all in on the rustling, taking pot shots at any ranchers or cowboys who tried to interfere. One of these bullets, fired by the former sheriff, struck a rancher's arm, and John Lawrence soon found himself chained up in the jailhouse that he once had the run of. His former Confederates in the Tin Hat Brigade found out and went to pay him a visit, but their efforts were somewhat curtailed by the shackles. Seems they couldn't figure out a way to remove Larn from his cell in order to string him up proper, so they improvised and just filled him full of lead right there in the jail. The end result was the same, and no more cattle was stolen by John M. Larn. As you can imagine, his air quotes deputy, John Selman, figured this was a good time to make himself scarce, so he drifted west into New Mexico. Lincoln County, New Mexico, right as the damn Lincoln County War was just ramping up. Selman chose not to take a side, though. Repenting of his ways and condemning his past actions, John instead worked with local ministers as a mediator of sorts, urging peace from both factions and repeatedly placing himself in harm's way. His only protection, a leather-bound Bible, and his unwavering faith in the good Lord. And no, of course that's not true. While Selman wouldn't fight on behalf of either side, Dolan's men or the Regulators, he definitely did not change his ways none. Matter of fact, his evil proclivities seemed to kick into overdrive. What's that old saying? In the midst of every crisis lies an opportunity? Well, I guess Selman saw a chance to make some easy money in a land embroiled in the chaos of war, and he dove in head first. Formed his own gang known as Selman Scouts, and they took to terrorizing the countryside, especially the Hispanic communities. And these guys were just unnecessarily savage. Case in point, they once murdered a farmer and his teenage son after asking for and receiving watermelons. Just killed him dead. I don't know about you, but where I'm at, we have been going through one of the hottest summers on record. And this time of the year, a nice ripe watermelon is most definitely my fruit of choice. It's truly a gift from God on a hot day, and just to think of these scallywags sitting back and enjoying that delicious heavenly nectar after murdering the very people that gave it to them, it just rubs me the wrong way. And sadly, that's not the least of it. The Scouts would burn down ranches for no apparent reason other than pure meanness. And if you were lucky enough to escape with just the clothes on your back, well, think again. One poor farmer was stripped of everything he had, even his clothes, and forced to run naked as a jaybird through the brush. But even he was luckier than the next victims, 3 young Hispanic kids, one of whom had Down syndrome. They made the mistake of objecting to Selman stealing their father's horses, so he shot them all dead. Then there was the murder of 14-year-old Gregorio Sanchez, and who knows who else that wasn't recorded, that we don't know about. We are aware of what happened at the Bartlett Ranch, though, located just 11 miles from Fort Stanton. Selman and his scouts took the wives of 2 Bartlett employees, made them undress, and then the sons of bitches had their way with them. When word got out, Lincoln County residents were rightfully outraged. You know, stealing cows can be forgiven. Hell, even murder, right? Especially out west. But rape or taking advantage of women, even among hardened killers, is often considered an inexcusable atrocity. News of these events spread to Fort Stanton, and Colonel Dudley wrote to his superiors hoping to intervene. Fun little side note. In the letter Dudley wrote to then Governor Axtell, he misspelled the word rustlers as wrestlers. I'm sure this was a simple mistake, but how funny would that be if there was just a rogue group of WWE wrestlers roaming around Lincoln County wrecking havoc?
Let me tell you something, brother. All you hulkamaniacs out there better listen up. I'm gonna steal some horses, brother, okay? And then I'm gonna steal some cows, brother. All you lawmen better take heed. And all of you out there on the regulator side, I'd say come on down too, brother, because we gonna steal some horses. And we gonna steal some cows, brother. Woo!
Wow. Not very good at my Hulk Hogan impersonation, but I think you get the drift, right? With their egregious crimes in the limelight, the scouts found themselves hounded everywhere they went and ended up getting in so many damn fights that they ran out of ammo. And when they headed into town to buy some more, they were met by armed men and chased all around the countryside. Finally, Juan Patron and his militia, the Lincoln County Rifles, found the bandits camped on the Pecos River and charged, shooting the hell out of them. Of those who escaped death, 5 were arrested, and at least one, the slippery John Selman, was able to escape entirely. By this point, the Lincoln County War was coming to an end, and seeing as how Governor Lew Wallace did not include Selman in his blanket amnesty, the outlaw judiciously decided to skedaddle back to Texas, where, incidentally, he came down with a pretty nasty case of the smallpox. Unfortunately, he lived, and the pox turned out to be a blessing in disguise, literally. The fresh pockmarks, coupled with the shaving of his trademark beard, helped Selman to make himself unrecognizable to any law that was out there hunting him. Leaning into this new appearance, Selman took on the alias as Captain John Tyson and opened up a butcher shop at Fort Davis. Now remember, Selman had gotten married back in 1865. In the intervening years, his poor wife Edna bore him 4 children. Henry, born in 1868, William in 1870, Margarita in 1872, and John Selman Sr. in 1875. Long-suffering Edna would pass away in either 1878 or 79, I believe from complications following a stillbirth, at which point Selman pretty much abandoned his children, sticking them with his in-laws as he continued his outlaw ways. John would remarry, though, to a gal named Nicanora, who would help nurse him back to health after he got the pox. He also sent for his old compadres over in New Mexico, including Jesse Evans, Billy the Kid's sometimes friend and sometimes enemy. The scheme was pretty simple. With Selman posing as a butcher there at Fort Davis, he naturally had inside information as to the size and movements of various local cattle herds. John would then report these findings to Evans and his gang so they could steal them. The boys were a little too efficient, however, and Selman soon found himself arrested by Texas Rangers and thrown in a hole. A literal hole that passed as a jail, just like the one they used to have over there in Lincoln. When it was time to stand trial, Selman was taken to Shackelford County, Texas, but the authorities there didn't want to deal with him. Instead, they put John on a horse, ordered him to leave the county, and fired a few shots in the air to let him know they was serious. A little while later, Selman pops up in Chihuahua, Mexico, running a saloon. He allegedly converted to Catholicism and sent for his kids, but only 2 ended up joining him. William and John Jr. With sons in tow, and I guess feeling like enough time had passed, Selman returned to New Mexico to prospect for silver. While there, he won a saloon and a card game and actually made a pretty decent living. But gamblers are going to do what gamblers do, right? Most of this money was either lost right back at the poker table or sunk into his mining interests, which didn't amount to a whole hell of a lot. After shooting someone in an argument, Selman was once again on the move without a damn penny to his name. Eventually, the desperado wound up in El Paso and got married a 3rd time, to a teenage girl younger than his own damn children. He also aligned himself with a shady individual named Jim Burns, who ran a joint called the Red Light Saloon. It was known for its cribs out back where customers could visit the quote-unquote crib brides, essentially just a bunch of whores and lean-tos. El Paso was yet another town of vice and violence, especially in the red light district and especially in the Red Light Saloon. With an election on the horizon, Burns was worried that the town would get itself cleaned up and he'd be out of business. That being the case, he suggested that Selman run for the position of constable. Burns threw a big party the night before the election and made sure his place was stocked full of sporting gals. John Selman Jr., then just 17 years of age and working alongside his father, despite their strained relationship, was told to guard the door and let everyone in who was of voting age, but to not let them leave until they were instructed on how to vote. In other words, make sure they knew damn well on how to cast a ballot for Selman. John Jr. was then handed a club by Jim Burns, and when he asked what it was for, was told, quote, "If any of them try to leave, hit them over the head and make a damn good Democrat out of them," end quote. Utilizing such tactics, it should come as no surprise that on November 15, 1892, thief, rapist, and murderer John Selman Sr. found himself elected as constable of El Paso, Texas. A couple of years later, on April 5th, 1894, a Texas Ranger by the name of Bass Outlaw got drunk and started raising all kinds of hell. Believe it or not, Outlaw was his real last name. Bass, sometimes spelled like the fish, B-A-S-S, and sometimes spelled with a Z, is thought to be short for basil, or basil. Already with a few killings under his belt, the story goes that Bass carried a specially tricked-out revolver, minus the trigger and several inches of the barrel. Often referred to as slip guns, these were fired by fanning or simply pulling back the hammer and letting her drop. Odd arsenal aside, Bass was considered a brave Texas Ranger and a good Southern gentleman. But unfortunately, when he got a little bit too much of that who hit John in him, he became belligerent and, more often than not, violent. So much so that his drinking had gotten him fired from the Texas Rangers, which is how he came to be in town one night sulking. In addition to drowning his sorrows, Bass was also threatening to murder a judge whom he had perceived as insulting him. John Selman Sr., who's still working as a constable, was friends with Bass, so he tried to get the drunk former ranger to go home and sleep it off. Bass refused, so they did what anybody in their right mind would do when confronted with a stalemate. Went to Tilly Howard's brothel. Bass demanded to see his favorite whore, but was informed she was currently with a client. Guess the inebriated outlaw didn't much like that answer, so he started throwing furniture, leaving Tilly no choice but to blow her police whistle. Here comes Selman again trying to calm Bass down, but he wasn't having none of it and just ran out the back door of the brothel. A gunshot followed. 23-year-old Texas Ranger Joe McKittrick heard the noise and went to investigate. He saw Bass and somewhat relaxed. After all, the two were very close friends in addition to having worked together as Rangers. Joe asked his buddy to put the gun away, and for whatever damn reason, Bass went ahead and shot McKittrick square in the face. At this point, Selman comes running outside, and Bass fans off a couple more shots, putting 2 rounds in the constable's thigh. John reacts, and as he's collapsing to the ground, he sends a bullet into Bass's chest, just an inch above the heart. Despite this wound, Bass Outlaw still manages to jump a fence and retreat into an alley. But just moments later, he would collapse in the arms of another Texas Ranger, Frank McMahon. Bass was then taken to a saloon and placed on a cot, asking McMahon to gather my friends around me, for I know I must die. Sadly, nobody came, as Bass had just shot and killed his closest friend a few minutes earlier. No word on whether or not Selman attended the former Ranger's funeral. Now, I mentioned John Wesley Hardin towards the beginning of this episode. He had just spent damn near 2 decades in prison studying law, and upon his release in early 1894, attempted to go straight. Married a 15-year-old girl named Callie, moved to El Paso, and even set up his own law office. Regrettably, Hardin's law practice failed, with one of his few clients being Deacon Jim Miller, the only verified killer with a body count comparable to his. John Wesley's marriage to his child bride didn't fare much better, lasting less than a week before young Callie went back home to mama. For over a year, John Wesley Hardin had stayed out of the saloons, but these losses brought him right back into the lion's den. Not long after reverting to his old ways of drinking and gambling, Hardin was hired by a lady named Beulah Morose, whose Polish cowboy husband, Martin, was imprisoned over in Juarez. Beulah claimed that her betrothed was wrongfully jailed and the $1,800 he had from the sale of his ranch stolen by Mexican authorities. Hardin was immediately smitten with Beulah and her husband's money and agreed to take the case. He also started taking Beulah to bed. That said, Hardin was successful in getting Martin Morose freed from jail, all part of his twisted little plan. You see, the thing is, Martin couldn't come back to the U.S. due to a $250 bounty on his head for rustling. He began meeting with Deputy Marshal George Scarborough on a plan to slip back into Texas without getting arrested and pull his wife back from the clutches of John Wesley Hardin. As such, on June 21st, 1895, Martin Morose, disguised as a Mexican, met with Scarborough, who in turn led him across the bridge between El Paso and Juarez. Waiting for Morose is Police Chief Jeff Milton, Texas Ranger Frank McMahon, and according to some accounts, our esteemed constable, John Selman Sr. And once Martin comes within range, they all just shoot him dead. Rumors began swirling that Hardin had hired the lawmen to murder Morose in an attempt to get his wife and money. Hell, John Wesley himself admitted as much one evening while getting drunk in an El Paso saloon. Enraged, George Scarborough forced Hardin to recant his statements in the newspaper, and the past his prime gunfighter complied. While Hardin was away on business, Beulah, who I guess he was now shacked up with, got good and drunk and started raising a ruckus. She was also carrying a gun within city limits, which was a big no-no there in El Paso. John Selman Jr., now working as a constable just like his daddy, disarmed Beulah and threw her ass behind bars. And while John Wesley Hardin may have been somewhat intimidated by George Scarborough, he certainly wasn't afraid of the just 20-year-old Selman Jr. As soon as Hardin found out what the constable had done to Beulah, he caught up with the youngster and gave him a tongue lashing, along with a good old-fashioned pistol whipping, an action that didn't sit too well with the homicidal John Selman Sr. As crazy and deadbeat as he was, I guess he still didn't want nobody messing with his boy. Selman went on the hunt for Hardin and found him at his usual spot in the Acme Saloon. The two damn near came to gunplay right then and there, but John Wesley was unarmed. "Go get a gun," Selman challenged, to which Hardin replied, "I'll go get a gun, and when I meet you, I'll meet you smoking and make you shit like a wolf around the block." And no, I did not just make that up. That's got to be one of my favorite things ever said before an Old West gunfight. Right up there with Buckshot Roberts calling Charlie Bowdry Mary Ann right before the fight at Blazer's Mill. I don't know about you, but I can pretty much guarantee that in the next week or so, I'm going to figure out a way to work the phrase "make you shit like a wolf around the block" into a casual conversation. At around 11 o'clock that night, Hardin was still at the Acme Saloon. Got to imagine he was pretty lit at this point, and he was standing just inside the front door shooting dice for even more drinks. He rolled an unfavorable hand against a local grocer and exclaimed, "Horse piss on you." The grocer told West to shake again, which he did, while exclaiming his final words, "You got 4 6s to beat." Shots then rang out, and the legendary gunfighter John Wesley Hardin fell to the ground. His gambling and killing days over for good. Now, it's generally accepted that John Selman Sr. shot Hardin in the back of the head before he even knew what was happening. But Selman claimed that Hardin could see him in the mirror above the bar and turned and went for his pistol before being shot. And some historians do believe that Selman did indeed shoot Hardin in the forehead. The reasoning being that the bullet hole above Hardin's eye is more consistent with an entrance wound than that of an exit wound. Either way, the bullet passed through John Wesley's head and shattered the bar mirror. Hardin fell, and Selman shot him twice more in the chest, in addition to blowing his pinky finger clear off. And he would have pumped even more shots into Hardin's lifeless body had his son John not rushed in to put a stop to things. Selman Sr. would stand trial for murder, but it ended in a hung jury. Gotta love that old West justice. I think it was pretty clear to everybody that Hardin's death was premeditated. Even though he had quote-unquote reformed and spent all that time in prison, he was still considered extremely dangerous, and his many card shooting displays on the streets of El Paso proved as much. Despite Hardin's heavy drinking, his aim was still true. Selman was released on bond to await a retrial, during which time his son, John Jr., found himself in yet another pickle. On April 4th, 1896, the youngster was thrown in jail in Juarez trying to abscond with a Mexican girl that he had fallen in love with. Certainly can't blame him there. Deputy U.S. Marshal George Scarborough, remember him, paid a visit to El Paso the following night, and Selman Sr. met with him. Guess Selman wanted Scarborough to help break his son out of the Juarez jail, much like they had done with poor Martin Moroz a year prior. Now, during this conversation, which, by the way, was for whatever reason held in a damn alley, Selman was drunk as Scooter Brown, and things quickly went south. Scarborough claimed that they agreed on a time for the jailbreak, and Selman then invited him inside a saloon to have a drink. When George declined, Selman shouted, "You goddamn son of a bitch, I'm gonna kill you," and then he went for his gun. Well, I guess George Scarborough wasn't quite as inebriated as John Selman. He cleared leather first and put 4 bullets into Selman's midsection before the constable was able to get off a single shot. It was April 5th, 1896. Exactly 2 years to the day after Selman gunned down Bass Outlaw. And now I reckon it was his turn. Now, Scarborough would be arrested. I guess authorities found it fishy that he was claiming self-defense when exactly 0 weapons were found on Selman's body. Before George's trial, however, a known thief by the name of Cole Belmont was arrested, and Selman's gun was found in his possession. He claimed to have witnessed the shooting and said that he stole the pistol before anybody arrived on the scene. Whether or not this is true, or if Scarborough had somehow forced a confession, is anyone's guess. Nevertheless, the deputy was acquitted, because of course he was, and soon found himself working out of Deming, New Mexico, where he helped to capture the famous lady bandit Pearl Hart. He also began tracking down members of the Wild Bunch, caught up with a few of them on April 1st in the year 1900, and engaged them in a little bit of old-fashioned gunplay. One of the outlaws was killed, and Scarborough took a bullet to the leg, causing it to be amputated. It was too late, though, as the poison had done set in. So it were that a few days later, on April 5th, 1900, that George Scarborough followed Bass Outlaw, John Wesley Hardin, and John Selman Sr. to meet his eternal reward. Yeah, April 5th, again. If you're keeping track at home, Bass Outlaw was killed by John Selman on April 5th, 1894. A year later, on April 5th, 1895, John Selman is killed by George Scarborough. And then on April 5th, 1900, Scarborough succumbed to that wound that he received on the 1st of the month. Moral of the story? Stay the fuck home on April 5th. As for John Selman Jr., it's written that he was ashamed of his father, and at the time of his old man's death, despite them working together, they were not close. Jr. would go on to work for the railroad and serve with D Troop of the 11th U.S. Volunteer Cavalry during the Spanish-American War, and live all the way up to 1937. Unfortunately, I was unable to find out whether he ever married that gal from Juarez.